What is the correlation between conscientiousness and doctor's visits?
Well, I don't know. What's the correlation between people being able to afford to go to the doctor?
The prime drink is good because it's good, and people don't care. They don't care who made it. They're not trying to honor anyone's memory.
You don't? You don't think they're buying it because they want to support Logan, or they love Logan, or they think he's...
Well, yeah, of course that's why people buy Prime.
Targeted by big food companies in their advertising, which has been proven through research for addictive products like ultra-processed foods. Cigarette companies will specifically target their advertisements based on zip code, based on...
Yeah, that's curious. I have a reason for why. Those people like those things better.
Right.
Yeah, because they're addicted to them, Dr. Mike. What the heck matter with you?
Like, I know at least one person who came from money, and he's on like his third $100 million business creation all by himself. No help from mom and dad in any capacity. Just like,
well, that's not true. Just to be absolutely clear. Like, if you have lots of money from mom and dad, you get educational resources.
I can't believe that. No help from mom and dad. If you have a protective buffer behind you, the amount of risk you're willing to take on is going to be greatly different.
I just feel like in this conversation, there's so many different things that I'm hearing from Dr. Mike that I love this guy because I think he's so smart when it comes to like working out. But socially, it just feels like he's missing the mark. Enough is enough, guys. I actually saw a bunch of clips of this video here on TikTok. I love Dr. Mike Israetel. I've been back into my gymming this year. You know, you got to do the... It's been going pretty well. I watch a lot of Dr. Mike on some different advice. He's a very intelligent person, and he's not a hateful person. Like I've seen him talk about people that are overweight in a very humane thing, where it's like, yeah, being overweight is not good, but you know, we're still people, right? Which is a lot, you know, apparently. What a hot take. So yeah, man, I'm interested in this conversation. Apparently it's about obesity, and apparently it's a little controversial. So let's get this going. Let's just start it up.
At the university, if I was still working at the university, I would never give this interview.
Why?
Because saying that poor people on average have lower conscientiousness, I'm still worried about this going on. Holy that's insulting.
Sounds accurate.
If you're nuanced, then you're smart. You can understand how it's both real and not insulting. But if you're anything else, and if you're very politically motivated, it's going to be a nuclear bomb. You're blaming people.
I mean, yeah, I could see people who like don't have the same amount of money. They don't have access to like education or good, proper food or nutrition. You know, not having the same, you know, mental capacity as other people. I could totally see that.
People for their problems.
Please welcome return guest Dr. Mike Israetel, PhD, to the Checkup Podcast. We had a very scientific, even philosophical discussion about the nature versus nurture debate surrounding obesity. We get into that and so much more. Muscle, its implication on your health, what's hype, what's not. You're gonna enjoy this conversation. I know I did. Let's get started.
If I don't, it's gonna be hell to pay.
With the Checkup Podcast with Dr. Mike Squared. I remember last time we talked about this. I don't think you read comments and feedback and stuff.
I do sometimes.
Oh.
You're better off not, you know?
Like I was looking at feedback at our conversation, and a lot of people were saying that they don't believe AI is exponential as you say it is.
Yeah, they're just categorically wrong. This is not really like a debatable topic.
What does he mean? AI is one of the biggest threats to us as people, but also one of the greatest comforts that could ever happen. AI is incredible. It's going to provide us new opportunities to be lazy as shit. It's going to do everything for us, but it's taking jobs, and it already is. AI art and videos that are going on, that parses through the entire internet for people who put in real work on making art and videos, and it just steals all that information and it creates a video. That's what that does. AI technology in general is going to decimate us if we don't figure out how to deal with it. Like everybody's talking about how the middle class and lower class is like struggling. We're talking about cutting taxes. No politician's talking about technology displacing jobs and driving down wages. I always talk about it, and I don't care because I beat it to death because it's so important. Right? You go to a fast food restaurant, self-checkouts. You go to the grocery store, self-checkouts. You go to factories, 80% of workers are like automated now. These are removing jobs. Jobs are disappearing. You know, it's a real thing.
For people who are deeply entrenched in the field, I can approach this from a variety of angles to illustrate this point, but it used to be that the number of people that were saying that artificial general intelligence, roughly human capability intelligence, back in the late 90s, the vast majority of AI researchers thought it was some combination of impossible. It would arrive later than 2100. Mm-hmm. Every single 5 years that they do investigations into what the consensus of the AI profession is, that number falls lower and lower and lower up until, and originally Ray Kurzweil was kind of the real, kind of not the father, but one of the main progenitors of this idea that AGI is coming much sooner than people think. His original prognostication date was 2030. He later revised it to 2029, which is oddly specific. There are conversations now among the CEOs of Anthropic, OpenAI, various people at Google. These are the people making these things. And the conversation is now is like, are we going to hit AGI in like 2027, or is it really going to be 2029 or somewhere between? And so the entire profession
is the big muscle guy really a doctor? Yeah, that's Dr. Mike Israetel. He's got a doctorate. He's a legitimate doctor. He's like an exercise doctor, like legitimate Very intelligent person. I would recommend watching him. Like he's incredible.
Has been coalescing into more and more aggressive prediction timelines. And so the idea that like I'm overly optimistic about it is I've just read enough about it to understand like this is the space that we live in. And the pessimism, there's also another thing. There's a well-documented human intellectual fallacy called the pessimistic fallacy. And most humans on average are more pessimistic than they should be. But it's also understandable because humans evolved in an environment, most of our brain and the way we think was designed in periods of evolution where hunter-gatherer survival was how we made things happen. Hell is a pretty good way to describe what that was like. Elements of paradise and lots of elements of hell. And things also just did not get better over time in any measurable way. And you could absolutely depend on things getting real bad real soon for most people. Like the average age of survival was like 30, so on and so forth. So that's where our brains kind of have a baseline feel of what's happening. And over the last 5 to 10,000 years, there's been an exponential growth in culture and society and industry. That means that we're really out of touch with the rate of progress. We're not usually exponential thinkers, we're linear thinkers. Almost nobody predicted the internet. And I can believe 1997 or 1998, Paul Krugman.
I mean, who would predict the internet? Isn't the internet like computers are just made of sand? Aren't computer chips just made of sand? That's a real thing. I don't understand how it works, but
Nobel Prize-winning economist had a comment that I'm sure he regrets making, which is, the internet's probably not going to go anywhere because most people just don't have much to say to each other. I mean, we're laughing at it now. He also recently, I believe, please don't take my word for this, you should verify this, but I think he also a few months back said something negative about AI as well. He'll be tripping twice in his life, unfortunately. But the internet was this thing that is just straight up pure magic. Like think about Amazon. You use Amazon? Like you think of something and you actually don't even have to type anything anymore. You go, hey, Alexa, can you order me XYZ?
I don't use that.
yeah, I wish I had an Alexa because yesterday my wife was making cookies for like holiday party and stuff every time the alarm would go off, I would have to reset the timer, which was a pain in the ass because her hands were in like cookie dough and stuff. And I helped a little bit, but I wasn't doing as much. Those are her cookies, I don't really like cookies because I'm morbidly obese.
Me neither. My parents do. She's great.
Which means I love cookies. So I shouldn't be having them.
Not even an LLM yet, believe it or not.
She's not a
large language model. Like
oh, okay, got
you have to upgrade her to that. But you go on your phone and you go like protein bars and it finds the one you like and you go, okay, click, go hit. And then it arrives between 5 and 7 p.m. that same day. I'm like, how?
Yeah, so I get my metrics bars. It's crazy.
How? It's insane.
It's because they're opening up so many Amazon factories all over the place. And so they get to like keep those in those factories. It's actually crazy. There's a ton of them that are opening up by me. That's gonna be like, for right now, that's a huge job infrastructure. But then, what's gonna happen? They're already doing drone testing to see if they can replace those jobs too.
We live in an insane time already. Imagine telling someone in the 90s, like, dude, you can just like, you'll have a cell phone, and they're like, okay, like one of those big ones. You're like, it's much smaller, but way more power, like 100 times more powerful than your best desktop today. Like, okay, it's going to be in your pocket all the time. Like, okay, so the rich have it. Like, everyone in the world has one. Okay,
yeah, it's like more powerful than like a fucking PlayStation in your pocket. It's crazy. It's interesting.
You just click on something and it just arrives later. Like where's it arriving from? Like, I actually have no idea, but I don't care because
it's a factory. It's a factory that's like a local factory typically.
Arrives on time. You can think of about 100,000 different ways in which we take totally for granted the fact that we live in an era of insane abundance and prosperity and predictable improvement. And so combining all of that together and saying, well, Mike's like a bit too optimistic about AI. I would say I'm probably on the aggregate, when I hopefully am alive in 20 years, look back, I was probably like more optimistic than most people, but still more pessimistic than the reality that occurred.
I think about rate limiting steps in the exponential growth, because I absolutely can see the amount of growth that we've had in scientific understanding, achievement. Sure. In fact, there's a great book called like The Half-Life Effects that initially was doing research to prove why we have so much scientific breakthroughs. And a big part of it is a pretty cool statistic where 80% of scientists that have ever lived are alive today.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting. What the fuck?
Because this is the time when they started becoming scientists.
It used to be very rare to be a scientist.
And through that collaboration, there's been an exponential growth. But then there's going to be a rate limiting step because there's not that many people to keep growing the field of science.
AGI will solve that problem.
So that's the next factor that comes into it. Amazon, and the reason why its ability to be at the level where it is because of incentives. And incentives aligning creates a really clear road for something like Amazon to occur. Yeah. So you have incentivization from capitalism, people that want those products, the products being able to be made at a reasonable way, area for storage, all these things aligning together because we all uniformly agree that's what we want. And I think it's very easy for incentives to shift because humans are not always rational. And there's a lot of emotional components, wars, political divisiveness, disease, that can interrupt the algorithmic growth that we've seen in the past.
It has never interrupted it up until never. So if you look at all of the important events in geological history, biological history, cultural anthropological history, and the history of development, technology, and civilization, you can plot them all on the same log scale, and they basically don't move up and down, accounting for wars, holocausts, massive natural disasters. There's a reason for that, at least a candidate hypothesis. It's a very mysterious thing to see in the data. The data is crystal clear about it. Like, how the hell did World War II not slow down progress? Because there are two things that allow progress to happen. One is abundance. Like, you have time to work on cool shit. You have money to work on cool shit.
Well, the other one is war, no? Doesn't I mean, isn't it like it's a real thing that when we're in war, we see pretty exponential like growth. I mean, making weapons is one of the biggest ways that we technologically advance. Well, we made nuclear weapons that are still insane threat to us today. Like that's just kind of how things work. I would say that we probably get more technological advancement. Well, I guess it depends on if your country's going to win or not. We get like more technological advancement during wars than anything else. I mean, I would make that assumption at least.
You develop cool shit. Mm-hmm. The other is incentive, the impetus to make something happen because of difficulty. And these work kind of as top and bottom end buffers to the rate of progress. When you have good times, you have huge abundance, but not a lot of incentive to make shit happen that's cool because it doesn't matter. Everything's kind of nice. So who cares? Like, really, is it really more important to make the next amazing iPhone? Like, the iPhone's pretty goddamn good. Like, who cares? However, when you get into wars, natural disasters, that's when the incentive to make radical innovations really pops up and seems to cover that difference. So what we see is a very homogeneous rate overall. Now, there are absolutely declivities and proclivities throughout, but in the grand historical sense, they seem to so far be very minor. Like the Cambrian explosion of life on Earth seems to be a big deal when you look at it, but when you spread out the timeline, you're like, oh, that's actually quite predictable if that would have happened, I guess. It's all on the same curve. So
yeah, I think about it like I think of when investors pitch you their deck.
Guys, that's why war is so good. We should do more wars because...
And they say, what's that line? Past results don't necessarily reflect future outcomes.
Sure. And
so I say all of that with that in mind of how the future plays out. And it's been interesting how the natural human buffer that you discuss exists and has guided us here. And then there's also the regulation of it all and the wars and the economic progress of it all. Like, there was talk about social media just continuing to grow in a way that was becoming unreasonable. And then you see young people say, well, I'm kind of getting bored of doing the same thing, of posting perfect images on Instagram. Now, you know what? The less tailored, less structured.
Streaming.
Yeah, exactly. Streaming.
Live.
Yeah, live. So like, it's not always been clear to me how the future will adapt to current technologies. And I'm always aware of that when trying to make predictions. And that's why, even though I probably would have agreed with someone who was very poo-pooing AI 10 years ago, but not because I too poo-poo AI, I just poo-poo their ability to make a good prediction.
Sure.
I mean, you guys see the videos of AI from like a year ago where Will Smith looks like a spaghetti monster? AI is insane now. Like AI, and listen, I'm going to be absolutely real with you. When we're sitting here talking about AI, the best way to gauge a society's progress is by looking at the Gooners. Have you guys ever looked at AI stuff? It's insane. I don't care if that's a self-report, but they got AI Miss Incredible. You put in a little prompt and it's just like, what the fuck? What the hell is this? It's a scary time. I'm telling you right now, I'm an older guy, so technology is great for old people because we're set in our ways. I have a wife, I have a life, I'm happy, I'm emotionally regulated, surprisingly, at least compared to this fucking society nowadays. If I was a young man growing up during the AI burst, oh my God, I think I would fall in love with computers. And now what's the next step? I'm 34. 10 years from now, there's going to be like perfect, like, silicone dolls that have like human emotion and life that secrete or they shoot out pheromones so that you can bond with them. People are going to be in love with computers. We're going to get to a point where we're going to start they're going to have legitimate wombs in in these things. I'm not even kidding. I saw that Rick and Morty episode. Those guys were fucking sex robots. Life's crazy, dude. I don't know. I'm a little scared. I think we're hitting a point. We're hitting a point. We are.
Sure. Most predictions that are very specific end up getting a lot wrong, 100%. But we can just go based on generalities. The amount of total intelligence in our society has been increasing exponentially for all of measured time. And it looks like it's going to continue to do that. They've done lots of work on theoretical limits of intelligence based on like physics and information theory. And the limits of intelligence are preposterous, like way out of reach of anything you could surmise. Like you could hypothetically turn like a decent fraction of the Earth's mass into a computer. And like the amount of intelligence it has is like humans are like a fungal growth on the Earth's crust level of like occupying the solar system. People are like, what about physical limits? Like, we could just mine Jupiter for matter. And like, I can't like there's like a storm on Jupiter, the eye or whatever, that's like 3 times bigger than the Earth. Like, it's a lot of hydrogen, you know? So when you think about physical limits, you don't really get a big limit on that one. And then you think about trajectories. Trajectories have been good so far. And you think, okay, so if intelligence increases a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, you can start to see certain problems kind of melting away, because a lot of the problems that are extant right now are because of a lack of intelligence. Here's something fun and wildly politically incorrect. So as you measure people's political opinions, you scale them against proxies or direct measurements of their intelligence, there is a massive degree of consensus on political opinions as intelligence scales in either way. People who are less intelligent on average, measured however you like, tend to be more authoritarian in both the regard of social and economic freedom. So people that are less intelligent tend to not be for social liberties. They're not super big fans of gay rights, trans rights, women's rights, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And they're not big fans of economic freedom in general. They seem to think that more government regulation is the way to do things. Like anytime they see something wrong, they go, there should be a law. They're against that. People on average, as they become more intelligent, seem to become more libertine in their attitudes. They favor a freer economy, substantially less and more intelligent regulation, and they favor a more libertine approach to social things, like live and let live kind of attitude. And so if you manage to increase the amount of intelligence in the system.
It's so interesting because when you hear that, it sounds like it's almost like, because like a libertarian perspective tends to be more conservative, but people that are for less social issues tend to be more progressive. But the people who tend to be for less social issues tend to be more conservative as well. There's almost like there in this scenario, there's a mixture of conservatives and progressives in both scenarios. You know, it's the more it seems from what he's saying, it's the individuals who are more okay with people like existing that are more progressive leaning, but then also people who are a little bit okay with like a looser society where it's like a little bit, you know, libertarian, where you get to make your own decisions. That's interesting.
System, it's going to cause a predictably better place for all of us to live, because when you have peoples that tend to be lower intelligence on average running an institution or country, wherever, they generally run it really poorly. And you have all of the social maladies that you can see in a variety of areas. Whereas as people become more intelligent, or as the aggregate of people plus machine intelligence becomes better, things get better overall. And so if you scale that out, at some point you're like, man, if our collective IQ, us plus machines, goes up another 10 points, a lot of places are going to be freer, more prosperous, and cleaner, and more stable, and have less war. Because if you think about it for like a little bit, you know, basic economics, if you're basic economics, war almost never makes logical sense. Almost ever. Like, should we attack the Netherlands?
Well, I feel like that's why they make sure that people in America stay stupid. It's like the majority of the people that are in the military are people who don't have another option. I feel that that's kind of almost like, that's kind of the way that works. They like try to keep people stupid so that they'll actually join the military. Because who joins the military to actually like protect their country? I don't think anybody does that. I think most people are like, yeah, I didn't have an option. I needed a job. I needed something to do, you know? I think that's kind of where people are at. I mean, that's where a lot of people, that's why people join the military. I would guarantee you most of them don't join the military because they're like, wow, I really want to protect and serve this country. And it's like, no, I had no other option.
Other ones. Why? To get the resources. Like, well, we could just buy the resources. Like, we can get them for free. Like, no, you still need to buy them, because then some of us live there and they sell us that stuff. Like the whole war for oil nonsense is just almost certainly just pure nonsense. There's war for oil in the modern time has just not occurred.
Well, that's that emotional reasoning that we were talking about in humans.
And so, like, as you scale up your intelligence, your emotional reasoning tends to capture less and less of your cognitive bandwidth.
I don't know if I agree with that.
It's just demonstrably true empirically.
Well, on
average, now there are absolutely exceptions of smart people. You're really having a lot of feelings.
I'm not talking about the extremes. I just see that, like, as IQs and Nobel laureates have attested, that they oftentimes are able to convince themselves of wildly inaccurate theories and the belief that whatever they're saying is true when it's absolutely not true. That's also been shown. And then also there's a chicken or the egg effect here, where it's when you're poorer and have less education, you need to have a little bit more of an authoritative mindset to succeed in order to be practically successful. And when you're wealthy and you have less to worry about, you think about being more free. And you think about other things, whereas when you're poorer...
I mean, I guess that makes sense. It's about how much do you have the ability to handle at any given moment based on your circumstances. So sure, that's fair.
You have to survive so that it frees you up to think more liberally and peacefully, which is why there's always so much disagreement of people who live on the coasts that have money versus people who are struggling to be rising in society and they want their children to focus and live the most strict lifestyle because they think that's the only way to achieve it. And they could be right given their circumstances. Do you think that could be a reasonable thought?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thought. It makes absolutely perfect sense. The more money that you have, the more freedom that you have, the easier it is to engage mentally with other things. Like you might really hate trans people and gay people because you're very uneducated and poor, but that also might be just because you don't have access to any emotional reasoning to live outside of that thought. You know, maybe you're waking up every day working 12, 15, 16-hour shifts and you just don't have the mental or emotional capacity to help other people because like you just don't have anything else. It's you and your family and that's all you have left. That makes perfect sense to me. You know?
Maybe. So to the first point of Nobel laureates questioning their ability or illustrating their ability to sort of justify anything they like, the fact that they're introspective enough to know that that's happening is already alienating them and alone to the group.
Well, I don't think they're aware of it. I think we studying them.
Oh, I see. I think some of them have talked about it openly.
Maybe.
And we, being less intelligent than Nobel laureates, are probably less self-aware than they are. And if we're self-aware of it, you have to ask, what about people of substantially lower intelligence? They're substantially less aware in general. And so they're apt to make mostly emotionally biased choices. As a matter of fact, many people, when you ask them what they think about politics, are answering a completely different question. They're answering, actually, I'm wearing my Thomas Sowell shirt to illustrate that exact thing. It's a former position of his, current position of his. Most people feel a certain way about politics. They don't think a certain way about politics, which is the wrong thing altogether, because politics is asking the question of how do you run a society for the maximum benefit? However you define that, it's a technical question. It's a machine question. It's not a question of how you feel about things. Most people feel rather than think about these kinds of topics. People who are more intelligent tend to think on the margins more than not, and people who are less intelligent tend to.
Well, I think it's a good thing to feel about things. I would say that most people, regardless of whether they're Democrat, Republican, left or right, they feel about things more than they think about things in general. I think a lot of people, especially young people, I don't think a lot of people have a particular understanding of their basis of morality. So you might have a young person that's saying like, oh, we need more trans rights or something. I don't necessarily think that they have a deep level of understanding of that. I think it's just to them more intuitive. And it's the same thing where somebody who doesn't like trans people, like they grew up in an area where it wasn't accepted or it was accepted. There's no moral foundation or basic or reasoning there. You know, the progressive people just happen to be right in this scenario.
More than not. And so on average, if you think Nobel laureates are biased, you should talk to someone of profoundly lower intelligence, and you will see probably exclusively bias and almost nothing else. And
I wonder what the research of that actually
confidence
shows
in
from an
one's
anthropology
opinions.
standpoint.
Give it a look. It's not pleasant.
because no, like even from a practical standpoint of what I've experienced in my life, I treat two very distinct populations of where I practice medicine, where I have people who live in the wealthy community where my hospital exists, and then I have people who are coming in for the community health aspect of it, charity care aspect, perhaps that are employed by the people who are very wealthy. And I see the problems that they experience, their logic by how they approach the world, and the strategies that they each use to survive. And they're radically different in terms of looking at them on paper, but they're radically appropriate given their situation. I think if you're
being very charitable.
I think if you're a single mother who's working two jobs, have two children, one of which that's struggling academically, you don't have the capacity or time to think about what a better world looks like for certain subsets of individuals.
That's perfectly true. That's 100% true and absolutely like real. People only have so much time and like emotional energy for other people. When you don't have resources, when you are economically oppressed, you don't care about anything outside of your immediate bubble. We are all just a matter of bubbles, right? So for me, it's myself and my wife, my mother and my mother-in-law, right? Like my brother-in-law. Then you got like your other extended family. Then you have your friends, and then you have like other groups of people, like gay people, trans people, black people, blah 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 blah. That's like the most outer ring. When you've got money and safety and you're provided for, of course you can sit here and really go like, oh, you know what, gay, trans people, black people, like all these different marginalized groups, we should advocate for them. But when you're sitting here and you're working two jobs and you ain't got no man, how the fuck are you going to have time to give a shit about, you know, who's putting what in their ass? You know, that is a real thing. And I would say that the fact is that we live in a time that's so economically burdened that they have less emotional intelligence because they don't have the ability to have it. Right? Like that's the great divider, is keeping people poor and angry at each other. And this is how it manifests. We're not thinking broadly enough about like how the system is kind of kicking our ass, like that class consciousness. We're starting to, after, you know, one of the Mario brothers took out that CEO, we're starting to understand like, oh wait, that's one of the things that economically oppresses us. But like the first thing we need to think about, really, isn't going to be different marginalized group rights. It's going to be like, how do we afford to pay for things happily and comfortably? And then after we meet that, we will see more empathy charged into the system, into individuals. We'll have more empathy for each other.
You're trying to be as practical and create the guardrails for the success of your immediate family. I think looking down upon that as dumb or wrong, I think misses the point of how that person got there.
Well, I don't think Dr. Mike's looking down on it. I think he's trying to have an educated conversation. Thank you for the 24-month small gut from Cali, right? Hey, Gutters. Hey, Papa. It's been too long. What's going on, brother or sister?
And therefore, we're judging a whole group of people for making a decision that, had we been in that situation, we would have made the same exact decision.
True. I agree with that.
You don't agree?
No.
I totally agree with that. I think that's almost impossible to disagree with. That's almost impossible to disagree with, I think.
Why is that?
What the fuck is strict
Boy.
sucks?
So, a couple caveats. We're speaking in statistical generalities. So we're not trying to paint an entire group of people anyway. The group of people we're painting is also a statistical abstraction. It's not an actual group of people you can point to. One example of this is people talk about the poor, but like something like a third of the poor are just like people who just graduated high school. Most of them will end up quite wealthy. They're just at the wrong time of life. So you can't group them in with the various other demographic groups that are poor consistently throughout their lives.
And when you talk about the rich, it's about how much money they have,
right?
Or how much they
they're
earned
making,
this year,
right.
because as Thomas Sowell says,
right. That's not always.
I mean, I guess one of the counters would be that rich people aren't exactly nice people. That would be a reasonable counter to that conversation. You know, I mean, some rich people might be, but some of them just like look down at you and think you're like shit. So
changes every year
all the time,
because the people that are extremely wealthy may not have earned a lot.
Sure. And they're also within any kind of category. Let's just say poor people. There are vastly different kinds of people in that with vastly different kinds of behavioral patterns. But the behavioral patterns seem to be the number one correlate of what continues to keep you poorer than average or continues to push you on the trajectory of wealthier than average eventually. So when we say on average poor people do X, Y, Z, you can give me millions of counterexamples of poor people being very diligent, very organized, very conscientious, very thoughtful, and very coordinated in their action. And those people are much less likely to remain poor than the fraction of poor people that have the opposite of those characteristics. So when you look at wealthier people and poor people on average, you tend to find that wealthier people on average are more conscientious, more goal-driven, more organized, clear thinkers about things. They have lots of feelings just like everyone else, but they don't let the feelings take over as much as people on average who are poor. But the averages kind of belie the fact that it really goes individual by individual. And whether or not you're rich or poor, you have no doubt, well, maybe no doubt, some people are not capable of having as many social interactions, but you've met at least four kinds of people, likely. Poor person who is like just a really conscientious, really organized, really thoughtful, calm person.
I don't think I've ever met a poor person like that. That's not even being like rude or anything. I don't know that I've necessarily met a poor person that's like super conscientious.
Very intelligent, very motivated to improve their circumstance, even if they've been dealt a nasty hand. Like they had married someone who was really good to them. That person died in an automobile accident, left them with 3 children, and now they work 2 jobs, and they're doing their goddamn best. That person and their children, through the genetic relatedness of having those features inherited from them and the very nice father that unfortunately was taken too early, their children and them will probably be, over time, on average, expectedly rising through the income strata because they're just good at stuff. That's just who they are. They don't spend excessively. They don't make impulsive decisions as often, so on and so
Shit, I do.
forth. So that's subtype number 1. Subtype number 2 of a poor person is when you like hang around them for long enough, you're like, don't say this to them personally, but you could be like, motherfucker, I'll tell you why you're poor, goddammit.
True.
You spend all of your money. You're addicted to like 10 different things. You have an I don't give a fuck attitude about basically everything. You've never invested a dime in improving yourself in any way whatsoever. You're rude to everyone around you. How are you possibly going to make money and hold on to it? In almost impossibility. So there's 2 subtypes of poor people.
So for that second subtype, is that caused by society, a societal situation, or is that a genetic situation?
It's a combination of the 2, but genetics explains much more of the variance as far as literature I've consumed. Because both subtypes of poor people are exposed to roughly the same social influences, and it does not affect everyone the same way. There are some cultural elements there that have to be thrown in because it's kind of like society writ large. There's genetics, but there's also
I'm trying to think about this like in a way where like when I was never like horribly horrifically poor, but I remember struggling paycheck to paycheck, like trying to pay for things, obviously. And I was in a pretty rough area. And I remember spending like an asshole. You know, I would just spend like an idiot because I just didn't care anymore. I was like, why bother trying to save for retirement? It doesn't matter. I got all these bills. Every week something new happens. This happens. I don't have time to eat correctly because I'm working, 8, 10, 12-hour days. It's just like it becomes exhausting at a certain point. And it's like, how many of those people that are, you know, addicted to something, or they engage in that lifestyle and that thought process, how many of them are just like, I don't care because I never see a way out. Like, it's kind of difficult to sit there and be like, yeah, you know, maybe in 40 years things will get better. That's a tough thought. So I feel like a lot of it is environmental.
Intermediary variable culture. How do you process society and express your genetics? There's probably something to say for culture, though based on the more recent behavioral genetic data that I've seen, people in some sense secrete their culture based on their genetics, at least to some great degree. Like if you're the kind of person that's born into even a family of very highly unconscientious people, but you have a lot of trait conscientiousness, and they introduce you to a very low conscientiousness culture, like just fuck it, do whatever, YOLO. You probably, as you mature into teenagehood, will be like, this sucks. I need the fuck out of here. You know, like the small town, get me out of here. I'm not made for this kind of thing.
Exists.
So we have two of those people so far, two archetypes, very rough, right?
And there's also, just to finish that point, I think there's a protective factor if you're in the correct social group. So how many kids that may, let's say genetically, have an issue with addiction, with lack of delayed gratification ability, all those factors that we label as potentially successful, like they have low levels of that. But if they're in the right social class, they're born wealthy into a wealthy family in the United States, will they make mistakes and suffer consequences? Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. But then their dad will just pardon them. I saw your penis, Hunter. That's a good point, actually.
But it's protective in the way that they're not going to become drastically poor.
It's possible. I mean, I know somebody who like came from rich parents and they still ended up a drug addict on the street. But
you just made category 3 of the 4. So category 3 is people who come from wealth but exhibit very low conscientiousness, and they tend to have that protective buffer. But you can work your way through any protective buffer, and through multiple generations of low conscientious individuals, you can lose absolutely everything and just become absolutely destitute, no problem. Say gambling addiction can cancel out every single bit of generational wealth in a matter of minutes, if you think about it.
Yeah, because you can lose all your money gambling. But you could also gain, this is the thing about gambling, you can lose everything, but you can gain so much more. The possibilities are endless, you know what I mean, guys? So go gamble. I'm just kidding. Don't gamble.
Definitely hours and days, for sure years. Profound drug addiction. I would like to believe in a world in which people who have a huge proneness to drug addiction, you simply give them the right access to care and they're better. Mike, you've seen the data on drug recovery rates.
I feel like when it comes to drugs, it's a terrible thing to say and think, but I feel like when it comes to drug addicts, most of the time unfortunately, I'm not confident how effective it is to get people to come off of a drug after they go onto it, after they have a serious addiction. I feel like it's one of those things where it's more preventative. You know, if you're an addict, you probably do have some kind of addictive personality that would make you addicted to something. I would say being obese is part of that. I would say that I'm fat. I have an eating problem. When I was smoking cigarettes, I was eating less food. I'm just going to be real. You know, so like there seems to be almost a necessity for some kind of addiction. Not necessity, but you get what I'm saying. Like there's like it's a filler addiction in some capacity. Like if you look at the transfer addiction rates for people who go on weight loss, when they get like weight loss surgeries, a lot of them start doing other things like drugs or cigarettes. But what I was saying before I forgot what I was fuck. Oh, what I was saying is I feel like you need to be more about prevention. The unfortunate reality is if you have a family of alcoholics, you're probably not going to stop anybody in that family from drinking, but maybe you could stop that kid from starting to drink. That's what I would say more than anything else. Like that would probably, and so like prevention. And it's like, how do you do prevention? Well, you need to hopefully provide like levels of education, but then also hopefully provide less of a need to self-medicate. And how do you do that? We try to live in a society that's a little bit more helpful to everybody, and except for other than the people with money.
It's not pretty. A lot of wealthy people who have all the resources, who are prone to drug addiction, just continue to, I'm not going to name any celebrities, just continue to struggle with it their entire lives. And so yes, the buffer is real, but we can't paint the buffer too strongly as like, you're never going to be poor. Oh, you can recess down. No problem.
What the data...
Much easier to lose than to gain.
Yeah, what the data shows about specifically, let's say, substance abuse is quite interesting in that if you look at people who are struggling with substance abuse in decade 3 of their life, checking back in with them at decade 5, the odds that they still have a substance abuse issue is not as high as you think it would be.
Well, I don't even know how high I think it would be, like 100%. What is it actually?
So really a lot of times it's about buying time to get past this issue by a means of risk reduction. And that could be taking a pharmaceutical medication to get you off of that medicine, even though it has side effects. It could mean trading one unhealthy habit like substance abuse for a healthier one. How many people cope with issues in their lives through abusing themselves in fitness?
I mean, that's true. If you guys ever look at like people that do West Side Barbell, a lot of them are former prison inmates who praise Louis Simmons. Right? It's Louis Simmons, right? Because he saved their life. And he did. Like, these people engage in a routine that kicks their ass every day and makes them hate themselves, and that helps them get through the day.
Or maybe overusing testosterone because before they were addicted to heroin and they've gotten off heroin, but they still miss that rush or whatever it is, and they're getting it elsewhere in a slightly less negative way.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting to see how if you look at humans in one point in their life, that doesn't always equate. Like we say people who have substance abuse. The same way that it's unfair to say people who are rich this year or earn the most this year, the top 1% this year, it's not going to be next year. The same holds true for people with substance abuse.
Yeah, and every other factor as well.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an excellent point. But the other last category is people who are relatively wealthy already and also have high trait conscientiousness. And those individuals tend to have extreme amounts of continual success and aggregate high amounts of intergenerational wealth. I've met a few folks who are from old money. And one of the things that stood out to me about them was how many of them were just mega degenerate losers, just totally just riding it out. What also stuck out is how many of them were just unbelievably awesome, kind, conscientious people that you're like, I can tell you why your parents were successful because you're related to them and you got the same thing. Like I know at least one person who came from money. And he's on like his third $100 million business creation all by himself. No help from mom and dad in any capacity. Just like,
well, that's not true. Just to be absolutely clear. Like if you have lots of money from mom and dad, you get educational resources, but I understand what he's saying.
Well, I can't believe that. No help from mom and dad. If you have a protective buffer behind you, the amount of risk you're willing to take on is going to be
drastically higher. You get a better education. Yeah, absolutely. Like you're more willing to invest in things 100% and take more risky investments because you have a pathway from that. You know, mom and dad will help you out if things go too south. Yeah, no, this is
greatly different.
Absolutely.
I have an exact counterpoint to that as an intellectual exercise. If you have no impetus to succeed because it doesn't matter because you're already rich, you have arguably much less drive to make it. People who came from very little.
I would disagree with this because especially if you look at guys, and I think women would be the same if we lived in like a similarly structured system, but you look at guys, how many men out there make more money than they need to and they still go for more? This is just something that is part of the ego of human and the ego of man especially. It's not necessarily about how much money you're making. It's like how many accolades you can get. So if you're rich, like that doesn't mean you're gonna be like, well, fuck it, I don't need to keep going. Some people might be like that, but I think a lot of people are like, no, let's see how much more I could do. I don't think that it's just like, oh, their basic needs are met, they're done, they don't care about anything anymore. No, I think that there are a lot of people out there that once they have, like, they want more. It's just about having more. It's an ego driving thing. I don't think that that's true. I think that if you are rich, if you come from rich parents, whether they give you money explicitly or not, you have a better education, better background, better opportunities, better networking, right? Because your mom and dad, they know people who know stuff and that passes on to you. Everybody has this in general, like more working class people, you know, you have a plumber or an electrician that you can call that'll give you a deal. In richer areas, it's like, you know, somebody in some kind of finance or whatever other, you know, bullshit that they do over there. I don't know, heroin, whatever.
Always recount the fact that it's because they came from very little that lit them up and made them drive. Whereas we're all familiar with the trope of the wealthy person that like goes to Dartmouth, but like they take whatever classes they feel like taking because who gives a shit? Dad did hedge funds and I don't have to do anything. So how do you traverse that?
The way that I think about it is they want to do better than whatever goalpost was set for them. You know, we're speaking of tropes, daddy.
It really doesn't matter because if somebody who's rich has a better outcome, it is because their parents were rich. Like that is a fact. If somebody who is able to make themselves rich when they did not have rich parents, that is more on them and whatever circumstance that they had ignited a fire in them. But that's not typical for most people. Most people are not going to see that circumstance of drastic growth. But like, that's why money makes money. That's why, like, oh, I didn't inherit a lot of money from my mom. I didn't do, okay, your mom and dad are still alive, but they had plenty of money to put you through school, right? Well, yeah, okay. Like that's I think that's a real thing. It's a huge factor.
He didn't love me because he thought he was more successful than me, so I'm going to outdo him. Or my dad started a $1 billion company, I want to make a $10 billion company.
Sure.
I think that motivation still exists for that individual.
I don't even think it has to be that deep. I think sometimes it's just like, oh, I can do, so I will. Like, let me try to do something.
Definitely. But it also, I think, works the other way, where people who have seen close to the bottom
And also, your parents usually aren't like, yeah, do whatever you want. A lot of times, like, parents will typically try to motivate you to do better, hopefully better than them, you know?
really don't like to be close to the bottom, and they're maybe less likely to be lazy about things and just let it ride.
Sure, so but how much do connections matter? Like coming to America for
almost
us,
not at all.
Come on, that's complete nonsense.
Almost not at all.
Come on.
What? There's no way that Dr. Mike thinks that connections don't matter.
That's complete nonsense. I'll even give you a practical, simple takeaway from it. Moving to America.
I love Dr. Mike. There's no way.
Not having a connection for a plumber, a car repair person, a dentist,
Absolutely.
versus someone who has all that, and then that frees them up to have the time to work more, to achieve more, to have the buddy-buddy relationship of a grant going their way, is an inherent advantage.
Yeah.
So how can we say that it's not?
Yeah, short-term advantage. It
What are you talking about? That's a long-term advantage. What?
definitely makes things easier in the short term for you, but usually that stuff doesn't last.
What doesn't last about having a connection to a solid like plumber or dentist office or somebody that'll help you invest? What are you talking about? What?
So if you have somebody who's been connected into business, like dad was in the industry, said, hey, hire my son, you know, that sort of thing.
Sure, nepotism.
Business is ruthless. I don't give a fuck who you're related to.
Okay, but it doesn't matter because if you don't have that connection, guess what? It's even harder.
If you're related to dad and he said, I'll hire you, you don't perform, and your stock trading isn't up to standard, I'm going to hire some dude from China that's a fucking merc.
Okay, right. But who got the first opportunity? It's the guy whose dad did finance, who has a better insight into the industry, who is still going to be treated more charitably even if they make a mistake. And then who gets the second term? It's the guy who had to build themselves up and like hope they educated themselves correctly. But I don't know. I love Dr. Mike, but like this is a weirdly out of touch perspective for somebody who's so in touch.
And he doesn't give a fuck. And I don't
You would
know
think
him. I don't
so.
know his parents.
There's so much nepotism. There's so many people who are terrible at their jobs at the highest levels.
Yeah, many, but it's much rarer than you may think. And there are also so many people at the highest levels that are just good.
I don't know. Listen, I honestly, the biggest career job I ever had was because of nepotism. Like I used to work for a bus company. I started cleaning buses, and then I became the manager of cleaning buses. Who would have thought before I was able to fall into this like content creation job. I got my job. I know I did a good job there because they would generally praise me, but I also know that I made mistakes and they probably bypassed those. I also know a lot of other people who worked there who were nepotism babies there, and they were horrific dog shit workers, and they just got tossed around to different department to department just because dad was the union rep. So we got to keep his shit son employed. And it's like, okay, great, you know? So yeah, I don't know, man. I feel like, you know, having that nepotism, it helps a lot. It's going to push you up higher and higher. This is a very real thing.
Good. And over time, especially the free market, now government's slightly different, but the free market, private institutions, private companies grotesquely over-reward capability versus anything else. You ever been inside Google? And no offense to anyone, all jokes, all love and respect, Google, all the companies associated with that tech sphere, bro, it's like 1/2 of the nation of India. Is there some kind of thing where people just love Indians at tech companies? No, they're fucking mercs, dude. They're fucking good. They're just good. And like, I'm going to hire people that are good. And it's also, we like to hold two thoughts in our heads at the same time about, you know, the myth of the, maybe not myth, the exaggerated form of the greedy capitalist. It's both a nepotistic asshole and a greedy asshole. Nepotism and greed don't work very well together, because if I'm greedy enough, I don't need you, my son, working for my company because you're flubbing. I need Garaj Patel working for my company because he fucking comes in at 6 a.m. I don't think he ever leaves. His portfolio looks like someone make-believe.
Yeah, or you could just hire both of them. Like, you're in this world, there's only so much money. But if you have a kid that sucks but you're the boss, you hire your shitty kid to make money, and then you hire the fucking guy from India to work for 1/10 of the pay, double the effort, and then you give money to your kid. We already know, especially in America, this is how CEOs work. They don't do anything meaningful in their company. So what are you talking? You're acting like there's only like so much room for so many things.
Leaf it into existence. I want to get this guy. Who is the current, was it CEO of Microsoft, or is it Google? One of the guys is like an Indian dude, right?
Yeah, I think.
Where did he come from? Where was his advantage?
I mean, he might have been rich in his country.
What I've seen, anecdotally speaking, the practical version of.
I think that just the insinuation that an Indian guy can't have rich parents is a little bit of a strange take from Dr. Mike here.
You're saying is you're the greedy asshole that hires his son, who's inept, and benefits from the hard labor of the Indian dude without paying them fairly.
Yeah, absolutely, 1000%.
I think that's the more reality.
And then
of
the
what a
Indian
greedy
dude's
person
smarter
is.
than all of you, and the Indian dude gets a startup going, and he crushes you and buys everything.
I love Dr. Mike to death. I don't know where this out of touch nature comes from. It's fucking crazy to me.
Company
How often do we see that happening?
all the time.
I genuinely wonder, did Dr. Mike did he come from money? Is that where we're getting this from? Did he come from money?
I feel like the big companies that have been in power are still in power. The blue chip companies.
Google was founded by a Russian immigrant in the 90s.
Yeah, this is during a period of transition of new technology. of a new
Yeah, where there was skepticism in that field. So like old money didn't necessarily invest into it.
industry being formed as opposed to an old industry being taken over.
So which industries are the ones that are like the old boys?
Disney.
Yeah, business and oil.
Disney's not an industry. Disney's one company.
What?
Well, Disney's industry
Disney's a media company. What are you talking about?
is media, it's amusement parks, it's entertainment,
Sure.
sports. You don't see brilliant engineers taking over sports teams.
You think the profit margin on sports teams is
Huge.
is it? Is the
Well, you do see a little bit of like technology entering sports. Like there's a whole movie about how they started to look at the numbers instead of like, whatever else, like when it comes to recruiting, that's like a whole conversation. But again, that's like old money. Those are not necessarily risky. Like those are established businesses. They're not really changing very much. There really aren't any new sports except for esports, right? And then you're seeing people buy into that after it already makes its successful rounds.
margin huge, or is it revenue?
The valuation is huge of change.
Sure.
That's the real value.
Sure.
And nowadays, you can't buy a sports team. It is now firms that are run by the same 10 people that are buying sports teams.
10 people is not, so I'd say 10 people are probably ruthlessly competitive against each other.
Sure.
It's a very competitive landscape. Another thing is, to the point of behavioral genetics, one of the reasons that nepotism actually still can be tracked statistically is because nepotism on average works. Because if you're a real smart dad and you had a great company, yeah, your son might suck relative to everyone else at the company because they're all studs. Compared to the average person, your son's a killer.
That part's probably true. That part I would agree with. Like, yes, if you have this is why people hire at jobs, like family members, because if your uncle or your dad is like really good at their job, the chances are the son is going to be good at the job and they're going to care about the job, especially since that, yeah, of course that part is, there's a level of truth to that too.
And so over time, I think you see this effect that can be labeled as purely nepotistic, but in reality, we're just tracing the effects of behavioral genetics. Like people related to really smart, really capable people are on average smart.
Like if I know somebody, I'm more likely to hire their kids than I am some random off the street, because I don't know that random off the street, but I do know, and I don't know you either, but I know your dad, and like your dad is a decent guy, and I know if you fuck around, he'll probably keep you in line because your dad does good work for my company. And like, yeah, of course, there's positives and negatives to nepotism.
Harder and more capable than everybody else. And so a huge degree of nepotism can be accounted just sheerly based on that. And over long historical trends, nepotism has a way of not working out so well because private enterprise does not care about nepotism. So like the Paul brothers, I don't know which one of them made the Prime drink. You know, the Prime drink, sugar water, Logan Paul.
Not sugar water, actually. It's
Non-sugar
artificial
water.
sugar water.
Sweet tasting water with electrolytes and stuff.
Stevia water, I don't know.
So
Whose brother just attacked me 2 days ago, actually.
attacked and physically?
Social media.
Oh my God, even worse.
Yeah.
Well, good.
Wait, why?
You had it coming. And what was the attack about? I'm curious.
He called me a book-thumping sheep doctor.
What does mean sheep doctor? Oh, like
He
sheep,
judged me for
like,
reading books, I guess.
Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, not big on the thinking that, man. Very well.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't think we would have like middle school level bullying in adulthood, but here we are.
I found it interesting. Like if you were
What did you say that made him upset? I'm sure he didn't reach out for no reason.
Politico posted that President Trump wrote that he wants to hire RFK for HHS, and he confirmed it. And I wrote, it's a sad day for us in healthcare.
I see.
And he took offense to that.
Yeah.
Why would people take offense to that? RFK's a fucking moron. I don't understand. I don't understand like the supreme cope here, like of RFK. He's not good. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's skeptical of polio vaccine, saying that the vaccine might have killed more people than it saved. Why are people cum guzzling this guy who's a chain smoker? I don't get it.
Politics makes the mind go a little crazy at times. Yeah, book reading is good, makes you smarter. So on
Well,
and so
apparently
forth.
not. Apparently makes
not.
you a sheep doctor.
Sure.
And he said I was indoctrinated.
Yeah,
but the doc was in quotes.
Lots of indoctrination going around. I assume he probably mislabeled you, but lots of indoctrination. So you got to take the good with the bad. But I digress.
Yeah. So you're saying the Paul brothers.
The Prime drink. It just tastes really good, man.
You like
Just
it?
I don't particularly like it. I think it's fine. It's not
So
my
how are you
favorite.
saying it tastes good?
Everyone I've ever talked to around me says it's amazing. And
Really?
they're like, absolutely. And
Interesting. Okay.
like
I feel like it's
making
been split.
Yeah, sure. It's like, so it tastes good enough for lots of people to buy it.
Right.
And there are no Pepsi Cola hardliners left to defend Pepsi's enterprise. If something's better, people just buy it. Tesla with Elon Musk.
What do you mean? RFK just tweeted that he's going to remove high fructose corn syrup in Coca-Cola and put cane sugar in it, and that's going to fix our problem.
Thank God. Finally, someone looking out for the people.
I feel like the way that we probably need to operate if you want to make people healthier is to try to remove sugar from things in general. Sugar is very addictive. It's from things I've seen, it's like just as addictive as like cigarettes and other very hard drugs. Maybe it's time to legitimately think about banning sugar. You know, maybe I just need that because I'm so fat. But honestly, I think that non-sugar, like sugar substitutes, taste better to me anyway. I like Diet Coke more. I don't know. It's just me. But I mean, sugar can, like, anything can be good in moderation, but like sugar is very addictive, and you have a bunch of fat people eating a mixture of carbs and fats. It's usually sugars and like some kind of saturated fat, and they're getting addicted to it. So we should probably think about doing something like maybe a sugar tax things at a greater rate for sugar. And then you fat fucks like me who eat a lot of sugar, you take that tax money and you invest it into healthcare for fat fucks. It's the same thing that we do with cigarettes. Cigarettes have a huge sin tax on them. What do they do with that? They send people resources if they want to quit smoking. That's how I think we should engage in all addictive substances. Tax the fuck out of it. And then if you still utilize it, maybe like send people resources that can help them no longer engage with that. Right? So I don't think it's a terrible idea. It's something to think about.
I mean, like, come on, like, if we're talking about science.
Yeah. So,
and hold on, the whole RFK situation, isn't that the prime example of terrible nepotism in success?
I don't think RFK is a nepotistic thing. I think RFK just really like connects with people in a really simple and plain way.
Mike, come on.
Well, yeah, he does, because he appeals to stupid people with that have conspiracy theory, like conspiracy fucking brain rot.
That's serious.
Yeah,
like,
but how did he?
There's lots of other Kennedys which are really annoying, and people
there's a lot
hate.
of RFKs walking around right now that are not in the level of where he is simply because of his family.
What do you think his family did for him to help him out specifically?
Money.
Like, what did he use the
money and just appearance? Like, he is RFK. He's a Kennedy. His existence in any political context is because of that. There's nothing of particular intelligent value from this guy. He's dumb as fuck. He thinks that the polio vaccine. He questions that the polio vaccine might have killed more people than it saved. Okay, we have to like get to a point where we stop doing mental gymnastics. He's a fucking moron. He's a fucking idiot. Now he has to walk that back because he might be getting an actual position in the government. But what are you talking about? What the hell is Dr. Mike talking about? Arky's a fucking moron.
The money for? How did he use the money to become famous?
How did he run his presidential campaign? How did he get?
Nobody gave him a chance. The only reason people give him chances because he's a Kennedy.
Media. How did he hire
he used
PR?
private Kennedy money for that?
Of course.
I thought it was fundraising.
He lived. Well, yeah. How do you get fundraisers?
You have to have influence.
How do you get attention? How do you create people to want to pay attention to you?
Sure, born famous. I guess just because you're a Kennedy, it's real tough to get a lot of things going behind you. I think he has some special qualities. I think he comes off as...
I mean, maybe, but he might have some special qualities, but he's a fucking idiot.
Incredibly genuine when he's conversing, which is super important. He doesn't have that Hillary Clinton, that Illuminati stare where you're like,
what?
There's no one in there, is there?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a good thing.
Yeah, people seem to like it. And
sure, true, okay.
So I think that's probably mostly why. Now, obviously, the Kennedy name doesn't hurt, and nepotism in politics is a much bigger deal than in economics.
Well, wait, go back to the Paul brothers of it all. I want to see where you're going with that.
The prime drink is good because it's good, and people don't care. They don't care who made it. They're not trying to honor anyone's memory.
You don't? You don't think they're buying it because they want to support Logan, or they love Logan, or they think he's...
Well, yeah, of course that's why people buy Prime, because they like Logan Paul. What are you talking about?
Cool.
No, there's not enough people that like him to make that economics work for like regular stores and stuff. Hell no.
Yeah. Yes, there are. What are you talking about?
You think random people that are going in to buy Prime that made it what it is don't know who Logan Paul is?
Oh my God, tons. Yeah, I barely know who Logan Paul.
I disagree with this. I think that this is an instance of somebody not understanding how like absolutely influential social media is. Like there's absolutely like there's that you don't seem to understand how influential social media is. There are tons of kids. That's why people buy like Lunchleys. Mr. Beast is like massively popular. The online atmosphere is much more mainstream than it ever has been before. It's much realer. When you see people like Trisha Paytas, a fairly obscure internet person, going on Saturday Night Live, when you have people like the Big Justice and AJ, the Costco guys, going on AEW wrestling, we start to realize like how much social media is life now. That's why when people are like, oh, Twitter, like free speech on Twitter and stuff, there's a reasonable argument to be made there because we're like, these are our public squares now. You're just more confident saying extraordinarily racist, weird shit. So what?
All is, I think him was a brother named Jake or something like that. Like I couldn't pick him. I couldn't tell him apart.
I mean, like almost 100 million people watch Jake fight Mike Tyson.
Yeah. I mean, I watch a lot of shows with lots of famous people. I don't go running.
And Dr. Mike is a little out of touch. I still love Dr. Mike. He's so extraordinarily intelligent when it comes to exercise science, but like socially, Dr. Mike's he's out of touch. He's very out of touch.
To buy their drink all the damn time.
Right, because social media creates a parasocial relationship, which is much stronger.
If their drink sucked, and maybe it's not that great, and maybe time will tell, No one gives a shit.
Yes, absolutely. But that's the thing. That's typically how like these nepotistic things work. Somebody with like an equal ability or even lesser ability than another person has some kind of influence. So their product gets pushed out there, even if it's an inferior product, because it's still acceptable. There's a level of acceptableness that people want to hit. As long as you hit that, if you're a popular person, people will engage with that thing. That's how these things work. What the fuck are you talking? Like, sorry, I'm getting a little too worked up. What are you talking about? That's why people still watch H3H3 instead of Papa Gut, because I am better, but you're already familiar. So here's Papa Gut, here's H3, right? I'm up here. Keep that in mind. Just okay. He sucks, bro. He sucks, dude. But you still watch it because you're familiar with him, dude. But get familiar with these. Get familiar with that. Thank you for $5 from Ruby X Daisy. I love that he says so confidently, like no one in the world would ever do these things. I personally almost voted for RFK because of JFK. Well, let's see. There you go. Then you did research. There you go.
No one's buying your drink because it sucks. You can say you like a bunch of stuff. You're not going out of your way to drink a shitty drink. You might do it once or twice. Like, oh, I really wanted to like Jake Paul's drink. Didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, but that's the point. It's probably a decent tasting drink, but he got his start because he's a creator, and there's creator confidence there that investors are willing to invest in.
If it's good, it's good. And over the long term, people who are able to innovate and create great things rise to the top of the ability to have great wealth and influence. And it doesn't happen quickly in all places. But in a relatively more free economy like that of the United States, it happens at a substantial rate. So while nepotism is still a thing, over the long term, nepotism is really difficult to hold on to unless there's an aggregate effect of nepotism actually.
Well, sure, but like, it's just so weird to talk about nepotism like it's an irrelevance. It is very relevant. It gets people employed. But yes, it can fall off if it hits a point of unacceptability. But when it comes to nepotism, people are more likely to hire somebody that they know, even if they're not as good, than they are taking a risk on somebody that might be amazing. Because the chances are you're probably going to have a better shot at them being good, or even better than that. What?
Making better products and services for people, which is why when you run a Fortune 500 company and your ass is on the line for how the stock does, nepotism becomes a really faint whisper. If someone's like, Google had a bad year, and someone in Google's like, hey, you need to hire my son, the board is going to be like, are you out of your fucking mind? Like, we need killers. We need people to turn this thing around.
Yeah, nepotism isn't necessarily bad. It has its benefits. But like, my problem isn't that Dr. Mike's saying like, hey, nepotism can be good, because that's a fair point. What he's saying is that nepotism is not a big deal. And that's like my issue. Is like, yeah, nepotism can be a very big deal.
When everyone's ass is on the line, nepotism becomes a cruel joke. And what people really want is raw, ruthless, greedy capitalism, people that can make stuff happen. And over the long term, that means that most of the people that can make stuff happen end up being a real smorgasbord of individuals, most of whom don't have nepotism. You look at all the best people in industry around New York, San Francisco, LA, bro, it's a goddamn rainbow out here. Like I straight up have a policy of hiring as many Nigerians as possible, as I've yet to meet a Nigerian that's not amazing at everything. I don't give.
Well, that makes sense because they have like a really incredible culture. Like Nigerian culture is really good when you mix it with like America. Same thing with like Asian people. They have like a really good culture, but then they come into a more charitable, richer society, and then like they thrive really, really well here. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I get that, but
I don't know. They're very distant.
But then you have another conversation of like, okay, if a Nigerian's able to come here, they probably had decent money and connections just to get here in the first place. Like this is one of the things, especially about a lot of countries that are not close to us. Like, is that the people who are able to come and like immigrate here from other countries that aren't like directly south of our border, that they can come here and like seek asylum, for instance. But people who are let in legally typically are the better of other countries. You're usually getting people with like a little more money, a little bit more influence, a little bit more intelligent. You're kind of brain draining other countries and you're pulling them in. So of course you'd expect a Nigerian that immigrated here to be better than the average American, 1000%, because for them to get here legally and go through the legal process, their family probably had to be intelligent and have some wealth, and you probably had to be a good kid. And like, that's why you come here with a very good culture that focuses on hard work and a very accepting, and empathetic society where you can thrive in. Of course, like you have to keep all these factors here though.
Genetically related to me. I don't care. They're just awesome.
What do you take away from the fact that most family businesses fail after 2 or 3 generations? I forgot what the exact.
Nepotism's not that great then, huh?
With 2 generations isn't like 100 years.
Well,
most businesses in general fail within several years. So I'm not sure how to put that statistic in line with the family statistic. You know what I mean?
I think about nepotism and how it demotivates, but those people still have generational wealth that continues to earn the money. So I don't know, but let's move on off the nepotism topic, because I do want to discuss about the topic that you brought up obesity
Yes.
and how it's impacted by perhaps genetics, social standing. And I've had tons of conversations about this with food industry experts, food political people. Just last week, it's not public yet, but we had an interview with a bariatric surgeon who's a director of the NYU bariatric program here, endocrinologists to talk about GLP-1 medications, and they all kind of have a slightly different take on all of it. So I'm curious what your take is.
Well, they're all wrong. I'm just the smartest.
Obviously, you're Dr. Mike.
And the most handsome.
There's no Dr. Mike.
When you arrive at the Dr. Mike status, you're just, that's nepotism.
Yeah, that's done.
Right? Like, get on in here. Enjoy the wealth. So this has been a passion of mine for a long time because I'm an astute, dilettante, delusional, recreational student of economics.
There's a lot of verbiage. I failed SAT.
Excellent.
I can't keep up with that.
Same. So I just made up a few words. And I have been poorer than almost every American because I'm from the Soviet Union. There's a level of poverty that is difficult to comprehend. I was high on edible marijuana one day, and I had this revelation that back when I was younger, and still to this day, I have like an odd nostalgia for the 50s in the United States. Yeah, say, like the good old days.
Mad Men.
That kind of shit. And I was like, I think I figured out maybe why. It's because in the 1980s in the Soviet Union, we were kind of at economically a similar level as the 1950s in the United States.
Maybe not even so.
Bro, exactly. I asked ChatGPT, and it's usually really polite. And it was slightly less polite and more like, God, no. The Soviet Union in the 1980s was like America in the 1910s or something. I was like, oh my God. So that was thrown out entirely. So, levels of poverty to where like people say like, there's people say like, I'm struggling to eat, and you look at them, they have a BMI of 35, and you're like, that can't possibly be true in a way that you're describing.
Yeah, I'm struggling to eat right now.
If it's linear. But back in the Soviet Union, like, yes, like getting food was by no means clear a thing that you were able to do every day. So then, I had all these experiences growing up, and then I was taught later in various school programs that poverty was a cause of obesity. And I found that to be baffling, and I've been trying.
Yeah, that's a very American thing. Like in America, like it's a very real thing to be fat, poor, and stupid. It's very interesting.
Trying to digest it ever since.
Okay.
I mean, that must be just because we had better technologies that are like caught up with the times. You know what I mean? Like over here, so it's easier. You can be like, you're like, a lot of times fat people can be lazy. Like I can be obviously lazy. Overeating. I think there's an addiction conversation there too.
And I have been perusing.
I think that's the biggest thing. It's like an addiction conversation, right? When people are addicted, if people are addicted to like heroin, they're gonna do it regardless. Like they're gonna get her done, right?
Various fields of literature to try to align my ideas on a subject, and I've come away with some maybe take home.
You mean to prove yourself right?
Sense. And to prove not just to prove myself right, but to give me that feeling inside that fuck, I just got it all figured out. Me,
a little
me.
Cognitive reassurance.
Generally, I just stare at a picture of myself, and that's good enough. But sometimes ideas get in there. So I didn't like everything I found out. So the following is heavily caveated to say I mean it all in the best possible way. Don't kill the messenger sort of situation.
We're going to kill you. Don't worry.
Oh God. There's a few people in the studio. Which one is it coming from? So as long as I'm sacrificed for big pharma, all is well. Yeah. And here's kind of how it looks to me. The typical argument or arguments for poverty causing obesity, if you ask a next level of questions about them, things start to fall apart. Level one of questions is like, how do people with more resources with which to buy food end up buying less food?
Can I play devil's advocate on all those questions?
Absolutely, every single one, because I have many retorts to every single advocacy point you're going to
so say the first question. How do people with more resources,
how do people who are wealthier seem to be consuming less of a thing that costs money than more?
It's probably because food is like healthier foods are more expensive and they're more nutrient dense and they're more filling. That's number one. That's the number one for the answer there. Thank you for $5 from Kells 840. Papa G, guess what? What's up?
It is at least requires a more complicated logic. And as you know, with Occam's razor, the more complex your logic becomes, just on very carte blanche levels of thinking, it becomes less likely to be true. So if someone says, okay, you take someone from the 1600s and you go, when people get richer, they get fatter. They're like, facts. And like, just kidding. It's actually the reverse. They're going to be like, what? It is, at face value, seems to be very confusing.
Sure.
And so you have
there's a lot of that in science, though.
Sure, of course. And then you have to start walking down of like, well, what are the intricacies here? And we can address all the intricacies in turn. And they start to paint a little bit of a different picture, a picture that is not super politically correct, but also can be, I think, more closely aligned with reality, because one of the big stumbling blocks in reasoning that people have on this subject is you don't want to be the person that is derisive to the poor as a social class.
Thank you for the $5 from Kells 840. Chicken butt. Incredible. Thank you.
It's real fun to make fun of rich people. It's actively funny. It's within the Overton window.
It's safe.
It's safe.
Okay.
Not so with poor people.
What are you talking about?
Considered
You can make fun of fat people though.
unbecoming. In the same way, if you say, well, rich people exhibit XYZ qualities because it's their fault, people are like, that's right, fuck them. You say that about poor people, a lot of people don't like that because it gives them very sad feelings inside. We should not be bound by how we feel about things to be able to elucidate what is actually going on, so that in that third order, we can help everyone, including poor people, navigate difficulties better.
Sure.
So the idea that we're going to pretend that poor people are sort of like protected against any kind of moral reasoning on our behalf, I think just needs to be discarded right up front.
Well, let's get more specific with it than talking about abstract. Like, let's say the notion of access of healthy food and the preponderance of processed food in someone's cabinet that is poor.
Yeah, makes more sense.
Much higher likelihood to have cheaper food that is likely to be ultra processed, that is likely to create a habit of overconsumption, less satiating food, and as a result, potentially lead to their obesity. True or false?
True.
So then what's the retort for it?
Highly processed, convenient food is by no means the cheapest kind of food there is, not by a long shot.
Yes, it is. What are you talking about? It's 100% the cheapest food when it comes to energy to create, and also when it comes to food deserts. It doesn't matter how poor your area is, there's a 7-Eleven that sells taquitos. But finding access to a Walmart superstore that sells decent food is a little bit more difficult. That's like a 20-minute drive in some instances, which can be very difficult for people that live in like a food desert area. So unhealthier food is generally more expensive, and there's an addiction process. Nobody is addicted to eating chicken, rice, and lettuce. But people absolutely are addicted to tons and tons of saturated fats and sugars.
The cheapest kind of food there is by a long shot is largely unprocessed basic food, like bulk bought rice, not even bulk bought, any kind of white rice, canned vegetables, reduced price high fat meats, and other such products. Canned beans are almost free. Calorie per calorie and nutritional content per nutritional content, they're undefeated. There is a
How do you know that?
Through looking into it substantially.
What are those people not doing?
Which people?
The poor people.
Oh boy, so that's its own thing. But just to finish the thought really quick, the real cheapest way to get the best nutritional food is to buy those kinds of essential basics and not convenient snack foods. Personal story time. Not that this matters, because personal stories are mostly just like, oh, I'm an N of one. Just for the people that'll be like, this guy's rich, whatever. My parents were highly conscientious when we came to the United States. And the first time we had McDonald's was like 2 years into being here. Mm-hmm. And it was considered an unbelievable treat.
Yeah, same here.
Same,
yeah.
Right? That is
like I remember being with my dad and my friend, and I wanted a burger really badly. But I knew my dad would have to pay for a burger for my friend, and I was like, I'm not going to ask for it because I'm embarrassed. I don't want him to pay for it.
100%. Yeah. So like that clashes substantially with a conventional narrative of like, well, burgers are cheap, like compared to what? My parents and your parents were buying basics type of food.
Well, burgers used to be really cheap. Back when like White Castle was the first place to actually make burgers in America. And back then, like ground beef was considered dog food. So they just put onions in it. And it's like, hey guys, we're going to sell these for like, 5 pennies. And they're like, wow, this is so good and cheap. And then they kind of just spawned this.
Suspect mine were for sure. I can't speak for you, but it seems like they were. Yeah. And so that already puts a little bit of a situation, because people like to envision that poor people are all relatively homogenous. It's absolutely not true. We can at least bifurcate them into 2 categories that we did earlier. Poor people of higher conscientiousness, poor people of lower conscientiousness. If you say they're all the same,
that's not the only factor. It's hard to say that's the one dividing factor.
It is probably by far the biggest dividing factor into how life outcomes occur for almost everyone, short of intelligence.
So social experiments like the marshmallow experiment, the delayed gratification of it all, do you believe that is a signal?
Oh, I know what they're talking about now, the delayed gratification, which is like, hey, leave this marshmallow here. You can have this marshmallow now, or you can wait 25 minutes and we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And it's like the delayed gratification. And then you have like some people who will just take the first one because they're like lazy or whatever. Okay. Hey, thank you so much for the gifted membership from Kells840. I appreciate that.
You know, of conscientiousness. Jesus Christ.
That took a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why has the replication of it been a disaster?
Well, that was the one like done on like 4-year-olds and shit, right?
Yeah. They had the kids come in and they tracked them for their lives to say like, those who exhibited delayed gratification were able to have higher SAT scores, decreased crime rates, like basically what you're saying, that they were able to exhibit this one factor at this age, and that on the whole projected a greater success in their life, what we deem success. And then when we try to replicate that, we A, don't see that same pattern occur, and B, when we relook at the past data, we see that the poorer kids who didn't have marshmallows just grabbed at the first marshmallow and then had lives that were in a position where they had less access to education, to proper discipline, to those things that perhaps poor kids don't have access to, then have worse outcomes. So it was like, are we really looking at the delayed gratification, or are we looking at a more systemic issue here? And that's an interesting point.
The amount of evidence for trait conscientiousness impacting human lives throughout the lifespan is like 1 million times stronger than the marshmallow experiment, of which I'm not familiar with any serious behavioral geneticist that cites research to that effect for how important conscientiousness is. Psychometricians, behavioral geneticists, if you look up trait conscientiousness, how it expresses itself in life, the evidence for its enormous power in guiding people through their lives is overwhelming.
When do you measure it?
Say it again?
When do you measure it? And how do you measure it?
You can measure it at any point in a person's lifespan. The problem with measuring young children is that the correlation of whatever traits you have when you're very young to when you're old is actually quite low. And so, like, you know, when people have like a 4-year-old that's like, he's the genius for his age, like.
Well, yeah, I understand that. So the counter argument to the marshmallow experiment is like, oh, they only have to wait 15 minutes and these kids are too fucking stupid to do that. They just have a fundamental lack of understanding. But then when you present a real world scenario where it's instead of a kid, it's an adult, you can't say wait 15 minutes for a second marshmallow. You say wait 20 years for an actual retirement. And it becomes much more difficult to engage in. And that's why, like, you would compare this to a retirement thing. Do you want to spend some money now to feel better about yourself, or do you want to save money for 20 years and have like a decent retirement? It's difficult for people to process that information correctly and like save money in a meaningful way sometimes because they have life stressors. They have life stressors. But also sometimes it just doesn't seem like that time will ever come.
A lot of times that just ends up being quite regular later. He just got there earlier. But you can measure conscientiousness through a variety of behaviors in an ethnographic context. You just watch people do what they do and take very diligent notes. You can do it in an anthropological context. You can do it in a cultural context, studying different cultures. You can do it with a variety of validated tests like the Big Five personality, the Ocean scale. The Ocean scale is probably the most common one, and you can administer various tests of that nature to people of very many age ranges and situations.
How crazy are the ads right now where you guys are complaining about them? I have them on the lowest ad settings I possibly can. Are they that intrusive? I'll have to take this up with YouTube.
And they all give you a hint as to what's going on. But on aggregate, they paint a very, very similar picture overall.
So it's not the fact that there's a correlation between that trait and something else societally in their lives that's going well.
Let's see if there's something I can do about that.
Both. But there's a causal effect as well. Because conscientious people over time make different choices. Highly conscientious people make different choices than lower conscientious people. We also know that conscientiousness is profoundly genetic. Maybe 50% of conscientious behavior is accounted for entirely by the genes. The rest of it is a little bit mysterious as to how it aggregates. We're not entirely sure how that happens. There seems to be no very dependable way to massively improve conscientiousness.
Let's try that. I did like a manual change to it. It should lower them drastically. I didn't think that this is like I have it on like the lowest ad setting. It's crazy.
With any kind of top-down intervention that we have done before, having peaceful communities that give you a decent degree of education probably has some effect on that, but seemingly not as big of an effect on how we want. We also know that what your common home environment was, like how you were raised by your parents, has almost no effect on your conscientiousness as an adult, if any effect whatsoever.
What?
On how we want. We also know that what your common home environment was, like how you were raised by your parents, has almost no effect on your conscientiousness as an adult, if any effect whatsoever. It's actually a little controversial to say almost.
How? Well, how does that? The quality of wishing to do one's work or duty well or thoroughly. Like, what do you mean? Oh, that's not a conscientiousness. It's like what is
conscientiousness?
Oh, it is. Wait, like when he says conscientious, I'm assuming it's like people who are basically self-aware. How does that have nothing to do with that?
Almost no effect.
Well, what about the effect of emotional regulation? If you have higher levels of what we call adverse childhood experiences, your emotional regulation is lower than that of someone who has less adverse childhood.
Are those studies controlling for genetics? Because almost none of
how do you control for genetics?
Twin and adoption studies. Because when you look at the twin and adoption literature, a lot of that stuff completely disappears.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it specifically within the twin world.
Twin, I mean, I just feel like that's such a specific, like when you do twin adoption studies, that's just so difficult because nobody's doing twin adoption studies en masse. I just feel like there's not enough of a control, like enough of a group to be able to engage with that. Like, because we're not separating tons and tons and tons and tons of twins. So I don't know how, I don't know. I think it makes me skeptical.
But knowing that you just said it's 50% genetic and 50%
Roughly.
Something else that we don't know.
Sure.
What does that mean for the fact that those who are poor are more likely to be obese?
Yeah. So I can split it. I can simplify the matter. two kind of different kinds of poor people. One kind of poor person has all of this kind of social burden foisted upon them, and they're doing their goddamn best. They're scrimping and saving. They're thinking long term. They're concerned about their health. They're concerned about their body weight. They're concerned about the choices of what kind of foods they're putting in their bodies, how it affects other things. They're trying to raise their children in a very diligent way. They don't spend excessively, and so on and so forth. Like I said earlier, those people don't tend to stay poor over the long term. Sometimes, through a variety of unfortunate circumstances, they stay poor. Like someone who's incredibly conscientious, but has incredibly financially burdensome medical condition will continue to stay poor and conscientious, which is a tragedy, obviously. But there's another kind of poor person who is also poor, but exhibit very low trait conscientiousness, which means they just have a 1 day, 1 minute at a time, what I feel like doing, massive bias in their thinking and in their choice structure.
The emotional regulation of it all.
Sure. The emotional regulation presupposes there is a desire to regulate emotion. There are two ways emotional dysregulation can present itself. One,
Yeah, I mean,
Well, yeah, no, it doesn't. It doesn't presuppose that you have to have a desire. The lack of emotional regulation is sometimes just more of a genetic or environmental scenario where like you just don't necessarily care because you weren't grown in a way that allowed you to have the ability to be more emotionally regulated. Usually not having the techniques to engage in emotional regulation. That takes a long time and like a certain type of person to be able to instill into a person. Like, what is he talking about?
the
I disagree.
ability, whether or not they want to.
sure, but conscientiousness speaks to wants. People who are conscientious but have, let's say, profound attention deficit disorder, know they need to be making better choices.
Yeah.
Desperately pray to God they can make better choices, but just keep getting off track because they can't maintain their attention and have a high degree of impulsivity. People with low trait conscientiousness
Just
don't care about making good choices nearly as much as they care about what's going to be fun and pleasurable for me to do now. And it's not even a value judgment. Fuck it, YOLO is a way of life, bro. And it's a decent way of life, but it's going to lead to different outcomes. So if I am a poor person in the United States, I have a high degree of trait conscientiousness, I can easily make a variety of choices that will entirely prevent me from becoming obese in many circumstances. There's another
everybody can, but it's like access to those, and like there's different stressors there. Especially like if you're fat, you're probably addicted to the food too.
component to this, which I'm excising for now, about food drive, which is also mostly genetic, which is critical to this discussion. I'll leave that for just a little later. If you're poor and someone tells you, well, I don't expect you to be fit because it's impossible for you, and you have high trait conscientiousness and you've thought this through for like 15 minutes, you're going to be like, Planet Fitness costs $10 a month. It's also irrelevant to go to a gym because you could do bodyweight exercise and have a high degree of physical activity for free anywhere. Any food you eat, you could just eat less of and become however much body weight you want. And if you're struggling with hunger, you can buy less palatable, actually more expensive foods and buy basic beans and rice like Abuela raised you to eat. And all of a sudden, like you just don't overeat that because it's just not that good.
Yeah, but that's just excluding the educational factor to all these things. Like for one, you can very easily go to the gym. I don't think there's two struggles to going to the gym. The first is going to the gym, but the second is knowing what you're doing when you go to the gym. Everybody's been there going to the gym and like, what do you do? Like you have to look into solid exercise education, usually through reading books like Starting Shrink by Mark Ripto. That's a great resource to start with. I'm always going to say that. Wendler 531, great ebooks. Watching Dr. Mike's channel is also a great idea. But it takes a certain level of education that you have to engage in to be able to put together, run a routine that's like intelligent. And you have to get a solid routine, learn your body so you know when like you're training too much, what is a good and bad technique. That's another thing you have to learn right off the bat there. So that satisfies that first argument. It's not as easy as like, oh yeah, it's simple, go to the gym. But like, what do you do when you get there? It can be very complicated. When it comes to eating the right foods, again, it's an educational conversation. Like a lot of these are like, yeah, it sounds so simple when you have all the resources, but when you don't have the resources, when you don't have a level of understanding of these things, it's not so simple anymore.
Buy basic beans and rice want. And if you're struggling with hunger, any food you eat, you could just eat less of and become however much body weight you want. And if you're struggling with hunger, you can buy less palatable, actually more expensive foods and buy basic beans and rice like Abuela raised you to eat. And all of a sudden, like you just don't overeat.
Yeah, it's a lot of it's a lot of it's just like a conversation about education.
That because it's just not that good. We've seen that one of the sole explanatory factors for the rise in obesity is the ubiquity of high palatability foods everywhere, super cheap. If you don't access those, it saves you money and you become more fit. So,
but it's not just about that. It's about people that are struggling with addiction problems, right? Like if you're obese, it's probably less to do with the fact that you don't have money for it and more to do with the fact that you are addicted. It's the same thing with like drug addicts that they will find ways to pay for drugs, right? They will find ways to pay for drugs. It doesn't matter. You see heroin addicts on the street all the time. They're skinny, but they find ways and they'll do stuff for it. It's the same thing with fat people that are eating. It's an addiction problem. People are eating foods that they want to because it feels good. It makes them feel good. And there's a level of addiction. Like sugar is a very addictive substance. That's what it comes down to. So it's like, oh, well, just buy better foods, make better choices. Absolutely, you should. It's very simple, but it's not easy, especially when you have like a legitimate addiction. Eating is an addiction to something, and we need to like acknowledge that, because we probably should do something about how easily accessible it is to have all these, addictive substances and like different foods. Like we should probably have a conversation about some kind of a sugar tax. We should probably have a conversation about fast foods restaurants like selling people pretty intensely unhealthy things. That's the conversations we need to actually have. But
actual impediments to achieving fitness and health to poor people essentially almost don't exist. If you have trait conscientiousness very highly, if you have low trait conscientiousness,
of course it exists. People don't necessarily know what to do when they're at the gym.
It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, because you're just going to YOLO the shit. Whatever you feel like eating, that's what goes in. And McDonald's just tastes better. Now, you're not getting spaghetti, steak, and shrimp because you're not a rich motherfucker, but you can afford very high palatability foods, chips and soda and ice cream. That's all very affordable to you, and that's what you want. And if people say, like, what about your fitness and health? Generally, your opinion is like, and that's a totally fine opinion, but it's going to lead to some kind of outcomes. If you're ultra wealthy, you're in low conscientiousness, there's a high probability you're going to end up exactly as fat as someone who is poor and low conscientiousness. There was a study that came out about 10 years ago.
Yeah, but if you're rich, you can afford a personal trainer that knows what they're talking about. That's like the difference.
Food deserts. I don't like that term. It highly insults people who have actually dealt with real food insecurity. You go to the Soviet Union in 1988, that's a fucking food desert, right? Mm-hmm. And they took a look at the data, and they said that people who had access to vehicles to leave the food desert to go to mega conglomerate grocery stores became and were fatter than the people that didn't, because they had the same low conscientiousness and not a distinct desire to be fit and healthy and lean. So when they went to the bigger mega grocery stores, they just got even better versions of the same fun snacks that they had slightly less access to inside the food deserts. So a person's individual proclivity of how they want to eat and what they want to put in their bodies, whether or not, to what degree they care about it, is something that's not discussed much in the medical community. Because again, like, first of all, what are you going to do about it? Telling low conscientiousness.
I feel like it is, though. We're starting to talk more about food addictions. Right? That's what this is. It's a food addiction.
It's just people, they have to care about their body weight and their health and think forward. It's usually very ineffective.
Well, yeah, people don't care about their health because they just don't see a reason to care. That's really what it boils down to. They're just like, yeah, I don't really care. That's why they're not caring about their health, because they just feel like there's no way out. Everything is so stressful.
Insanely pedantic and paternalistic. And doctors usually have a very realistic approach. I'm going to try to help you in the way that I can. And if I tell you to eat healthy and you don't listen to me, we're going to medications. Is just the only thing I can do. So when you take a look at the two sort of very artificial groupings of poor people, if you have high conscientiousness and you're poor, all of the systemic factors keeping you obese seem to disappear almost entirely. And if you are...
So how do you gain conscientiousness? Like, what's the solution? Because we're talking about this, but I want to know, like, what is his solution to all these problems?
Of low conscientiousness, whether you're rich or poor, and you have a high food drive, you're going to be obese 99 times out of 100.
Eliminating highs and lows. 50th percentile people. They're the ones we're talking about when we're talking about generalizations. So why are we talking about high conscientiousness versus low?
Yeah, because...
Let's talk about middle.
Sure.
Where the majority of people live.
Yeah. Because poverty,
within one standard deviation.
Totally. That's a great question. On average, poor people tend to exhibit lower trait conscientiousness than richer people.
Which could be due to social factors.
Maybe,
as you said.
Maybe. The social factors are definitely a component of that, but we know that genetic factors are a massive component of that as well. And whether or not they're social or genetic, the conscientiousness is such a huge effector variable for everything else that that's kind of where the rubber meets the road.
So are you saying we need to target the conscientiousness of people in order to actually make change, not actually the food deserts, not what they're eating? The trait is what we need to figure out ways to impact. Is that the takeaway of it?
No. I think that's a fine idea. My contention is that if we target food deserts, if we target big evil food companies, we are not targeting the core onus of why obesity is higher in poor people. And the reason it's higher in poor people is a two-factor situation. This really explains, I think, probably 80+% of the variance.
This is your theory.
Hypothesis. Yeah, theory is that gravitation, evolution, et cetera. Much lower than theory.
Right. I say theory in the non-scientific way.
Yes, stop doing that.
Yes.
So the biggest determinants of your body weight and proclivity to obesity in the modern world is going to be a two-factor system: your trait conscientiousness degree of that and your degree of food drive. How much do you like food? How much do you like to eat? How big of a deal is tasty food to you? You no doubt have some friends that they'll eat 3.5 chips and they're like, that's pretty good. They just sit there. You're like, the fuck? I get into some chips. I eat the whole bag. Food is amazing. Not everyone is like that, right?
Sure.
So if you have someone who's a relatively low trait conscientiousness and they have a high degree of food drive, even if they're poor, they can still afford to be grotesquely obese. No problem. In the modern context. Back in the day, that was not the case. If you have someone who's wealthy and has any given food drive, they definitely have more of an arsenal to shoot. They can buy foods that are more filling, but are still tasty, like very good Trader Joe's, Whole Foods type of shit.
Yeah.
That definitely has an effect, but they have to have some impetus to go buy those
Also,
foods and give a
pharmaceuticals.
shit.
Because access to pharmaceuticals.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that when you have access to, when you're richer, you're probably eating really good food. If you're kind of poor and you want to like eat something shitty and addictive, which that's what it boils down to, you're going to eat McDonald's. If you're rich though, you can go have a fucking steak, which is going to be more nutrient dense, and you're going to be in a better spot. I would say that's like a huge factor to a lot of these things. My boyfriend still refers to you as Papa Gat. He sends me your reels and says Papa Gat came up on my feed. Okay, incredible.
But especially these days, it's a big
Just
difference.
recently, for sure. Just recently. Because like just 2 years ago, no one knew about Ozempic and no one even used it.
Well, bariatric surgery existed.
Totally. Yeah, that's very
Well, bariatric surgery is a lot more of a commitment than Ozempic, just to be clear. And I think Ozempic is great, by the way. I'm on Mounjaro because I'm diabetic. So when people are like, "Oh, you shouldn't do it just for weight loss," I'm doing it for my diabetes. That's what the intention of the drug is. I think if that becomes accessible, people should be engaging in it. People who are overweight to a dangerous amount, they should be engaging in Ozempic or Mounjaro or Zepbound or whatever the alternative is. And you might say, "Well, yeah, but what about the side effects?" I don't know. What about the side effects of being morbidly obese? The reality is that like, yeah, it's lazy to go on some kind of Ozempic to lose weight, but like everybody only has so much of a capacity for doing things. We have a stress capacity. So you might be, a really good family member. You might be a good kid, a good parent, a good grandson, a good, grandma, blah, blah, blah. You might be great at work, a great friend. You might have all these different, emotional stressors that you're really good at, but you don't have enough left in your bucket to just lose weight because it can be difficult, especially if you're addicted to food, because that's a lot of times that's what happens. And so if you need some affordable Ozempic, which we should come up with, then why not? Yeah, you should be able to do that. Like, yes, it is lazy. Yes, there are side effects, right? Like it does paralyze your stomach to an extent. That's how you are full longer, which makes you have like more heartburn. It could lead to osteoporosis or I think a degradation of like your muscle mass. But that has a lot to do with the fact that you're not eating very much and you need to like stay up on fitness. But I would say that so far what we know, the negative side effects to Ozempic far outweigh being morbidly obese to the point where your blood is thickening. Which is going to put you at like a higher risk on your heart. You have high blood pressure, you have high cholesterol, high blood sugar, and you're like literally ruining and deteriorating your body. So like, yeah, Ozempic probably better. And if we can make it affordable, people who want to be able to be on it, it's better than being fat, at least from what we know now.
very extreme situations. Again, most people of low conscientiousness usually are not interested in bariatric surgery because they're like, well, why the hell would I go do that?
It's a lot of effort. That's why. It's a lot to do that. Like, it's a surgery. It could be scary.
It doesn't make sense to them why you would do that because they don't seem to have...
Again, we're talking about low conscientiousness versus...
Well, we're talking about, like, there's a risk. Like, fat people might just be like, oh, I don't really want to do that because that sounds scary. Because that's a very scary sounding thing to do, no? Like, is that not a factor?
The average.
Correct. So, again, on average, you have a larger fraction of low conscientiousness people that are poor than are rich.
But the reason for why they're there, we don't yet know.
We know some of it, but we don't even need to postulate that because we have this thing of poverty causes obesity. That's the notion. Actually, a combination of high food drive and low conscientiousness cause obesity.
Food drive.
It just so happens that people who are less wealthy on average also have lower trait conscientiousness.
I think that this is an over-intellectualization of the problem at hand, because I'm sure what he's saying is not necessarily wrong. But at the end of the day, being poor leads you to make bad choices because you're less educated. That's really what it boils down to. And it also opens you up to addictions, and that's really what it boils down to, I think. I think that, like, I'm fat. It's an addiction problem, right? Like, I'm eating like a fucking animal, and, like, I shouldn't be. I'm hurting myself, but I'm still doing it. It's the same thing as when you do any other type of illegal drug. You're hurting yourself. The only difference is we don't see sugar or addictive foods as an addiction problem, which we should, because it's a legitimate problem. Like, I probably have a mental disorder or some kind of a disorder. If you're eating to the point where you're like hurting yourself, you're slowly killing yourself, you have a problem. And we don't look at it like that. We don't understand how addictive like Oreos are and sugars are. And like, it's nice to say like, oh, just stop. But it's like, it's very difficult to stop engaging in an addiction. So what you're going to want to do is probably substitute it for a better addiction, which is probably like, yeah, weight training or like fitness is a better addiction to have. Try to do that. But then it can be difficult to do that because you need the proper resources, right? Because like it's difficult to find the proper resources for like weight training or exercise. So you might want to get a personal trainer, or you might want to read like, Starting Strength by Mark Ripto, just so you guys know. But I think people need to frame this as an addiction problem. Like sugar is an addiction. People are addicted to foods, and we have to look at it more like that.
It's like the situation with vitamin D, that those who have lower vitamin D levels have higher rates of certain illnesses. But then supplementing the vitamin D past the norm doesn't actually reduce the outcomes of those diseases. Sure. So much in the same way, when we talk about food drive, and you're talking about someone as that being one of the two variables that decide whether or not someone is obese, food drive is so impacted by social situations. One, if you're depressed, which if you're poor, there's a chance that you're not getting help for your mental health situations because we don't have great access to that in America.
True.
If you're poor, you have worse likelihood of developing adverse childhood events that lead to mental health conditions.
We're also in a massive transitionary period. When I was younger, we went outside and did a lot of things. I was always a chubby kid, but I was very physically active, very physically fit. I remember going to the YMCA and playing sports all the time. I was very active in the Boy Scouts. When I hit my early teenage years, that's when like Nintendo started becoming very popular. And all of a sudden, instead of getting up and eating like a dumbass animal, but then going outside and running around and riding my bike and doing all this, now we're sitting inside and we're playing video games. And also the political, not even political, but just the atmosphere around us is like afraid of everything. Back then you threw your kid out of the house and like you trusted the outside world so much, or you just didn't love your kids so much that they had to run advertisements that are like, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? Nowadays, everybody is so afraid to let their kid go outside. And they're like, just stay in and play Fortnite, because it sounds safer. And that's a whole conversation about how social media absolutely does beam information into your brain that makes you afraid of the world. Because realistically speaking, and generally speaking, year over year, we are getting healthier, or excuse me, we are getting safer as a society. But when you go on Twitter or X, whatever, or you go on TikTok or you go on Instagram or you go on any social media platform and you see this person just died because of this happened and this happened, you're like, oh my God, that could be me. I can't do this thing anymore. I'm afraid. That's what happens, because it's, even though it's 1,000, it's so far away from you, it seems so close up in your face. And so now we have like a society full of paranoia, and some of it can be healthy, but I think that we have just a general unhealthy consumption as a society, whether it's between food or the media that we engage with.
Who are likely to have been targeted by big food companies in their advertising, which has been proven through research for addictive products like ultra-processed foods. Cigarette companies will specifically target their advertisements based on zip code, based on...
Yeah, that's curious. I have a reason for why. Those people like those things better.
Right.
Yeah, because they're fucking addicted to them, Dr. Mike. What the hell's the matter with you?
Buy them more.
Correct.
Yes.
And that could be an education component. That could be a genetic component. It's probably a multifactorial component. But why I find...
I love Dr. Mike. That was the coldest take ever. Yeah, sometimes they will try to sell people, addictive substances based on zip code. Yeah, here's my theory. They like that. Yeah, people like the things they're addicted to. That's the point. That's how addiction works, Dr. Mike. They like it too much. That's what it is.
Find that interesting is because once those people are hooked on the product in a way where, not that food is addictive, and yes, it's true, it is addictive, and once you consume ultra-processed foods, you're constantly hungry, not satiated, you're craving all that stuff. But also, once you become obese, your epigenetics change of the fat cells. There was actually a recent study that came out, Eric Topol shared it on Twitter, where, again, in mice, so I have to give that prerequisite.
92% genetic similarity to humans. So you can extrapolate.
But still, I generally don't like jumping from mice to humans, but it is not illogical to see.
I don't know who this guy, I still love Dr. Mike. I think he's fantastic when it comes to fitness. I think that I love this conversation because I understand where Dr. Mike is coming from, the other Dr. Mike. So that's one thing I really respect, is that even though I disagree with almost everything Dr. Mike's saying, and I agree with actually what other Dr. Mike is saying, it's very rare that you'll see somebody have reasonable, logical arguments there. Like when you see Mike Israel talk about like how like people's food habits in America, I could see where some of that comes from, because he's angry a little, or he has some of his bias, because like when he was younger, he lived in Russia with true food deserts. So he's skeptical of the excuse for Americans. Totally understand, I can respect that. I don't even know where the fuck I was going with my point. I don't even know where I was going with my point. Fuck.
See how the creation of fat cells for storage then can impact your behavior as years go on, and the difficulty of escaping from those circumstances. So if you're a child that is born in an area that's poor, these are the things that are likely to happen, and they're not going to happen in every circumstance. Worse education, more targeting by big food companies, worse social situation from a mental health component, high likelihood of being fed ultra-processed foods by parents, which then raise your risk of being obese. then sets you up as an adult to regain that weight, even if you try and lose it, in a much easier way than someone who never had that issue that grew up.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And then you're saying here that the only reason is because of the trait conscientiousness?
Definitely not. I was explicit.
But those
that it was
two,
not the only
the
reason.
food
That's how it comes off, just to be clear. So thank you for the $5 from Pipex. Mike 1 and Mike 2. Yeah, right.
drive and the trait
They probably account for, I think, something like 80% of the variance. Yeah.
over what we just said.
Yeah, so all the other stuff you mentioned is insanely influenced by trait conscientiousness as the baseline variable.
Okay, but like this is the problem is that if your whole thing is like, yeah, it sounds like what he's saying is like, yeah, but the parents also lack conscientiousness. Okay. What does the word mean anymore? What is it an excuse to be like, oh, fuck? It sounds like Dr. Mike is using this concept of trait conscientiousness or whatever conscientiousness to just kind of like be like, oh, it's your fault a little bit. That's the weird thing. I'm surprised of that take. That's at least where I'm getting from. That's the energy I'm getting here, but I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm just missing. Maybe I'm not conscientious enough.
The reason that people have, let's say, a more crime-ridden environment is because more people around are low conscientiousness. The tie between conscientiousness and criminality is insanely high correlation.
Well, yeah, because they kind of like are in situations where they kind of need to, like that's kind of just how their culture is, and they don't care, and they don't see a path to like changing that. What?
So some of those same
I don't understand what he means when he says conscientiousness. It kind of feels like almost a dog whistle to like just not care about any of the issues going on in these certain areas.
people are more likely to be criminal prone. They're less likely to take care of their communities, leaving trash everywhere. They're more likely to make rapid choices based on desire. And
did you know that if you like leave trash in a community, it's so weird. I know this sounds so stupid, but like when something appears cleaner and nicer, people treat it better, you know? And so maybe part of it, maybe part of this equation is to, you know, make some of these areas nicer so people will have some value into them. I just thought it was an interesting thing.
thus make you next to them the proxy target of Big Food advertisement. Big Food didn't try to target poor people just because. You'd much rather target rich people with every product you sell because they have more money to spend. Curious why they would target the poor, because there are some large fraction of them that are low conscientiousness to begin with that want these sorts of things. They are.
This is what I'm talking about. It sounds like what he's saying is that it's your fault for being low conscientiousness, having low conscientiousness. It's just so bizarre, but like your entire atmosphere and surrounding is going to dictate significantly how, you know, self-aware, which is what I'm assuming he's saying, self-aware you are. So like, it's nice to keep saying, well, it's your fault because you don't have enough self-awareness. But it's like, how the fuck do you gain more self-awareness? That's a very deeply difficult thing to engage in. You need to have the right circumstances of proper education, but also financial abundance so that you have the ability to look outside of yourself. Because if you don't have enough money, you don't care about anything but yourself and your immediate family. So it's almost like a dog whistle of like, yeah, if you're poor, you can kind of go fuck yourself. That's how I'm interpreting it, at least.
Attractors for them, and they are the progenitors of many of these bad circumstances. Trauma doesn't come from the ether. Trauma comes from people being nasty around you. Most nastiness in humans is because people have a high degree of impulsivity and just kind of do what they want. That is the same variable of low conscientiousness.
It's not just impulsivity, though. Like it's not just impulsivity making people make bad choices. It's also an atmosphere of how much those bad choices are bad, right? Like when you have societies of where there's people with impulsivity issues and women don't have the same rights and people don't look at women as the same, sexually assaulting women isn't as bad in those societies as it is maybe in another society. Like if you live in a society that is much more educated with like equal women's rights and you're super fucking horny, you're probably not going to go assault a woman because you're going to get arrested. But if you live in a society that doesn't respect women, where they have such massive problems, where they have to have separate train cars for men and women, that society clearly communicates to you that if you have a lot of sexual feelings and you're feeling sexually impulsive, instead of maybe fucking jerking off in the middle of a bus, not doing that, but instead of going home and jerking off because you have to do that, which could be a problem in and of itself, you might go and like start feeling up on a girl and you might engage in some kind of like sexually exploitative behavior. I know that's a drastic example, but this is like, it's not just the particular behaviors of impulsivity. It's also the atmosphere that you're in and the acceptability of particular behaviors and impulses in those atmospheres. It's not just one thing.
Basically, in some large component, not totally, describing why things are the way they are with very poor communities, let's say in the United States.
I think the difference in our hypothesis is that I see how you've gotten to see such a strong correlation between low conscientiousness and outcomes in obesity.
Causation.
That's what I was going to get to. I see the very strong correlation that exists there, but at the same time, I see the very strong correlation as well as poor education, difficult circumstances, all those variables that are also very strongly correlated. And I want to know how you jump to the causation without having a trial that impacts the trait and then seeing a better outcome. When you said that trait can't really be changed.
Yeah. Behavioral genetics, twin and adoption studies, genealogy, heritability studies that show that your genetics is profoundly important as to how your life lays out in front of you.
Sure, but I would say the environment is equally as important.
Everything else becomes usually secondary unless it is extremely, extremely different from the norm, which definitely explains some of the variation with really nasty growing up circumstances, but not as much as many people would think. So if you ever dip into the behavioral genetics literature, and I encourage everyone listening to give it a shout, don't expect to be very cheery at the end of that dive. It's a real thing, man. It's a real thing.
I certainly believe it to be a real thing at the extremes, at the highs and lows. But I think when you look at 75% of the population, I can't imagine it being a causative factor to the degree that another random variable is.
I got you. So I'll cite a couple of offhand random studies just for illustrative.
Thank you for $5 from Antares. Okay, this is the only one. Myron's hair went from balding to budding. He is a new Benjamin Button. That's the only one you're getting. Let's get to it.
Purposes.
Sorry.
There's at least one study which showed that past the age of about 12 or 13, your common home environment, where you grew up, has almost no effect on your eating habits.
I just don't even know how that. I don't even know how a study like that could even make sense.
Because they did it with twin and adoption research, and they found out that if you came from a genetic stock of people that were prone to obesity or prone to making food choices that were more snacky, junky kinds of foods, if you were adopted into a home that gave you healthy foods, as a child up until teenage years, you ate what mom and dad made you, healthy food, the whole thing. And then as soon as teenage years hit and you were able to make your own food choices, you veer so far into the average predictive of what your parents used to like that the degree of influence of your parents, adoptive parents' healthy eating instructions are almost undetectable. Insanely rigorous research keeps coming up over and over again. Any parents who have had children listening to this show, if you've had one child, you can attest to the fact of how great of a parent you were and how your effects made them who they were. As soon as you have child number 2, you realize, holy shit, we're shooting in the dark. Kids kind of become sort of whatever the hell they were supposed to become, and we have barely any effect. And anyone who thinks they have a large degree of effect on a teenager is, I don't know, insert.
I'm so extraordinarily skeptical about this. It makes absolutely no sense. None of this makes any sense. The research, I doubt, is robust enough. If you're doing twin studies, which means that you have to, these studies are only done on twins that are separated at birth, most likely accidentally, and then they do studies based on their life. That's not enough of a group for me to go like, oh, this is indicative of the average society. I know that there are genetic factors, but I'm just so skeptical because what we're hearing right now is that the decisions, like, you just don't make any of your own decisions. Like, what you're telling me that the way that you grow up isn't going to have an influence on you in a profound capacity? I just think fundamentally that just sounds so ignorant. If you're not skeptical of what you're hearing, I just think that you're trying not to be. That's bizarre.
Joke here is a large degree of delusion. The conventional wisdom on how education works and how upbringing works cannot possibly survive the rigorous data that shows that, for example, as I stated just now, food choice proclivity has almost nothing to do with a common home environment.
After
I just disagree.
age 12.
Correct.
There's no fucking way this is true.
What about before it?
Before it has a ton to do because you don't make the choices that you have. Like, they put stuff on your plate and you eat it.
And don't you believe that if you're set up before the age of 12 with bad habits that potentially created childhood obesity, that you're going to have worse outcomes as you get older?
Yeah, for sure.
So then how are you saying that those social impacts are not equally as causative as the trait?
Because when you look at the behavioral genetic data, the social outcomes at the extremes can absolutely have an effect. But most of what you think are the social outcomes is literally just the expression of people's genetic proclivities over and over. Mom and dad have the same ones. You have the same ones. And if you try to get kids to eat hyper-palatable food all the time when they're younger, it definitely affects them when they're older, on the margins, 100%. But it doesn't affect their proclivity to make the same choices when they grow up. They're going to start eating healthy and thinking of the future as soon as they become teenagers, just like their actual mom and dad did. And then they're going to have extra adiposity and struggle with it. However, unless you become profoundly obese as a child, childhood overweightness generally resolves itself as teens mature into adults, because unless you continue on the path of egregious overeating, more or less you can grow out of considerable chubbiness as you get older.
I would like to see the data.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, me too. I don't know. I'm very skeptical about this, especially since all they're doing is judging twins. I don't think that that's enough. It's not enough to be the average. It's not enough.
Like kids that are obese and what their rates into adulthood are.
Sure.
I don't know what
Sure.
Do you know what they are?
Because I could not imagine that there are massively robust studies when you're just talking about like twins, especially when you're talking about adoption. Because I wonder how much of that has to do, if we're talking about adoption, how much of that has to do with some kind of a rebellious nature from the adopted kids in general when it comes to not wanting to follow their adopted parents' rulings. There's just too many additional factors. We're not talking about the average kid. Generally speaking, somebody who's adopted is going to have different struggles for somebody who's not adopted, especially when it comes to their identity issues and when it comes to how rebellious they may or may not be. And I imagine if you're 13 years old and you're already every kid is already engaging in a rebellious sphere. I mean, you're hitting an additional level of rebellion when it comes to your identity, because like that's not your biological parents, and that could be deeply distressing to you in a way. That would just skew this result so much, in my opinion, potentially.
Not offhand, no. But it's things that happen to your childhood can affect you long term, but don't seem to affect you long term nearly as much as people would think, because
it cannot be true.
Your genetics become more and more an effector variable that's better and better detected as you get older.
In deciding causation, right, we think about changing a variable, randomizing it, and seeing what happens. If I could wave a magic wand right now and stop food companies from advertising to children hyper-processed foods, especially in poorer areas, if I create access in food deserts, I know you don't like the term, but in areas where there's less fruits, vegetables for sale, and I sell more of those foods, less of the ultra-processed foods.
I think it's more about providing people the intellectual resources to make better choices, which usually means like providing them with better like food education.
Even through an authoritative method. If I greatly improve mental health support, maybe even medication in poorer areas.
What's the mental health thing have to do with it?
The mental health,
because people are definitely like they're eating through people use addictive substances to cope with like their issues, and people are absolutely using their eating as like a cope. What the fuck?
health thing is that some people overeat as a way of coping through difficult moments.
It's because they have high food drive, and that's a very happy thing for them to do.
Yeah, it's the same thing as somebody who would do heroin because they're stressed or smoke cigarettes. You can sit here and use high food drive as a dog whistle to say that they're just lazy or something, but that's what it is.
That's profoundly genetic. Many people in their most stressful time cannot eat.
Sure, but it still doesn't change the fact that when they're sad,
because it's an addiction.
They eat. Sure. And if they're more likely to be sad in an area where they can't get help for a mental health condition.
I think these people also eat when they're happy.
Yes, because they're addicted to food. Yes, that's the point.
Celebratory eating is a cultural universal.
It is. But I'm talking about the poorer outcomes where there's worse social outcomes and there's worse mental health support.
Yeah. What I'm saying is people with a high food drive don't need any stress to eat more. They don't need any less stress to eat
I don't like doing the highs or lows because that's not representative of the average.
We're not talking about the average. We're talking distinctly about highs and lows because we're talking about poverty versus wealth and its effects on obesity. It is a conversation exclusively of highs and lows, because in the average, actually, you can't disaggregate anything, and who knows what's going on.
Yeah.
I would say like the average American, though, is eating too much.
I'm saying in the average human, not, let's say you don't.
Or really human at this point.
No, and you're blinded to what people's poverty level is. You have to create a graph of what the average is.
Sure. So you're saying a lower degree of mental health on average causes people to become more obese?
Yeah, I think it's a factor.
Is that
I think it's a correlated factor.
Okay. Is there like a thing where like...
Well, ACEs, that's like the emotional regulation of it all correlates very strongly with people who have issues of crime, issues of overeating, higher rates of blood pressure elevations. So those variables are there. I don't know about the twin studies because I've never looked at those. But my point was that if you wave a magic wand and you fix all those issues that I discussed, you don't think there will be a significant improvement in obesity in poor areas?
I think the improvement in nearly all factors would be very impressive and hugely helpful. Locally, not systemically, because you have all sorts of really nasty side effects like drug dealers who deal in food and not actual drugs because now tasty food is illegal. And,
well, I didn't say make it illegal. I said reduce and improve education.
How do you reduce it if you don't make it illegal?
You limit targeted marketing.
Okay.
Because that's so influential and that's outside of our control.
I don't, if you implemented like a sugar tax, I don't really think, you don't have to make it illegal, But I don't think that you're going to get people selling it illegally. We already have sin taxes on things like cigarettes and alcohol, and people don't typically get those illegally. I mean, you can get some of that stuff at like Indian reservations or indigenous reservations, but like it's not illegal. It's just we put a sin tax on something to desensitize the specific behavior, and then you use that money to help people with their particular addiction problem.
There's ways that food.
It sounds like with a lot of Dr. Mike. It sounds. We'll call him Mike 2 because he's pissing me off. Is a very you can't do anything about it, individualistic choice type of perspective. There doesn't seem to be a lot of systemic appreciation.
Food companies change what we eat without ever us even realizing that they're doing it. It's the invisible hand.
Yeah, so I guess
changing government policy.
Sure, food companies wouldn't be. People wouldn't know as much about tasty junk food because food companies don't advertise them. So you'll have people who take advantage of that, and let's say in the ghetto, and bring to young children for sale healthy treats unhealthy treats they've never seen, and those kids are like, "Well, what is that? Like Cheez-Its? You ever had Cheez-Its?"
I'm sure that'll happen.
It'll happen.
But the question is, what will happen
food.
to the number?
Yeah, I think it'll go down. I think these if they magic wand it, it'll be helpful for sure. Here's my contention: there are a huge fraction of people, usually on the political left, or just moderate, reasonable people who have been educated in the United States or the Western world, who believe that these variables of social effect, food companies, etc., are, if not only the only variables, that very close to the predominant variables. They expect the magic wand of external social factors to be waved and fix almost the whole problem, if not the whole problem entirely. What you're going to get is almost an inversion of that reality, where you'll get like a very serious improvement, 5, 10, 15, 20% of improvement in the problem. And you'll have like 80% of the problem still left over, and be wondering why, since we have these amazing educational programs, these amazing programs of reducing food advertising, mental health enhancement, so on and so forth, that some people are still demographically much more likely to be obese than others, is because we ignored the two most primary causative variables, which is conscientiousness and food drive. If you have low food drive, it doesn't matter how conscientious you are or not, you're probably not going to be overweight, because like food's just not as big of a deal. If you have a very high food drive and are very wealthy, you can deploy quite a bit of technologies and personal chefs and all that stuff.
So what's the solution? This is one of the things that frustrates me about people who will say things like this. Like, okay, that's fine. What's the solution to you then? Nothing? Like, what do we do? What do we do about it? You're giving me what you think the problem is. That's great. What do you say is the solution? Because if you don't think that we can intelligently engage in a way societally to fix some of these problems, like massive food addictions, which we know is like real. It's like it's so intuitive understanding at this point. But what the fuck do we do about it? What's your solution?
Almost certainly be significantly.
It just sounds like he's just poo-pooing everything.
More overweight than otherwise, but maybe less so. If you have very high food drive and you have a low degree of conscientiousness, you're going to be very, very, very overweight, and all of the sociological variables in the world.
One of the things that's just driving me nuts about this conversation with the current Dr. Mike on the screen is that he's constantly boiling everything down to genetics, and that it's not very environmental. And he's quoting twin studies and this and that and the other thing. So if it's all genetic and not environmental, why are people so much fatter now? It's because it's very heavily environmental. The environment right now is very technologically driven to make people lazier, and very high access to very addictive foods and substances that people are over engaging in without any meaningful resolution to these problems, because it is a technology problem. Technology problems get dealt with so incredibly slowly in our political system, especially when we're pit against each other with dumb bullshit. And so what he's saying sounds nice, and he's very intelligent about it, but I think to some extent he's almost gaslit himself. He's almost too smart for his own good, where he has a concept of the world, and he's like, this is how the world is. And he's so smart, he's convinced himself to believe it. I'm not saying he's all wrong. I love Dr. Mike. I think he's extraordinarily intelligent. I love this guy. But just, it doesn't make sense what he's saying when you kind of retract a little bit and go like, oh, wait a minute.
Cannot help you to a huge extent. They can help you to a moderate extent. We're going to have so much left on the table, they're going to be wondering why. So what I'm proposing, this is why I'm so passionate about the subject, is I like to take holistic approaches. I like to understand the landscape of the entire issue we're dealing with before going and rendering very, very confident conclusions. For example, if you look at the British public schooling system, there's some public schools that are not so great, I guess, and some public schools that are just unbelievable. And the recent, this is quoting Robert Plomin's work, behavioral geneticist, behavioral genetic analysis of childhood success in school and after, especially after school, has the quality of schooling, quote unquote, by ranked school systems in the United Kingdom that you received has almost no predictive effect on how successful you become. And when you see that, and this is insanely rigorous data,
I'm sorry. What?
Success, behavioral geneticist, behavioral genetic analysis of childhood success in school and after, especially after school, has the quality of schooling, quote unquote, by ranked school systems in the United Kingdom that you received has almost no predictive effect on how successful you become. And when you see that,
how do you even come to the conclusion that how good your school is has no impact on how successful you are? I don't even know. There's no way that this statistic is accurate.
and this is insanely rigorous data.
You keep saying that, but like you're telling us that better schools don't provide better outcomes right now. Am I misinterpreting what he's saying? This doesn't make any fucking sense.
What do you have to shake off the page to make sense of that? Because when I read that for the first time, I was like, I almost stopped the car. It was an audiobook, and I was like, the fuck? How? Like, it was supposed to be a thing that you inject education into people, and they just get better.
Yeah. That's true, though. We know that. People with better education have better outcomes. This is a fact.
And all of a sudden...
And you saw one study that was by one person, and that just completely undid that entire worldview that, like, better education is better. Every poor area in the United States has shit education and less money going through that area. What?
When gradations of public schools explain almost no variance for outcomes after, and
you're just wrong.
There's programs where they rotated kids to different schools, lots of variation. It has almost no effect.
No.
If you knew behavioral genetics in its
this is just such a preposterous thing that goes against every bit of information we have over the past like 5 decades. It's unbelievable. It's just not believable. He's saying that better schools don't promote better outcomes. So then why the fuck do people go to Harvard?
Aggregate.
What study is he talking about? All right, this is what he's apparently referencing. A leading geneticist has told parents they don't need to send their kids to top schools like Elton because genetics has already determined how well they will do in academics. Robert Plowman, a professor of behavioral genetics at King's College London, said prestigious schools don't add anything to child's grades. Speaking at the Hay Festival, he said that a child's success is predetermined by their genes, and nature plays larger part in our lives than nurture or external environmental factors. When asked why a parent would spend money sending their kid to Elton, he replied, "The reason why education is universal is literacy and numeracy are innate." Jesus, these ads are insane. Children need to learn to read. We're talking about what makes them different. So the issue is, do differences in the quality of school make differences in outcomes or their GCSE scores? There's a correlation there. Kids who go to selective schools have GCSE score that is 1 full grade higher than kids who go to comprehensive schools. That's a correlation and correlations don't necessarily imply causation, and in this case they don't. If you correct for what the school's selected on, there's no difference in GCSE scores. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you select the very best kids academically, yes, they go on and do well, but have you added value? The answer is no. What is he referencing here, though? If you correct for what the school selected on, what does that mean? What's the actual paper? So why send your kids to Elton? Don't. If all you're doing is for educational achievement. But if you scratch the surface and talk to parents, it isn't just for that. It's the reasons like I want them to be with the right sort of people. I want them to get access and credential more than actual achievement. But achievement in itself, Elton, don't add anything. Schools matter. Kids got to learn the stuff, but do they make a difference? The answer is no. Elton was okay. Based on what? They have achieved the same grades but Professor Pullman argues that they would have achieved the same grades if they had gone to public school. In his book Blueprint of How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, he writes, students select schools and are selected by a school in part on the basis of the student's prior achievement and ability, which are highly heritable. Fantastic ads here. I love it. Students in selective and non-selective schools differ in their DNA because the traits used to select students are highly heritable. Selection of their students for those traits means that students are unintentionally selected genetically. Even though schools have little effect on the individual differences in school achievement, some parents will still decide to pay huge amounts of money to send their children. Okay, it's just insisting upon itself at this point. This entire paper seems to base it off of a GCSE score. Saying that when you, what is a GCSE? General Certificate of Secondary Education. They are highly valued by schools, colleges, and employers. A qualification mainly employs studying into theory of subject. Oh, okay, listen. So what they're saying is that these kids that do better don't need to go to these better prestigious schools because they would have done just as well in the normal average class. The problem there's a problem that I have with this theory. And the problem I have with this theory is like, what exactly are we determining? No, I don't know what a GCSE score is. We don't have that in America. I don't know what the fuck that is. And if we do, I don't give a shit. That doesn't make any fucking sense. The only thing that I could think here, what is it? His conclusion is that school is basically universal and its contribution to success. It basically means that it's genetics that decides whether you do well both in school and afterwards. I need to sit on this for like a little bit.
What do you have to shake off the page to make sense of that? Because when I read that for the first time, I was like, I almost stopped the car. It was an audiobook. And I was like, the fuck? How? Like, it was supposed to be a thing that you inject education into people and they just get better. And all of a sudden, when gradations of public schools explain almost no variance for outcomes after, and there's programs where they rotated kids to different schools, lots of variation, it has almost no effect. If you knew behavioral genetics in its aggregate before that, you could have been like,
I need to like sit on this and think about this because there's absolutely no way that better education is not better for people. There might be an idea that there is a certain level of acceptable education where any better education after that is not actually going to be stimulating enough, right? So it's like the diminishing returns of education. Like, okay, education is really good up to this point, and then once you get to this point, a school that requires twice as many resources to provide your kid education will only give you a 5% increase in actual outcome. That makes perfect sense to me. That could be it. Maybe these, English schools are so good on average that you really can't get a better experience or a noticeably better experience in the actual learning experience by spending more resources on that. That makes sense to me. But this concept that schooling has nothing to do with it is stupid. It doesn't make any sense.
like, I could have told you that. And then you would have been like, okay, we should have predicted this wasn't going to be a big deal. How do we really address these issues and understand what is the realism with which we can approach the situation? If you didn't know about behavioral genetics, you would have been like, dude, we need tons of funding for all of these programs. Maybe that's a good thing, but then you would have expected it to work. And when it worked on the margins, but not in its entirety, you would have had to contend with the fact that, I think we've severely misunderstood the problem. A quick analogy just for folks who are listening. If you are under the myth that genetics are not the biggest factor in athletic performance, you can take a scrawny little Jewish kid and try to get him into every single soccer camp in the world. I'm a billionaire. My kid's going to learn soccer from like the Brazilian national team themselves, day one. You poured millions of dollars into your kid, and he's like 16 years old. He's the worst person on his non-select soccer team, and he's like, I want to play the violin. And you're like, the fuck? I thought I could.
What is he talking about, Ben Shapiro?
Pour athletic talent into you. And any sports scientist, to quote, paraphrase Jordan Peterson, worth their salt, it's a hilariously Canadian expression, would say, like, that's not how that works. Sports science is about identifying talent and then improving it on the margins, sort of cultivating it. If you don't have the talent, you ain't doing a whole lot. Now, you can get better, but it's a similar thing to the poverty obesity thing. If we addressed all of the sort of endemic issues that you were talking about, the systemic ones, external social cultural ones, we would get some decent traction. Yeah, you coach a kid in soccer with the Brazilian national team his whole life, he's going to be pretty goddamn good at soccer, but he ain't going to the Olympics. No way, unless he has mega talent. The same is true about poverty and obesity and those relationships, where if we don't address the food noise, which luckily pharmaceutical companies are addressing now with Ozempic, which I think one of the best things we can do is make anorectic drugs like Ozempic and tirzepatide, etc., ubiquitously cheap and available to everyone that needs them. That's going to make a big hit. Why? Because it addresses directly the variable of food.
I was listening too much.
Drive.
Okay, listen. I'm trying to truly understand what he's trying to say. It's a lot of information at once. I don't know if it's his lack of communication or my lack of understanding, or maybe it's I'm playing a fucking video game. But if what he's saying is there is a diminishing returns on a particular experience in school, and once you get to that diminishing returns, you see very little benefit by going to like a better schooling, that might be true. That those kids that do really well in better schools would do just as well in their life, maybe slightly worse, but generally they wouldn't have, it's a diminishing return experience if they went to a regular average school. There might be a level of truth to that. But we have so many instances of just like drastically undereducated people that's the bigger issue, at least in the United States.
Trait conscientiousness remains. There is no drug you can take that improves it, unfortunately. And it's going to remain this kind of sand grain inside that makes the pearl. It's a constant nuisance that will constantly be there. And we can have a lot of sociological, we're just not doing enough. Education didn't work that well. We need more education. To your point earlier, like vitamin D, once you get enough of it, 10 times the dose is technically toxic over the long term. Sure, shit doesn't help. So we have to understand the entire topography, the landscape of what we're dealing with, and have to accept straight up that many of the core, most explanatory reasons for why poverty and obesity correlate with each other are outside of our ability to have traction on them in the modern timeline. And going from there, we should make all of the changes that you recommend, which I'm absolutely 100% on board. Depending on how they're executed, of course. That all stuff matters, but it's going to matter a lot less than many people think. I can't speak for you and tell you how much you think it's going to matter, but because of what we know about behavioral genetics and how causality works in this case, it's going to matter substantially less than you think. And if anything else, it's disheartening. You did all this stuff, and then what happened? Almost nothing.
I think that's the only point we disagree on. I think the trait matter of it all, the food drive of it all, you created this 80-20 guesstimation formula. I can't even argue against it because I don't have the evidence to argue against it. And I don't think that you would even fight if someone said it's 70-30.
No, sure.
Right?
No
because
problem.
it's almost an arbitrary number because we don't have
30-70.
Exactly, yeah. But I do believe that these traits matter. The way that I think about it as a practical clinician, because I'm not a researcher, is you hear that we can change the 20% with that magic wand that I was talking about, and you say, that's not the 80% that is really the issue. And I view it as 20% decrease in obesity rates gets us under the average person in America being obese.
That's fair. Like even I like the way that this guy approaches solutions. Like he listens to what's being said and then he just kind of argues within the margins of the person that he's dealing with. So instead of hearing something outlandish like school doesn't have a positive impact on somebody's outcomes and going, that's preposterous. Or excuse me, here's something like Dr. Mike say like, well, school, it has a very little outcome on like somebody, or how good the school is has a very little outcome on how successful you are. Right. And it's like really 80% is genetics and 20% is only environmental. He's like, okay, let's work within that 20% then. And it's like, well, that's a lot. And it's like, oh, wait, yeah, that's a good point. You know what I mean? I like this guy.
That's a monster win for me. Because if we're, let's say, at 60% obesity in the United States, if we get 20% drop off, we're 40, we're less than the majority.
Yeah, the way I'm contextualizing it, it's going to be 20% of 60. So it's going to be whatever fraction that ends up being.
I don't know what the exact number is.
Yeah.
That's 12, no?
Actually look up what percent of the United States is obese.
No. That's not my contention. I'm saying that if obesity is a problem and you solve 20% of it, you don't get an absolute 20% reduction.
Of course, yeah.
You get a relative 20% reduction.
Right.
But
which is still pretty significant. No?
So in any case, like, I love that point. I think I'm looking at it from a little bit of a Sowellian pessimistic take of, geez, like we're not even addressing the two biggest factors in the room. And it's totally fine to address all these other factors. Well, I say, as a society or whatever.
And also,
policy.
Just to put into perspective from like the bariatric surgery side of things, which has been ongoing for 30 years plus more than the GLP-1s, the reason bariatric surgery works is partially because how it impacts your food drive.
Yes, almost entirely why it works that way. Yeah.
So this is not new. Medicine trying to impact food drive. This has been going on since before I started practicing medicine.
Yeah.
And that's number one. Number two, medicine usually practices on the fringes.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about vaccinating kids and we talk about saving hundreds of lives, someone might look at that and say, I don't find it worthwhile to vaccinate kids to save hundreds of lives.
Sure.
But we do. And science does. So yes, there's very little control that we have of ultimate human outcomes, because controlling 1, 2, 3, 4 variables in the grand scheme of life is usually ridiculous in thinking you control the ultimate outcome.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't like protocols that say like, oh, if you ice bath, you can create X, Y, and Z. I'm like, come on, man. One variable, especially such a small variable, is not going to have some meaningful, substantial change that we should give it this much air.
Sure.
But those issues, to me, that if we can change those issues, A, we get some benefit, even if it's not the majority of the benefit. B, the obesity change isn't the only benefit that we get when we change those things. If we change education, if we change their ability to...
What do you mean by education? I'm curious. That one I have a lot of ideas
Okay, when
on.
someone walks in to one of my men on the street interviews and I ask them a question of like, what nutrient is most prevalent in your banana? And they say protein.
Potassium? I don't know.
The odds are that they are from a worse education background from a health literacy standpoint is higher. Fair to say?
Well, what's the answer? Please tell me.
Mm-hmm.
That happens.
Or are they talking about just like carbs?
Very often in lower economic schools, education systems, because there's not as much motivation to learn about those things. So the sales of a 64-ounce Slurpee is much higher in that area than it is in Greenwich, Connecticut, some really wealthy area. Why? Partially because of education.
Nutritional education is a perfect example of a variable that is talked about as a preeminent variable. Here's one of my beefs with this. Coming up through the educational system in all of these fields, you're not really taught that, we were never taught that food drive was a thing that was largely genetically correlated. It's just never talked about. We were never taught about conscientiousness. We were taught about things like nutritional education, empowerment to make better nutritional choices, monetary limits.
I think we weren't taught about those things because we didn't know how to impact them.
When I learned about these things, they were taught as a theoretical basis for why things happen. Whether or not you can impact something is very different than theoretically does it caused by something else. And so I think the reason that they theoretically were not taught is because most people in the field didn't ask the question, because most people in those fields are intellectually biased to the political left to begin with and do not to like to look to genetics and deep social forces outside of our control.
That I think that is such a weird, drastic thing, right? Because I understand what he's saying. He's effectively saying that we don't talk about the genetic differences between different groups of people because it's politically too left. I just think that this is a generally newer concept. I think that the concept of some people, like let's say like more Germanic people that maybe grew up in colder areas probably have more food drive because we needed to be fat. That's not like a politically left-leaning driven thing that we're not talking about because academics are so insanely biased that we can't talk about that. I think that in general, conversation about health science is new. We didn't need it 20 years ago because people weren't horribly addicted to food the same way that they are now, and people were more physically active. So these issues weren't issues. We tend to, as a society, be reactive to problems. Right? You generally only find solutions for problems, not non-problems. So back in the day, there were some fat people, but like everybody was moving around. Technology wasn't as prevalent. So people were going outside. They were playing more. There wasn't technology beaming the worst information from around the world in your head, making you scared to go outside. We didn't have these problems. Nowadays, we're seeing more genetic issues with people. Like we'll say some people, like again, like me, like more Nordic people who are bigger, we're taller, we're generally put on more muscle, but then also more fat because like historically our people needed to eat a lot of food to survive and like to stay alive, right? So now you're starting to see these things bloom up, and now we're having the conversation more, but also everything in general, education included, it moves very slowly because it is also governmental, which government moves very slowly. I understand there can be some biases in some things, but I feel like sometimes we lean too much on we lean too much on these conspiracy theories that there is some kind of magical indoctrination happening. And while I'm sure that can happen in some instances, realistically speaking, there are more commonsensical ways to explain these problems than like, oh, there's a political left-leaning bias in here. I think that's silly. You lose a lot of weight in the cold? That's not true. What are you talking about? Papa, people in the north are not fatter than people in the south. What the fuck are you talking about? I don't understand what are you saying? People in the north are not fatter than people in the south. What are you saying? I'm talking about like some potential biological differences. What? I think education is way less important than just access or time to prepare quality food. I mean, that would be education on like actually preparing food and like dietary education. Like I doubt that most people even know really that fiber is very good for you, and that fiber processes differently, so you can eat like more fiber, but like you absorb less of it. I doubt most people understand that like higher protein diets, there's more thermogenics required just to process like protein in your body, where like 1,000 calories of protein is going to put on overall less weight onto your body than 1,000 calories of fat or carbs. It takes more energy just to produce that. So I'm not understanding what is your contestment here?
Why?
Why do you think
because it makes them very sad about the state of affairs, and it disempowers.
Well, I mean, like people from colder areas are not fatter than people from warmer areas. The point that I'm making is that people in colder areas would have a drive to eat more food because they would need to use more energy to stay warm. I don't think that that's a hot take. Right? Like when you no, right? Like that feels pretty. And like also you want to be fatter. You'd want to also be fatter as well because you want to have some weight on you to be able to keep you warm in the cold. So that's my point, is that if you're like a more Nordic person, I imagine that you would have more of a food drive than maybe somebody not like that.
Them. They believe in human malleability. They believe that no one can be blamed for anything, that it's social forces externally all the way up and down, and those are the, if not the only, the by far predominant reasons why people end up different.
Yeah, but like the problem is that I can generally agree with sometimes people are too macro about these things where like you have no personal control, but Dr. Mike's just being too micro about it where you have all the personal control.
It's because of social forces. That is like...
but don't you think they always, like, barring the extremes, most people will say that it's a mix of nature and nurture.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about most people. I'm talking about the educational
In the
establishment.
educational establishment. You don't think they would say that it's a mix?
No, it's you can lose your job for saying it's a mix. If I was still working at the university, I would never give this interview. Because saying that poor people on average have lower conscientiousness, I'm still worried about this going out. Holy fuck, that's insulting. If you're nuanced and you're smart, you can understand how it's both real and not insulting. But if you're anything else, and if you're very politically motivated, it's going to be a nuclear bomb. You're
I mean, listen, he worked in a school, so I guess I have to take his word for it. But I honestly doubt that if you had like an intelligent socio-economic conversation or like social conversation about this, I very highly doubt that you would get fired for being like, yeah, if you're poor, you have like lower conscientiousness or whatever. Like, I don't think that it's, especially the way that he's communicated this. But I could be wrong.
blaming people for their problems. Even though they're in private
Well,
life, everyone knows people.
I don't know if you're
largely to
blaming.
blame
I think you're trying to establish a cause for why something is developed. I don't think you're necessarily putting blame on an individual.
I totally
Whether
agree.
that person is conscientious, especially as you put it genetically, you're almost not blaming them. You're almost dissolving of the blame.
That's a very interesting way to look at it.
But aren't you? Is
Most-
that fair? Because you're saying genetically you have this predisposition to this trait, therefore it's not up to you.
I think the concept of blame is
Determinism.
one that the longer you look at it, the more it falls apart anyway. I don't like to deal in blame. I don't even know what that means. I like to deal in causality instead of blame. Blame is like an emotion you have inside from ancestral times when the police and court system were not there to enforce things. And by blaming someone, you could paint them in a negative light and interact
I
with
feel
them
like we're
less.
going to get into this no matter what. Do you believe in free will?
Getting a little bit philosophical. He's going to ask him the free will conversation. I knew it was coming. Because it sounds like Dr. Mike does not believe in free will. Dr. Mike, and it makes sense, seems to believe that you're a mixture of just your genetic factors, really. Like your apparently, like your environmental factors are almost a nothing to him, which is fucking preposterous to me. But like he would, by this logic, not believe in free will. He would believe that like everything is dictated by, you know, just your genetics, but your thoughts and basically by your environment, and your condition. I guess your environment and your genetics.
Will?
No.
Oh, cool.
And I think that, yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense.
sure. But I think the concept of free will is preposterous on its face because people will say, well, what about quantum mechanics and randomness? Because that's random will. It's still not free will. So I don't think there is a space for free will as most people understand it in a modern intellectual landscape. But at the
Sure, I mean, it's a philosophical conversation. I rather just believe that we have complete control over our actions for the most part, because it just gives me more, from a personal perspective, it gives me more hope for my own future because it makes me feel like I have more control over it. Even if we are just a kind of like, basically our entire lives are just inputs from our environment and our genetics, it feels better to just be like, no, I don't really believe that. I think that I have control over myself and all my own actions. This way, like if something happens to me I feel like I have a level of control, I can change that. But I think that when you don't believe that you can have that kind of impact on your own life, that's when you start to just become like a big fucking blob of shit, worthless nothing.
the same time, in your brain, you have a machine that decides what you're going to think, which is out of your control entirely. And you have a part of that machine which reviews all the contents of your mind and decides on aggregate, am I going to make this decision that I just thought of or not? And so the combination of having self-awareness.
Thank you for the small gut from Imanar. Bald Dr. Mike has recently been getting disliked. I think that this interview is a little rough for him, I'll tell you that.
And an ability to take all the information, you know, and aggregate it to not just my recent proclivity, but also everything else I know, certainly makes a system that acts as if it has free will. But you really lens down into it, it's not free at all. It's entirely mechanistic.
So what would you say people watching this that you're afraid of that they'll say about you?
I don't give a fuck. That's
Well,
why I'm
no, but
here.
you're saying that you're worried about it going out. What are you worried about? Or why would you get fired?
Yeah. Mike's
If you
a
were
Nazi.
still working.
Mike's a Nazi.
Come on, for real.
No, I'm serious. Check your comments. Check them now.
I don't think anybody's going to say Mike's a Nazi at all. I think that people are going to say Mike is like a bit out of touch. Let's see. Actually, I already read through these before I even watched this. I didn't see a single person call Mike a Nazi. I think that Mike is a little bit... I think that his thoughts on what the comment section is going to say about him is very indicative of how how politically brain rot he is, to think that what he said in here, while it might be uncomfortable, was so controversial that they think that he is like an oppressive force. It's uncomfortable, and I think it's out of touch, but like I think that he has a little bit of a victim complex when it comes to thinking that people are going to ostracize him from society for talking about this topic.
But in reality, you think they would call you a Nazi?
Yes.
And why would they call you a Nazi?
Because the Nazis took the idea that people had genetic differences that impacted their behavior and decided the end run best way to deal with that was to kill millions.
Yeah, we're a little far off there on that there, bud. We're at a little bit of a different spot. Okay, there's a difference between saying that genetics play a factor, which they do, versus saying that we should oppress people with different genetics than a certain group.
I think there's a really big problem with that.
Maybe he's thinking of liberal journalism, not the layman, but he just said, look at the comments. So he's not. Like, that's the thing. That's what I'm saying. He's not. He literally just said, look at the comments. I bet they're going to call me Hitler. It's one thing to say, like, I think that some of the academics might think of what I'm saying is like very oppressive versus him saying the comment section is going to think that he is Hitler. These are two different things. I agree with you there.
And are you that
part? Do I have to answer directly? Yes. Israel. That'd be a fun Nazi name. I am a politically very closely aligned with libertarians. I'm a secular humanist. And so I think anytime a complex human being dies, it is an unmitigated tragedy. I think that
what does a complex human being mean?
Killing people and putting them into camps is abysmal.
Yeah, sure. I agree.
But you can reason yourself through sociological effects only into the same thing. Evidence Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. They didn't believe genetics had any effect on anything. They believed it was all sociological. What did they do? Put people into camps, toast them by the tens of millions.
You can weaponize any philosophy.
Oh yeah, sure.
To any extreme.
But if you're on one extreme or the other, you tend to weaponize the
opposite. Yeah, but you're still extreme. For sure. Still weaponized.
It just so happens that most of the community, the intellectual community in the United States, the collegiate intellectual community, is wildly left-wing biased for a generation and for 3 generations now. The problem is getting, let's say, if it's a problem, it's getting worse. It's becoming more and more of a thing that the campuses are attracting more and more left-leaning people. And so when we're talking about looking at this from a grander landscape of what really is the cause and effect situation for why poor people tend to be obese more on average, you're getting a very, very biased view from most of the academic establishments. They neither teach the basic theoretics of it. If you bring it up in class, you're lambasted as like having borderline Nazi thoughts.
But
and
like,
the whole
if
thing.
you bring up food drive, people will call you a Nazi? I don't understand how that happens.
If you say food drive is mostly genetic, the right-wingers will say you're excusing people's willpower thing.
Okay.
And the left-wingers will, in some situations, be like, see, but then when you tie genetics to other factors, let's say racial factors, they're like, holy shit, Hitler reborn.
Well, what racial factor are you trying to tie it to? That's the question that I have for you. Because you are getting dangerously close. It's one thing to say like, hey, genetics will have a factor in some different drivers, but what driver are you talking about? Like, are you just saying that there are some different groups of people that might be better at different sports? Like black people seem to be better at typically have like longer legs. They seem to be better at certain sports, and like some white people seem to have bigger like torsos and midsections. They're better at like other sports like strongman, it seems, which is not universal. But there might be like a generality there, sure, but that's not condescending to say. Or are you going to say something like, well, there are groups of people that cause more crime, and that's really just all in their genetics? And it's like, oh, is that in their genetics? I'm not entirely sure of that. Where you have to give us a little bit more. You have to give us a little bit more than that. That could be sketchy. Is he going to say it?
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of people. The world has many beautiful things about it.
Sure.
There's many ugly things about it.
Sure.
And when you go, hey, this ugly stuff we should be looking at, there are lots of people that go, yeah. And there are lots of people that go, you son of a bitch. How dare you?
Like what?
And as intellectual, every college campus says they're for intellectual curiosity and freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And in the United States, almost none is or isn't. You and I could sit here and really make fools of ourselves and get canceled by going, what was Hitler right about? He was right about a lot of shit, right?
Like what?
He was a fucking murderous animal who was wrong about the core tenets of his philosophy. But he had all the stuff that was correct. Order, social responsibility, personal responsibility, pride in the greatness of your nation. That's fucking awesome stuff. We don't need to jettison that. But people tend to feel so much more than they think in many regards that like, as soon as you bring up, oh, I'm doing free thought. I'm doing cost-benefit analysis. Let's look at Churchill, Hitler, and Stalin and see how their philosophies differ, cost benefit, pluses and minuses. That intellectual exercise is damn near forbidden on college campuses today. So the idea that we have free thought is largely been jettisoned. Like I went to the University of...
Well, just to be absolutely clear, you can have intelligent conversations like this, probably less enthusiastically about it. I'm sure if you looked at it, there are things that every good and bad leader has ever done that was both bad and good. Absolutely. There are pros and cons. But what we have to understand is like the weaponization of facts, which is a real thing. When you say like, hey, this particular leader did these things great, maybe that's true. Why are you saying that? Are you saying it to have an intelligent conversation? I believe Dr. Mike would. But I think there's a lot of people that would be saying that to dog whistle that bad leader was actually kind of a good person, and maybe he was right about other things. We are very complex in our communication. Everybody has different life experiences where every single word that you say will have a different meaning based on how you say it and who you say it to. which is very real. Very exaggerating forms of this are literally just different languages. But there are also subtleties where like some different words mean some different things. Like in some places, calling somebody a bitch is a very negative thing. But like my wife and my mother-in-law call each other bitch all the time in a more endearing way. There's a more exaggerated example. But that's a very real thing that you have to keep in mind when you have conversations like that. That's very important. So when you're like, yeah, you can't even have conversations about like, was Hitler actually kind of a decent guy? You need to be very careful about the way that you talk about this, because there is a conversation about the weaponization of different facts. You can interpret anything in a positive or negative way, and you need to be very careful about how you express these particular things. Like if you look at some groups and go like, oh, this group here, they cause more crime, blah, 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 blah. Okay, maybe you're having a conversation about how like socioeconomically they have been denied opportunities their entire lives as the entire group of people. Or maybe you're just trying to say that's just something that is inherent to that group of people. Then you could look at other groups of people and say, well, they have imperialized the entire world. Does that make them good or bad people? Right? Well, you're saying that this group is violent because they have higher crime rates in certain countries. But what about the group that literally can't stay out of other people's areas and territories? Are those violent people? What type of violence are we acceptable in our society? And what are the justifications? You get into a very complex conversation. I just think that like the way that he's thinking is too simple about this. And I think that part of it's because Dr. Mike is good natured and maybe doesn't understand that people will legitimately use conversations like what he's saying as a dog whistle to be oppressive to other people. But, maybe that's just me overthinking.
Michigan as an undergrad, a phenomenal institution, but damn near a propaganda machine. When I went there, they're like trying to get you to believe a certain version of the world that felt really nice for people on the political left to believe. And so they jettisoned entire classes of introspection and trying to figure out what's going on, such as behavioral genetics.
The problem is that like these, okay, I think that the best way to look at this is from the example of trans women in sports. I think that's the perfect way to look at this, that there are issues that are maybe too politicized on the left, right? Because on the left, it's like a trans woman absolutely should be able to play in a sport. They are women, blah, 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 blah. My personal belief is that if you have a trans woman who goes through a male puberty, right? They're probably going to have biological advantages that are going to allow them to compete at a higher level than somebody who did not go through a male puberty. When I say that, I mean no disrespect to trans people. I think trans women are women. I think trans men are men. I just think that there are some differences that we have to have complex conversations about. I will guarantee you that most of the people that agree with me on this topic hate trans people and want them to be eradicated from society. And that's fucking insane. And so when we have these conversations, like, yes, on the one hand, things are getting too left-leaning, but on the other hand, there are some very reasonable people that I think agree with me that are even maybe more conservative-leaning. But a lot of other people will use what I say as a dog whistle and go, oh, yeah, because they just hate trans people on the foundation of their existence. And that's the problem with some of these conversations is so many people will try to dog whistle their way into being oppressive to certain groups of people through well-intentioned, normal people who have very normal feelings and expressions. And like that's how these problems work. That's what I think this conversation kind of boils down to.
Such as the true cultural differences and where they stem from. They had an idea that you could re-architect external society to make any change that you wanted. That idea is wrong. It's always been wrong, but it's not completely wrong. It's partially correct. There's, like to your point earlier, it has some traction. You can change society and make people's lives better, even if they're the same people. But what you should expect out of that is a much more mixed picture. There's a lot of situations where you think the core variable is social, you pour tons of social resources into it, it changes up to a point, then it doesn't change anymore, and your answer is like, well, we just need more social stuff.
Well, yeah, but that's a different conversation, right? Like at that point, you're like, okay, there is going to be, there's a diminishing returns conversation. You can have that conversation, right? Like that's a different thing though. What you're saying is that the well-meaning implementation of education in whatever capacity worked, but it only works to a certain extent. And then after that, we have to look to other variables. That's how science works.
And that is the wrong answer. But if you're not willing to admit that this other thing even exists, what the hell do you do afterwards? That's a real curious situation.
It's the only problem is that like Dr. Mike doesn't seem to think that environmental factors are that much of an influence based on the way that he's talking. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but that just kind of seems like what he's saying. But
yeah,
maybe
I guess
I'm wrong.
The real research that I would like to see is
maybe I'm too uncomfortable with the conversation and I need to like sit with it for longer to come to a better conclusion. I mean, that's possible. That maybe that's what it is. I don't know. I mean, this is all very intellectually stimulating conversation, so that it could be that.
What can we do to
and like a lot of times, it's difficult to change like that type of thing like very instantaneously.
Impact this trait?
Like food drive and conscientiousness,
Yeah,
respectively?
well, food drive, we kind of have some, at least beginnings of evidence for.
Correct, yeah.
But for conscientiousness, as an example.
And you could ask the same thing about intelligence. Probably the single most beneficial thing you can have. I always go back and forth in my head as to which one is more effectual, conscientiousness or intelligence. But together, they are the single biggest effective variables for everything else that happens in your life. If you are intelligent and conscientious, above average, you're going to be doing some really interesting shit. If you are significantly below average in conscientiousness and intelligence, there's a high probability you're going to be in jail or highly unaccomplished and poor and making terrible decisions all the time.
Sure, but like how much of that do you think is genetic and how much do you think is biological?
If you ask the question of how do we increase people's conscientiousness and increase their intelligence, some of the answers are very straightforward. A cultural reinforcement of high conscientiousness. Like,
Sure.
hey, save your money. It's better to think of the future, things like that. But now the political left in some extremes is so insane that even trying to say that to people is considered paternalistic and
Yeah, but there's
I think that Dr. Mike falls too much in the victim complex conversation where he's taking the political left to like the political left is like a boogeyman that's like you can't tell people to save your money or you're a bad. It's just like it's too much. I mean, there's a level of truth to some of these things, but it's like Jesus Christ, like give me a fucking break. You know,
the exact opposite happening on the right wing side where it's weaponized in the other direction.
totally equally as unhelpful.
What I probably should have asked very early on
maybe.
in this conversation that I didn't is when you say that there is a genetic tie to the trait of conscientiousness, what is that gene that you're looking at, that you're describing? Because to me, when we look at a trait, that is something that we've sort of elucidated on tests, but what actual gene are you looking at?
So it's almost certainly polygenic, which means hundreds, if not thousands or more genes are responsible. This is true for intelligence. There's no intelligence gene. But there are lots of genes that have small fractional mini percentages effect on intelligence, and in the aggregate, they make you much smarter or much less intelligent. Conscientiousness is the same. You can track a lot of what conscientiousness is and how it acts by analogizing to child development. Every single 2-year-old is the least conscientious thing you'll ever meet in your life. They don't have the neural architecture to think of the future, mostly because they don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex.
Sure.
So prefrontal cortical development is probably really, really tied causatively to conscientiousness. So if you had some wacky idea to genetically engineer people and you found a way through 150 genes to push the prefrontal cortex into more aggressive development,
Let me tell you, I'm going through that many genes now, dude. Being morbidly obese, jeez, I'm not that bad.
accounting for skull size, etc.,
I don't wear jeans.
then that would probably be something that would be
My wife says I look handsome when I wear them, but I just don't have the drive. They're uncomfortable.
fruitful. Like it's if someone's profoundly athletic and has an amazing sense of balance, they probably have a larger, more well-integrated cerebellum because that is the seat for that kind of action. So these are all just like the brain is a computer. These are all computer properties of the brain.
Sure.
Thinking about traits like this historically has been problematic. You mentioned the Nazis.
Yeah, that's
How
not
they
what they did that
weaponized
was a
it.
problematic thing. What they did is just killed millions of people.
Right.
Yes.
Based off of that logic.
Sure.
Again, their action is the issue.
Yes.
Self-esteem era of the 1990s elucidated that having high self-esteem was a big contributing trait that led to success from childhood.
Yeah.
So we instituted participation.
That makes perfect sense. If you feel better about yourself, you're more willing to take risks. And if people look down on you, you're like, I don't care about them. 1,000%.
Trophies, praising children even when they're failing, creating a higher level of narcissism that perhaps didn't exist before.
That's definitely
And
makes sense.
largely, we've seen it as a failure of modern psychology of trying to institute false
Very
self-esteem.
well intentioned. And to
Yeah, I mean that's how a lot of issues do happen, right? Well-intentioned failure. You know, it's hey, self-esteem is better for you. Okay, let's just build self-esteem recklessly. Okay, how do you do that? Just give everybody you win trophies. That's obviously a stupid idea. You can you need to fail to succeed. You need to have productive levels of stress in your life to be better, right? They didn't have participation trophies when I was younger. If I lost something, I didn't hate myself to the point where I wanted to fail. I typically did well at things, so that was definitely beneficial. But you could teach people to productively lose, and you could develop habits through that way as well. And I would say that like people who are really good at things too sometimes can be like not necessarily the best people to engage with. And let me explain. Like if you grow up and you succeed at everything effortlessly, right? Like you're really smart, you're really athletic. People love you because you just know what you're doing. There's an intuitive sense of yourself and like how to engage, and you just do so well. That's a really great thing until you meet adversity. Because if you're somebody who just does well at everything and you don't meet adversity, well, how did you learn to deal with adversity? And so now you meet a stopgap of like, wait, this is hard. What do? You give up, you quit. because you were just so good at everything. You didn't learn how to be bad at everything. And then you just melt down because you don't have the mental capacity to be like, oh, how do I get over this? You didn't learn how to be to work through that stress. That's why sometimes it's better for like somebody who struggles when they're younger, like maybe like a C student that tries really hard and like actually gets through school and has learned, they've learned about themselves and how to overcome certain obstacles, can be better than a straight A student that doesn't have to study, because you actually learn to be productive. In general, you know how to be productive. You know how to problem solve better. You know, so it's found that interesting.
Very from the political left.
Very well intentioned. And frankly, I don't care which side it comes from.
Political left.
Just to keep in mind the idea.
You could just say more left-leaning people. When you say political left, it's very Twitter charged.
Yeah, that this is not the first political left thing.
I'm pretty sure Dr. Mike is a normal person who's been like brain rot by Twitter to think that like things are worse than they actually are.
To come up to the surface to where there's an orthodoxy that you're supposed to accept.
Yeah, but there's a right-wing version of that in the past that has happened.
The right-wing people do not run the universities. There are two types of people.
Okay, they run the government now.
Do they? Well, they
literally every part of the government. Supreme Court, Congress, Senate.
We won't get into something like.
And they also ran that in 2016 to 2018 as well.
90% of actual government workers, not accounting for police and military, politically on the left.
Why wouldn't you account for police and military?
Just to keep that in the discussion. Mm-hmm. So the deep state on the extreme is an insane right-wing conspiracy, but
you believe it.
A more reasonable take, like, yes, most people who actually work in government of all levels are Democrats.
Genuine question. Answer this how you want. Do you think that that's because of some kind of indoctrination where they're only trying to hire people who are more left-leaning? Or do you think that there is a correlation between intelligence and voting more progressively? I'm not saying everything progressive is positive. There are obviously instances where you can over-empathize and have a negative impact on people. Like we said before, participation trophies is a great example. But generally speaking, when people are more educated, they tend to make more money, right? Which means that they can look outside of themselves more, which means that they're more left-leaning. And so if you're a government worker, which generally gets paid pretty well, has decent benefits, I would see you being more left-leaning. So that's number one. Number two, why wouldn't you count police and military? Like all these governmental workers, except for this huge batch of people who are probably more right-leaning. Yeah, you know, it's like there's a dog whistle of some kind of Dr. Mike. Unfortunately, is kind of dog whistling like a politically left deep state that controls the world, despite the fact that Trump won twice now. I love Dr. Mike, but his brain is rotted through the core. I'll just be real.
And so when Republicans are in charge, they're dealing with a largely antagonistic workforce.
Which is great because checks and balances are awesome.
When Democrats are in charge, then it's bad, right? The corollary has to hold true.
Well, what does it mean an antagonistic workforce? Like, give me an example of like what is an example of like antagonistic things that have happened that have been negative? Like, I need a more specific example. Antagonistic for what?
I don't think that's necessarily true because I feel like the pendulum swings in both directions.
But it doesn't in the actual running of the day-to-day government.
Yeah, I don't know what is the actual predominance of government workers.
Yeah, it's 90%.
I'm curious.
Yeah, but
that's just okay. Hold on.
Just to say, like,
well, we did the well-intentioned self-esteem thing, right?
Yes.
I read a book by Roy Baumeister about the power of willpower. Have you looked at any of his work? So there was a thought that it's not self-esteem. It's willpower. That's the thing. That if you have good willpower, you actually get better outcomes. And that's the one factor. We need to focus on boosting willpower. And there's little things that we can do to impact our willpower.
I just need to be clear about this because I wanted to look into this. Federal employees are slightly more likely to vote Democrats over Republicans in upcoming midterm elections. According to a new poll, though, they disapprove their top boss, President Biden, blah, blah, blah. For their House members, 46% of federal workers are planning to vote for Democrat nominee, and 35% are planning to vote for the Republican. Okay, so just to be clear, I don't think this is unrealistic. You're saying it's 90%. How, but here it seems like there is a higher amount of Democrats that are voting or more left-leaning individuals in government, but not to this 90% degree. This is preposterous. What the fuck are you saying?
Or throughout the day, throughout our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And that's also fallen out of favor because we've seen that artificially trying to change this trait doesn't really help.
No, okay, so does it not help or does it not work? Like, is willpower enhancement actually not something we can gain traction on? Or is it the fact that the people have substantially improved their willpower in a robust way that lasts, and that doesn't still improve their lives?
I think that
it's probably the former.
We don't know.
Where's he getting this statistic from?
which
Can somebody find the statistic he's quoting where 90% of government workers are fucking Democrats? What the fuck is he talking about?
of the two it is. We just know in a clinical, practical sense, it doesn't.
Yeah. So that comports back to the whole behavioral genetics thing. There's only so much you can change for a person's expressive psychology with external factors, even from childhood, definitely in adulthood. So the idea that you can change someone's general ability to yield willpower, which we express as discipline, is curious. And the behavioral genetics literature would be like, you probably can't make much of a difference. That's the thing is, both intelligence and conscientiousness seem to be deeply genetic. And if we have a robust plan to genetically engineer anyone who wants it, now we got a real solution going. Short of that, we should do our very best in every regard that you expressed on providing social services, so on and so forth. We cannot expect miracle resolutions to many of these societal issues because, and I'll say it very plainly, it's dope to talk about nutritional education.
I think that when it comes to people, basically what I'm hearing is self-awareness and intelligence. I think that there are definitely going to be environmental factors that will have an impact on your self-awareness and your intelligence, but there's only so much you can do. And so we need to identify the best way to teach these things to the best of our ability. And then outside of that, just not do too much. You know, if we have a decent implementation, we're like, okay, we've seen good outcomes, this is going well, but some people just aren't taking to it and it's not working and we have no other theories on how to change that, you just move on and you don't have to, you know what I mean? Like you don't have to participation trophy this situation.
And it helps many people on the margins. But when you try to educate someone who doesn't give a shit about what goes into their bodies, who cares? It doesn't matter. And
Sure.
The reality is that many people like
So you should provide this education and then work from there.
to engender ideas of who they're helping, having met very few or none of the people who they're actually trying to help. If you talk to a lot of people who are very substantially overweight, a humongous fraction of them, sometimes in words, depending on the context, almost always in action, don't really proximately give a fuck to do anything about it. Many of them do. And those are the people who you're going to be able to help a lot. But a lot of them don't. And
I maybe this is anecdotal. I disagree. Every fat person that I've ever met wants to not be fat. It's just hard. It's so simple. Just eat less and eat better and exercise more. This is so simple. But it's hard to implement, especially when you're like addicted to food. Like that's what we're coming down to. And a lot of times the pathways aren't clear. When it comes to the exercise, you have to find out what you like, and then you have to figure out how to way to implement it correctly. I always talk about weight training. I like weight training a lot. And so it's like, how do you do that? I always say Starting Strength by Mark Ripto. Great way to start. Look at resources like Alan Thrall and Mike Israel, by the way. But then it's like nutrition. And it's like, you have so much to learn about nutrition that like I didn't even know about. Obviously, you want to eat more fiber because that has a better impact on how you digest things, even sugar. Try not to have any sugar without fiber. My understanding is there's no sugar in that's actually by nature that comes separate from fiber. You're meant to ingest it. So try to stay away from very high like carb and fatty foods together. You know, like donuts, those aren't natural. You know, maybe you have something that's high fat, but with protein, or high sugar with protein. That's a better way to ingest things. Understanding the thermogenics of food, like eating 1,000 calories of protein overall is going to be, or excuse me, 1,000, yeah, eating 1,000 calories of protein overall is going to be less calories on your body than 1,000 calories of fat because it requires so much energy to process, and then it processes more as muscle, right? There are so many different things to have an understanding when it comes down to like diet and exercise. So it's like really easy to be like, yeah, nobody actually wants to change. It's like, oh, but I don't think that's true. I just think that some people think that it's hopeless to change, especially when it comes to their mentality around change, where it's like, you need to lose weight. If your only goal is to lose weight, you're not going to lose, you're going to fail, because once you stop losing weight, you think you failed, right? A lot of people will start dieting and then they'll lose a lot of weight really quickly. It's usually water weight because they eat better, because they're trying to eat like really healthy. And then they crash out after 3 or 4 weeks. It's like, oh, I'm not losing 5 pounds anymore, even though a lot of it was water weight. And they're like, oh, I guess I give up. But if you're just going to be healthier and develop patterns, like this whole past year, I've committed to going to the gym and weight training, and I've done it for this whole year. Next year, the goal is to do 3 days of the gym a week, which I've been doing, and then 3 days of walking a week, right? Slow implementation of better patterns while you go and get like medical help so that you can be in a better spot is the way to go. But people don't necessarily have those resources. It sounds very commonsensical, but it can take a long time to come to those conclusions. I'm 34 years old.
And the thing that revelation that you get from behavioral genetics and sort of multifactorial analysis that reveals like some people just kind of want to do this stuff and they like eating junk and they're not going to be bothered by it.
Well, of course we like eating junk, but it is what it is, but it's not like we don't want to change.
Because there are hundreds of millions of them that exist in the world and tens of millions in the United States at the extremes even. The optimism you have to have for your ability to change the situation has to be brought down to reality, and your bandwidth for how to think about addressing the problem has to expand to think, okay, we got people nutritionally much more educated. It helped a few percentage points. We thought nutritional education, as we were taught in school, was maybe a third of the issue, but it had a 6% reductive effect, and we're at the saturation point for nutritional education, where people can tell you, and here's been my experience, almost everyone who walks through the door at McDonald's and out comes with a shaken burger, do you think that's healthy? Almost everyone will go, no, hell no. What? You give people a bag of chips or a green apple. Which one's healthy? 90% of every American is going to be like, I said this on another podcast, this is a trick question, right? Like, no, legitimate question. They're like, you're fucking with me. It's the apple. Duh.
Well, if you ask that to Dr. Gundry, he would disagree with you. He says grapes are basically the same thing as Hershey's.
So you know how like one...
Well, that's silly because there's fiber in the grapes. That fiber in the grapes is just going to make it better with consumption when it comes to anything else.
It's like the monk on top of the mountain. The simpleton and the monk agree. Yeah. Gundry's that smart that he's come back around.
Wow. Okay. You're giving him a lot of credit.
Dr. Gundry, by the way. I'm so sorry I said Gundry. How insulting. Do you want to do a cigarette break really quick to enhance our health?
No, I want to live a shorter life.
I almost broke my phone in half when I watched the cigarette clip, by the way. But I decided to smoke a cigarette instead because I care about my longevity and something nicotinamide, something other, the British health study, you know the rest.
Oh man, that was painful. If we control food drive, does conscientiousness not matter for obesity?
Oh man, I would like to agree with that.
That's an interesting conversation. I mean, that's like Ozempic. Ozempic helps you control your food drive because you're usually less hungry.
It won't matter nearly as much as it does now. So if you control completely food drive, so conscientiousness expresses itself in fun ways. You give people ubiquitous access to anorectic medications, let's say 7th gen in 2032. They're just ultra.
The better version of Ozempic for
the
those listening.
10x better version. You still got to take the pill. And there are people who, even if it's a one-time genetic enhancer shot, you get the shot, your genes change, you're just going to be skinny with your genes. Some people aren't going to take the shot. Some of those people are just like, hey, did you get to the treatment center to get your shot? They're like, nah. How many people, what is the correlation between conscientiousness and doctor's visits?
Well, I don't know. What's the correlation between people being able to afford to go to the doctor? You're kind of forgetting like an entire aspect here.
It's real high.
You want a gym video? Maybe today I'll record my wife, how my wife recorded me front squatting.
Some people just don't give a shit. You ever deal with people in a hospital setting who like haven't been to the doctor in living memory? Of course. Yeah. So when you're conscientious,
yeah, but then like the question is why, bud? Like, do they hate doctors, or does it cost them? Do they have to hit a $9,000 out of pocket before their insurance will kick in? So they're like, oh, fuck it, I'm not even going to bother. That's kind of there's a couple of extra questions to ask here, honestly.
Low, short of us violating your civil liberties.
Yeah, look, I have patients that are nihilistic that end up in my office for a variety of reasons, 100%. And I can't really help them.
Right. Right. So, but the food drive thing is for all the folks with low conscientiousness that take the food drive medication and or get the shot or whatever, they're going to see enormous changes. However, even if you have relatively low food drive, junk food is still fun to eat.
Sure.
And your ability...
But you could have like a healthy relationship with eating junk food now.
To think of, is this good for me or bad for me? If we get you back down to like normal food drive, you can still be substantially overweight, though not obese, because you just really like to snack. And someone's like, are you hungry? And you're like, not really, just eating.
Look, bodily autonomy is
huge
everyone's
deal.
Right. So like I box and that's terrible for me and I know it is and yet I do it.
Yes, exactly. I have taken...
Oh, yeah, because you can get like a fucking like CTE.
And grotesque amounts of anabolic steroids and all the bad things I talked about last time on this show. So it will have a huge effect. It won't have
100%.
It won't have 100%.
Well, who's looking for 100%? I feel like with one variable controlled, you're not going to get 100%.
No, for sure. But you're going to get a lot because food drive is absolutely the quintessential variable. Because if
you're going to get a lot, why even talk about conscientiousness? It's not... You can't really change it, as you said.
Yet.
If you control for the other variable that you talk about within the poor communities about food drive, it pretty much gets you almost all the way there. Not a lot of the way there. For sure. A significant majority. Why talk about it?
Yeah, easy. So you're going to have a situation in our magical mystery pretend world here.
You crush 8 miles in 30 minutes on a bike. That's awesome, brother. Congratulations.
Where the difference in obesity rates between poor people and richer people used to be, let's say, 10 imaginary units of obesity, and now there are 2 imaginary units of obesity, right? We made an 80% reduction in the difference between wealthier and poor people. We've addressed everything you suggested and everything I suggested short of conscientiousness. Food drive, medication, access to everything. Everyone's no longer experiencing stress and trauma, relatively same rates, so on and so forth. Like, look at Japan, for example. It's actually just not true to say that poor people in Japan experience more crime, stress, and trauma than richer people, because there's just no statistical differentiation hardly between them. Like, there's just not really any crime and stress and drama anywhere in Japan, relative to us, right?
I have no idea.
So yeah, well, you could look at the statistical data, but if you go to Japan, all of a sudden it seems like, okay, where are all the...
Well, it's hard to take Dr. Mike's statistical information at face value, because I don't know if he necessarily understands all the statistics that he's engaging with, if he doesn't think school is particularly productive, or good school is particularly productive, unless I'm just misinterpreting that. I don't really know.
Violent people. I'm going to Japan in a little bit, so I'm trying to bring violence to them. I'm kidding, Japanese people, please. All jokes. So if you look at that situation in the future that we could have, we would reduce the problem.
Oh fuck, dude! I hate to say this, because like, yeah, Japan generally has lower crime rates, although they have higher sexual violence rates over there, at least in my understanding, or rather more normalized sexual violence, because like obviously if you have to have a whole train cars for women, that's not something inherent to Japanese people. I think it's just a culture that disrespects women, which a lot of cultures do, unfortunately, especially religiously censored ones. I really want to talk. I want to know this guy's take on different races of people. I really want to know, because something's telling me that this guy, I love Dr. Mike still, but something tells me that he sits on Twitter all day and he absorbs tons and tons and tons of basically Twitter psyoping you into hating groups of people. And he referenced earlier, and he hinted at the genetic differences between different races of people. And now he's saying that Japanese people, even the poor ones, don't seem to have very high levels of violence. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, Dr. Mike, what do you think about minority groups in America? And I want to know what your opinion on these individuals is. And do you think that there's level of genetics, and what level? I don't know. I don't know, man. I'm getting Twitter vibes from Dr. Mike. I love Dr. Mike still. He's so much more relatable now that I can see he hates black people. No, I'm kidding. But I'm just so curious. I really am, man. Maybe I'm reaching, but...
Well, an unbelievable amount, but differences still exist. You're going to have the temptation, especially with the ideological bias of most of these institutions that we have that actually make these changes, like institute the regulations for food.
I would have to have a conversation with him, like in private, though. He would never have that public conversation.
And so on. So the people behind them, and the people politically who voted in those people, very well-meaning Americans who want the problem to be resolved. Because anything that's a difference between wealthier and poor people, including money itself, is kind of fucking gross, right? Like, what the fuck? Like, just because you have less money, you should have like shittier health? That's fucked up. Like, we all want the difference to be zero. When the difference used to be 10 units and now it's 2, holy shit, to your point, like, that's it. Problem more or less solved.
Not problem solved.
No, but like, we did it. Why?
Yeah, because now I'm looking into this, and it's like Japan has lower levels of wealth inequality, which is a central driver of crime. So before, he's talking about like, yeah, well, Japan has rich and poor people, and they don't really have the same violence issues in America. And it's like, well, I wonder why that is. Oh, it's because wealth inequality isn't as extreme over there. They have better levels of equality when it comes to wealth. People need to understand this. It's not just about how poor people are. It's about how poor people are relative to how rich other people are. It's a huge factor. If we all turned off our phones and stopped comparing ourselves to other people, we would have happier lives, but we don't do that. But when you log on, or you go on your phone on break after you're in the middle of a 10 or 12 hour shift at work, you're working for fucking, pennies on the dollar. Your union is fucking you in the ass. Your boss is fucking you in the ass. And then you see him driving a really nice car after he was taking a nap in his office. And then you see all these healthcare CEOs denying coverage, even though you have to pay, $10,000 a year for your health insurance for you and your family. And you have like a $10,000 deductible, out of pocket before they'll even kick in. And you're like, holy fuck, this is bullshit. That's where the problem comes in. So when you look at Japan, less wealth inequality, even if they might be, let's say they were poor on average than us, they have less wealth inequality, so they don't have these issues. But comparatively, we see it every day, whether it's in person or even through our phone. All these fucking entitled rich pieces of shit that have decisions over sometimes our healthcare, going, haha, fuck you. And it's like, well, why is that person doing so much better if I'm putting in more hard work? That's the issue there. There are inequalities that exist in America, whether it not just wealth inequalities, but also social inequalities, class inequalities, race inequalities, sex inequalities that exist over here that don't necessarily exist in Japan. They are very there's a very ethnically homogenous over there. We're not. We know we have a history of literally slavery in America. Every minority group of people that's ever come to America has been oppressed. It doesn't matter if it's black people, Hispanic people, Italian people, German people, Irish people have all been treated as less than at one point in their life. This is not an issue that Japan has to deal with, where you have a bunch of people coming over And then they have to settle into a society where there's deeply ingrained racism over and over and over again. This is not something that happens in Japan. And so this conversation, I just feel like in this conversation, there's so many different things that I'm hearing from Dr. Mike that I love this guy because I think he's so smart when it comes to like working out. But socially, it just feels like he's missing the mark in a way that like it makes me question. It just makes me question how much of this he assigns to genetics, because he's very big into that, and how much he assigns to social, like or like social atmospheres. I'm just genuinely curious.
Do I still give a shit about conscientiousness? Here's why. Because when you have that smaller difference, people are going to be like, all right, we're not doing enough on the regulation side. We're not doing enough education.
Do you think they'll go too far? That's your concern.
They have in almost every other regard. That's just what they do. And, as soon as the oppression Olympics situation that's happened recently in politics, as soon as you could no longer statistically detect different levels of oppression among different genders and races in the United States, which probably was mostly the case about the 1980s, depending on what literature you look.
Well, no. That's not true.
Some really in the 1970s, definitely 1990s. In the 90s, you think like, dude, like overtly, insanely like racist, homophobic, like in the old Alabama way people. They're just like they're teeny tiny fraction. And they can't possibly explain all these systemic differences and stuff.
Well, yeah, because it's not as acceptable to be outwardly racist.
People went way overboard for 30 years trying to address these issues, not coming back to being like, okay, what's the base reality here? So for the conscientiousness situation, if we kiboshed every other variable, but we still have this 20%, which absolutely is much lower, but relative to someone who...
There's so much there that I just feel like he's not saying that he wants to say, and I need to hear it. There's something there that we're not... There's something here that he's not saying. There's something here that he's refusing to say. I don't know. I don't know, man.
Comes of age during that time and sees like big differences. You know what I mean? Like imagine someone from the year 1600 coming to America and you just give them a tour of New York City.
I don't think it's true that we as a society have effectively rooted out all inequalities when it comes to race, sex, gender, all these other nonsense or whatever the fuck's going on. By the 1990s, black people were only considered people in the 1960s. You're thinking that it all disappeared in 25 years? Hold on a second. This doesn't even make sense. Sorry. I don't know.
And they're like, what's that person like? It's a poor person. Like, he's overweight and he has a cell phone in his hand. Like, right. That's what poor people are like, but it's real bad. They're like, he has no place to sleep. Like, he has a place to sleep. It's warm. He's a gigantic color television. He has access to the internet. He gets essentially like functionally through the city, really, really good health care. Like, what's that mean? Like, nobody really dies of infections anymore unless they like really untreated. All the diseases you know about don't exist anymore. And they're like, I don't understand why we even care about rich and poor. Everyone's rich. But to us growing up today, even small differences can seem quite stark. Mm-hmm. And so what we'll do in the future then, if we don't account for conscientiousness being a relatively large variable, then we're going to have this thing where we got to do all this other stuff. And the reality is none of that other stuff is going to work because it's completely saturated. We're going to be attacking a problem from completely the wrong angle because we've never sort of taken to task the real kind of the crux of the issue. A quick offhand example. If you've had some relatives who you deal with, who you've had not so great relations with, you think it's the way I'm speaking to them. It's the way they understand me. We have to have a come to Jesus talk. We have to do the therapy. And it turns out years later, like they have a psychological condition that's endemic and they have to be on drugs and therapy for it, but you never addressed that because you didn't want to be like, hey, Uncle Bill, I think you're fucking crazy, like crazy. I think you need pills because you were like, well, that's not cool. I'm not telling him that. You would have been like, you know what? I'm just not kind enough to Bill. Next time I'm bringing an even bigger Christmas or Hanukkah present or whatever the fuck.
I'm sorry. I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with this because we literally we put people in therapy and prescribe them medication. I would say one of the issues is sometimes overprescription of medications. This whole entire rant about being too afraid to put people on meds because they might just be, in his words, crazy is stupid. We have an entire DSM-5 that has a list of different mental issues that we prescribe medications and behavioral issues for, behavioral protocols for. What is he talking about? He is looking at a very real victim complex that people have, and he's just taking it. He's running with it in such a weird, illogical way. What the fuck?
And every year you bring a bigger present, he's just the same kind of dick. Now, it was better than when you didn't give him presents at all, but it hit a baseline. And you're like, what am I doing wrong? And the answer is nothing. That's just who Bill is. People with a very low conscientiousness can only be helped to a certain point. They just make different choices. It's like trying to expect your toddler to be formal with greetings and go to school on time by himself. You're like, that's a kid. You can't expect him to do that. People with low trait conscientiousness are going to live their lives in different ways and face a cacophony of problems that don't occur to people of high conscientiousness, problems that even exist for an adult. And if we don't have an understanding that that's a real thing that we should expect, we're going to spend a lot of time and resources that could have alternatively better spent in 50 other different ways on that problem, and they're going to have no effect for generations. We've already done this with education in the United States. We've already done it with a ton of different factors. What I'm saying is, let's get a full understanding compassionately of the problem at hand. Try to understand what fraction of what is accounted for by which sources that could have alternatively have a cacophony of problems that don't occur to people of high conscientiousness, problems that even exist for an adult. And if we don't have an understanding that that's a real thing that we should expect, we're going to spend a lot of time and resources that could have alternatively better spent in 50 other different ways on that problem, and they're going to have no effect for generations. We've already done this with education in the United States. We've already done it with a ton of different factors.
No, we haven't. No, we have not. My God. Okay. So like I'm a little older, but like there was a huge push for Head Start programs like maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Statistically speaking, it was a fact that if you had a Head Start program, which means just basically universal kindergarten, you had a higher chance of getting through school with better grades and not turning to crime. That was a fact. We never implemented that. But this concept that we've been wasting money on education for how many years and it hasn't been effective? No, we haven't been doing that. There are absolutely things that statistically should be implemented. Like, so I'm talking about, it's just, bro, it's, oh my God, I fucking hate this, but this is like some of the weirdest conservative dog whistling I've ever heard in some of the most unproductive ways. It's just weird. It's just weird Twitter talk. Everything is fucking Twitter brain with him right now. Thank you for the $5 from Jay. Dr. Mike went from bowling to budding. He's the new Benjamin Button. Okay.
What I'm saying is, let's get a full understanding compassionately of the problem at hand. Try to understand what fraction of what is accounted for by which variables. Definitely address the variables we can. But then when people say, like, how come there's still room left over? I would like future universities to say, look, you can help people a lot externally, but a lot of it depends on the person himself. And we haven't found a way to change that yet. And if you bright students of today have any great ideas about how...
Well, yeah, you could teach people better personal responsibility. And usually that's from like trying to maintain like a reasonable, loving household that's going to teach people to like engage in a positive culture. Some people are going to just be those people who they are. But at the end of the day, there are plenty of people that have plenty of like, that just haven't been addressed properly. I mean, when you have like areas of like high crime, those kids that are, have access to that area or live in that area, do you think that it's all genetic for them? Or do you think that it's some kind of an environment that's telling them that what's happening is like acceptable and it's just like the way that life is and they're going to have to adjust, so they're going to have to suffer or they're going to just die? I don't understand.
Hand-straight conscientious people, we need you to think.
The problem with this whole conversation is that there are no specific examples to actually route out what Dr. Mike is saying. Abstractly, what he's saying isn't necessarily wrong, but he's applying it too precisely to our society, where you need to flesh this out by saying, give me an example of this in a more meaningful way. Let's talk about high crime areas in the United States, and let's talk about the people that are typically high crime, typically poorer, and let's have this entire conversation and let's flesh this out, because there's so much that Dr. Mike is not saying that if you push him on it, it'll actually be productive. But like, there's no meaningful push in this conversation to be like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
That through, but so far we've kept away from it, but we know it's a factor, versus saying, why would you even care about that, you fucking Nazi? And then all of a sudden we're back to square one, where we're like, we've deployed all these strategies, we need more strategies. Imagine we're to a point where trait conscientiousness isn't accounting for all the obesity differences.
So I'm also just on like the more basic aspect of this, what do you expect to happen to get to a point in society where everything is perfect and we no longer try to solve problems? I don't understand. What are you saying?
And you're like, we need more anorectic intervention through drugs. When you're going to drive people so high in the anorectic scale, regular people who don't have low conscientiousness and who could just say, fuck snacks, I don't need any snacks, they're going to be like, the government's going to be like, here's the average dose of, future Ozempic we need you to take. They're going to be getting very low in body weight. They're going to be getting osteopenic. And you're going to say like, well, more, they need more. And you're like, no. We're actually having real nasty side effects from this now. The thing you're trying to change is a thing that can't be changed because you're not even looking at the right variable. It's like, how much more basketball training do I need to give you for you to be able to dunk? You're like, dude, I'm 5'3". There is no amount of training that's getting me to dunk. You're like, no, it's got to be something with the calf tendons. You need to go to Bulgarian basketball camp 24/7. You've just pissed away a child's life changing an unachievable goal.
You are worried about the future, trying to create perfect scenarios that perhaps don't exist. Because of some inevitably
the least charitable way to say
unchangeable.
that, yes.
No, because in the future, that's the concern. It's not an issue now. You're saying like right now, think about the social things, but like once you get the benefit of that, then don't think that you need to do more.
I don't.
That's a charitable interpretation of what he's saying.
Know any people that I've ever talked to who are genuinely concerned to try to make social changes that think they're working on a 10 to 20% factor. Almost all of them think they're working on an 80% factor, and they're not. So
who cares? Why does it matter what level that they think it is? who cares? Environment's very important. If I didn't grow up with the resources I have, I wouldn't be in this area. So
I think today
does that matter? Again, in the present.
Oh, yeah.
In the present.
Why?
Yeah. Oh,
Why?
yeah. Because how the government has finite resources. And if you think you have a huge degree of traction on a really big problem, then you're going to pour a lot of resources in that problem. And it's going to take resources away from other problems. Whereas if you realize, like, okay, we can pour some resources into this, and to be honest, we're doing pretty much as we can now, and the rest is kind of not up to us, then you go, okay, we're doing decent here. Let's switch to an alternate way of affecting other variables. We don't have free money coming out of the ground.
It's such a shame that we live in the time that we live in, where like we have this conversation about limited resources in America, because under like every single Democrat president except for Biden in like the last fucking like 30 years, the deficit has been going down, and we would even see surpluses under like Bill Clinton. Whereas every single conservative president in like the past 30 years has, it's probably even more than 30 years, has literally inflated the deficit even in good times. That's what Donald Trump is most famous for: literal government spending when we didn't need to spend that much money. And so we're having the conversation about limited resources when like the resources wouldn't be as limited if we got our shit together. We taxed rich people better. We figured out this technology problem that's displacing jobs and driving down wages, and we stopped recklessly cutting taxes for everybody. And it's just like we're having we have limited funds. We really don't need to have that many limited funds, but we keep getting presidents that are fucking cutting taxes in like easier times, like Donald Trump, and not addressing real problems like technology.
Ground. If we start getting free money coming out, they're going, fuck it, spend.
And like wealth inequality, which is a huge issue as well.
Money and everything. We just have people eat money at that point. You know what I mean?
Why do you think that when the self-esteem movement came about and people labeled that as the trait to focus on, no one called them Nazis?
What's the opposite of a Nazi ideology? A lot of conservative thinkers call them socialists and communists.
When they said this self-esteem.
No, yeah. You're gonna make up a bunch of entitled assholes and pussies. You're gonna pussify a whole generation. There's all sorts of nasty things said about that. But fundamentally, when you say, look, who's against people having more self-esteem? Nobody. Somehow if you could really improve people's self-esteem, people generally think that's a good thing. But if you say, like some people, the number one cause of the problems in their life is them and how they behave from a largely deeply cultural and genetic perspective. Like there are entire subsets of American society.
Sorry, I have to re-listen to what he's saying.
Improve people's self-esteem. People generally think that's a good thing. You're going to pussify a whole generation. There's all sorts of nasty things said about that. But fundamentally, when you say, look, who's against people having more self-esteem? Nobody. Somehow if you could really improve people's self-esteem, people generally think that's a good thing. But if you say, like some people, the number one cause of the problems in their life is them and how they behave from a largely deeply cultural and genetic perspective. Like there are entire subsets of American society with nothing racial, by the way. Every race has subsets of their culture that is like YOLO culture, like live for today, fuck everything else. Like, don't you think that matters? Whoa, no, we're not gonna go judging people's cultures. It seems nasty to judge people's activities. It seems nasty to blame the victim. And that's why you don't get as much.
Yeah, but the culture isn't the person, right? Like that cultural is a societal aspect of a person. No, like it's not
pushback about it. And that's why I'm here embarrassing myself to push back on it for reasons of, again, trade-offs of what issues you attack. Because if you think something's really tractable and you have the money to spend and it's worthwhile, you fucking spend the money. If you think something's not so tractable, we've already spent a lot of money, it's not seeming to have marginal effects at this point, you got to ask, because from a grander perspective, the kind of issues that affect the rest of the world make us look like spoiled fucking children. There are parts of Asia and Africa that are destitute. Mm-hmm. They need our help. And being a humanist, I don't give a fuck about borders or nations or any of that shit. Mm-hmm. It has huge value in other regards, but we got to help real people. And when you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars into nutritional education, where you now know that the returns on investment are teeny tiny, and you could be sending hundreds of millions of dollars in development aid properly administered in Africa and South Asia, oh my God, like you have 100-to-1 life-saving potential that
you
you're
wouldn't
like,
do well in politics with that message.
There's a reason I'm not in politics.
You wanted to talk about muscle. Can I tell you my take on it? And then
I would love that.
Because I don't want your thing to influence what I'm going to say.
Oh, of course.
My thought about muscle is that right now, muscle is talked about as a longevity organ because, like, for example, someone will get an invite to a podcast and they'll say, what's the most important organ? And they'll say your thighs. Because if you have good thigh muscle, you could stay independent, you can go see your friends, you can exercise, increase in muscle
Wasn't like your heart, because that like pretty much controls everything, no?
Tissue, decreases rates of hip fractures and balance, and they'll point to all these things. And I think muscle is incredibly important. And there's even a protective factor in muscle from obesity and regaining weight after losing weight if you were once obese. But I think it's just another phase of excitement to talk about obesity in a new way. Mm-hmm. That's my thought.
Yeah. Yep, I agree.
Okay.
You said it all. All right, cool podcast.
What does he mean? Does he mean that like some people overly focus on muscle as like a dog whistle to try to shame fat people? Maybe, I don't know.
Yes, wish all of them were this easy.
I don't think Dr. Mike does that.
No, but what's your thought, or how does it differ from mine?
So I think there are two components that in the real world are enormously effectual for health, long-term longevity, and a massive reduction in morbidity, even more than an increase in longevity. And that is the balance of muscle and fat that you have. Fat's the more important one of them by a factor of like 8 or some shit like that. But muscle is also important. And so at any given body weight, if you have more muscle and less fat, you are profoundly more healthy in every measurable way.
Yeah.
And if your body weight is also relatively lower, you're also profoundly more healthy. So when we are seeing people who are, let's say, in their 50s or something, their blood work's good, health outcomes are good, no concern. A regular, and I don't want to ascribe any opinions to people, so this is all Fantasyland nonsense, which is really should be the title of the podcast. Mike's a delusional idiot, comma, and a Nazi, in parentheses, Hitler himself reborn. So
He's really hamming up the victim complex on that one.
when people in a traditional medical establishment, which I don't ascribe you to be in.
I am.
Yeah, but you're one of these modern thinking doctors. You don't even smoke cigarettes when taking patients. What do you know? Dr. Gundry said, now I'm becoming angry at various clips of Gundry in my head. So when people see 50, 55-year-olds in their office, regular health screening, and all the blood work is good, they're like, sweet, have at it. You're great. See you next time. If I'm a person who's got, a little periscope to the office and I see them, and I see that person has a relatively low amount of skeletal muscle mass and a high degree of relative adiposity, relative body fat is higher. People that are like normal weight but kind of made of mush, skinny fat or whatever.
Like me right now.
I've been looking at your body for quite some time. I haven't seen anything I've disliked yet. So
Well, thank you.
no problem.
For your objective measure.
Okay, can we stop the podcast and get it popping?
Yes.
The cameras can stay on, by the way.
That's a different show, Mike.
Oh, nice. I heard that's going well as well. Mine is also. Mostly feet. I digress. When I see that person,
What a gooner. That's why I love Dr. Mike.
and if I'm that doctor, I'm not a medical doctor, but if I'm like a consultant to the medical doctor, like, hey, sports scientist, what do you think? I'll be like, we got to try to talk to this person about resistance training consistently, eating a diet of enough protein to make a difference, and trying to get the balance of their fat and muscle through whatever ways. Decrease in fat, increase in muscle. Usually it's much more decrease in fat because muscle gain doesn't go as high as fat loss is capable of. I want to see them next time in the office just thinking of older folks, like a Willem Dafoe. Do you know who that is?
Of course.
It doesn't matter what age he is, he's fucking lean. And he's kind of jacked. Not jacked, but he's like wiry. Mm-hmm. A person 55 years old of Willem Dafoe's body composition, to me, is a person who is, outside of crazy whatever drug habit or whoever the hell knows, for real people in the real world, at just the value of their body composition as a predictive variable for future morbidity and mortality. I would say, like, if you're in really good health, but you have a high degree of adiposity or low degree of muscle mass, even if you're of a healthy weight, you need to get to work on making your muscle mass higher and your fat mass lower, because that is going to have a huge effect on how your health is later. And so if I'm a consultant to medical doctors, I don't rest until every patient I see over the long term eventually comes back to the office with visible muscularity and no grotesque aggregated adiposity, like massive spare tire, thighs, etc. Or if they flex their arm, there's some hard stuff in there versus just goop. Now, none of this is a personal judgment whatsoever. I actually don't value people more or less based on how jacked or lean they are to any extent. I don't care.
Yeah, I believe that. I've seen him talk about like fat people before. Like Dr. Mike is very, he's very considerate when he talks about like people that like obese people with weight problems.
Care at all. Most of the best people that I look up to in the world, I don't even know what their body comp is. I don't care. But as far as an individual perspective, the more muscular you can be and the leaner you can be, especially the latter, but definitely the former, the healthier you will be long term. And the strength of these variables as a factor of variables is so massive that I don't want that doctor letting people out of his office with good blood work in their 50s who have very...
It's unfortunate because I'm listening to this before I go to the gym tonight in a few hours, and I'm going with my wife, and we've been talking about her starting to do weight training. Like, as you know, now with the new year, and I think I'm going to make her start weight training with me. I think we're going to start going to the gym like 7 days a week, 4 walking days, 3 workout days, and just try to put on more muscle mass together. Nice and slow, and just like she hates. I think that's something that women tend to hate, is doing that kind of stuff, but I think I have to force her to do it so we can both be healthier,
Very little muscle mass, but a lot of adiposity relatively, and just be like, you're good to go. I want that doctor, if it's in the scope of practice and polite conversation to them, to be like, hey, you're doing good. Now your DEXA scan has you doing just fine. The bones look strong, but you'll benefit really, really greatly if you do some resistance training. Here are the resources for that. Here are the resources for diet, to work with a registered dietitian, to bring the body fat down and the muscularity up. And the person's going to be like, why? My blood work's good. And you're like, see, it's good now. But the thing that makes it good is largely how much fat and muscle you have over years and years and years. That's my big contention.
Yeah, it's good to be like preventative rather than to be reactive. Try to be more preventative, right?
You're a walking.
Mama got powerlifting, bro. I'm telling you right now, if my wife actually committed to powerlifting, she'd be fucking so strong. It would be so hot. I would fucking lick the sweat out of her fucking ass cheeks. Are you kidding me? All right, enough. Sorry. Who said that?
This woman sitting, oxymoron.
How dare you?
I love my wife. She's very beautiful. I'm just saying, I'm not against muscular mommies. You know what I mean?
I've never been accused of, guys, what word is that? What did he say? I'm not a moron.
Do you know why I'm saying
OxyClean was a great product.
Do you know why I say that?
I have my suspicions.
We had this whole 2-hour conversation, and the takeaway on your end, it seemed, was that the social issues require so much work, but are not going to give you the majority of the benefit. Does that sum it up somewhat fairly from an obscure side? Mm-hmm. And then you want, in the limited time we have in our offices, to change human behavior by telling them, hey, lift more. And you think that's going to lead to actual human behavior change? When we look at recommendations of diet and exercise for weight loss, 95, 98% failure over the long term.
Yeah.
Talk about getting little reward for the time spent.
Sure.
The thing you're talking about, which I agree with, by the way.
Wait, that's actually such an intelligent way to approach that. That makes like a total amount of sense. Dr. Mike wants to implement some kind of societal change, some kind of educational change through like, hey, you should lift weights more and have better muscle mass, which is totally true. But he also thinks that that we can't implement systems to educate people in different ways. That would be a system of education that you'd have to implement. And that would start by doing school. I think that gym classes in schools should be like, hey, what do you want to do for fitness? We're going to teach you how to do it. It could be Zumba, it could be yoga, it could be walking, it could be weight training, it could be powerlifting, it could be strongman, it could be anything that you want to do. That's how I think that we should operate, Instead, we promote football, which gives people CTEs. Unironically, like that's not healthy. Just to be clear.
Yeah, of course.
Is the thing that actually yields the worst result.
Yeah, I didn't claim it was going to save humanity. The other thing is, if you deal with highly conscientious people, it is possible to have an effect.
It sounds like you have a bias for conscientious people.
I do.
Okay.
No.
Well, at least you said it.
Yeah.
Because you said you don't judge people based on their body mass, but you probably would judge them based on their conscientiousness.
We could have a long philosophical discussion on what judging people actually means. I appraise everything.
I wish I could have like a private conversation with Dr. Mike, because that there is a little bit of concerning nature here when it comes to like some of the ways that he talks about politics, some of the ways that he talks about different groups of people. When he says that he has a higher value on conscientious people, there are some interesting thoughts behind those thoughts that could potentially be there, but I would have no idea unless I was able to be like, I have to push you on A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z,
When I ever meet you, I've been on dates before where the girl's like, are you judging me? I'm like, absolutely.
Are you the guy in the room that talks about what discrimination actually means?
Yeah, hell yeah.
Okay. Can you tell the audience?
Discrimination is not necessarily bad. It depends on what you're discriminating for. Like, we should obviously discriminate against like fucking babies from driving cars, right? Like, it depends on what it is.
I'm not trying to cancel myself anytime soon. Discrimination is the ability to tell things apart. Yeah, Thomas Sowell on my t-shirt, man. I can't do that.
Well, discrimination is about looking at a particular group of people and deciding to remove them from the ability to do a certain thing based on a particular quality. Discrimination in and of itself is not bad. It's okay to discriminate against babies driving, or certain men from going into women's locker rooms or women going into men's locker rooms. It's okay to discriminate against like older people who literally can't possess the ability to drive from driving. We discriminate all the time. It's about what is the discrimination? What's the reason for it? If you discriminate against a 15-year-old from driving a car, it's generally because 15-year-olds aren't mature enough to drive cars. If you discriminate against a black person from drinking from the same water fountain, you have no justifier other than like hating black people from using your water fountain. That's the difference of discrimination. Discrimination isn't inherently bad. We discriminate all the time. You can't be like 25 years old and go to high school. You have to get your GED. There's a reason for these different things, but there are logical justifiers for it. So discrimination in and of itself is not bad. It just depends on what you're discriminating. Like, why are you discriminating? Yeah, baby phobia, very important.
I read Discrimination Disparities, and he did a great job talking about if your discriminatory taste with wine
or with your sexual partners, yes,
you will be a fine describer of wines.
Yes, exactly. So basically, first, if you tell people of low conscientiousness to like, hey, lift weights and eat better, reduce your body fat, fucking who gives a shit? So people who are high conscientious, they'll have a better time of it and be able to do better. But this brings me to the next part of my talk, where this kind of social effect is going to hit some people, but it requires so much effort in our modern food environment to constrain your adiposity, to increase your muscularity, that a lot of people just don't find it as something that manages to squeeze in their schedule. And I think that if you have a situation where you tell people, like, really, doctors across America are really pushing resistance training, they're really pushing lowering adiposity, even relative adiposity, if BMI is not too high, you're going to have a substantial effect that's in that 10% of solving the problem. But that's like tens of millions of people whose lives have been extended. It's wonderful. Exactly. Like, I think that your sociological stuff is wonderful. It's great. Right?
But you don't like
Yeah, so we should implement all these things.
No, I love it. I just think it's just not super powerful. So I agree with.
I think if you don't think that 10% is powerful, then like I don't really know what to tell you. That just seems like it seems like Dr. Mike is illogically against social reform because he thinks that maybe one day it'll go too far. And he doesn't have, instead of having, this is a problem with Dr. Mike here, is instead of having a productive conversation about like how much of a social thing we should implement, and like reeling it in for going too far, instead of talking about that, he's just like, yeah, just throw the baby out with the bathwater, kind of the mentality. And it's just something I just think is very ignorant and doesn't really scream to me somebody that would be particularly conscientious, to be honest with you.
I'm just total.
Given that your career is about the non-super powerful thing.
Really, my career is about like sports science. It's a hobby. I work in the entertainment industry. Legitimately, sports is just entertainment. So that being the case, I think the next step, and this was described well in a review article recently written, we need to really seriously consider the development of a non-androgenic anabolic drug. So we've now have the modern anorectic drugs, the GLPs, GIPs, glucagon agonists, that have allowed us to kick down to any body weight reasonably as we tolerate the drugs. Any body weight you want, you just crank the dosage, eventually you get to that body weight, as long as you're just remotely interested in eating sort of the right things.
Not necessarily the case.
I'll debate you all day.
It's not my take. Again, the bariatric surgeon said that once you're in the BMIs of 50 and 60, the GLP-1s are not getting you where you need to be alone. And that's why multimodal therapy is now the forefront of the research, where it's both.
Both what?
Bariatric surgery with the GLP-1 after.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, then you have like also like an insane number of fat cells at that point that are screaming really loud, and they just can't dial up the dose enough to, so that's why I mentioned side effects. If you could mute the side effects and dial up the dose, you could get people in the 500 or 600 pound range to weigh 100 pounds within a matter of years. But they're going to look like skin bags or whatever, which I will say, I have to say this as much as possible. You
got that flying squirrel physique, pretty cool. Might as well. First human to fly, baby. Go for it. See, that's why I'm bulking. I'm bulking so that one day I could cut and then I could fucking fly like a flying squirrel.
Skin removal techniques as an industry, surgical and non-surgical, are the $1 trillion question for modern medicine in the late 2020s, early 2030s. So whoever the fuck is listening, hit me up. I'll invest in your company. JK, please, I don't know, feel free to give it a shout out. I don't know.
Well, I mean, skin surgery. Well, first of all, you need to get extra skin removed because you can like develop like skin issues. But yeah, I mean, that would be a pretty lucrative, I guess, industry to get into, huh?
I'll see the email, but it's a big deal, right? Because Ozempic and all those drugs are helping so many people lose weight. And a lot of people think, like, I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to look like whatever, like the celebrity I like. And they're like, oh shit, skin just doesn't go away. And so skin removal is a big, big deal in the future. But so
maybe as bariatric surgery drops off, because the latest study that came out showed 130% rise in GLP-1 prescriptions and a 30% drop off in bariatric surgeries. So maybe as they have more time.
Well, I think people would rather do Ozempic because it's much like less taxing. So
because when I asked the bariatric surgeon about that, she said that they have spent their time where they're performing less bariatric surgery, performing general surgery.
Interesting.
Also, but maybe they could do skin.
For sure. And also like is a very different thing from like developing medical techniques that are effective. If you're in a very niche field of medicine, it's just not a huge environment with a lot of like total part of the economy going into it and total amount of thought going into how to resolve those problems. There's lots of people thinking about heart disease. Very few people thinking about like, austere monogenic conditions, or like just there's 3 guys in the world that study your condition. I'm really sorry. Hopefully we'll get more AI about it in the future. But again, as literally tens of millions of people become candidates for skin removal surgery, that side of plastics is going to be like exploding, because it's like, oh my God, like anyone who figures out 10x cheaper and more effective, easily recoverable, and aesthetically more pleasing skin removal technique, bro, the medical companies that do the tech and the doctors that do best surgeries, huge. In any case, I digress.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's the exact opposite of what the future looks like for food companies.
Oh boy, that's a whole other thing.
I have a question because I love your philosophic answers on these.
Mike, where the fuck am I supposed to go? That's my question, Dr. Mike.
Name one industry that benefits from societal significant weight loss.
That benefits from significant societal weight loss?
Like if we were to create like a better version of Ozempic 10 point.
That's a good question. The question here is from a capitalist perspective, what is the benefit to having not fat people? And I don't think I could come up with a single answer except for maybe gyms. maybe, because then maybe you'd be going more. But then again, the reason you go to a gym is generally either to be like consistently weight train, I guess. Or you subscribe to a gym member. I wonder how many people subscribe to gym memberships just so that they can, like, because they were going to go and they do like a year membership and they're just like, maybe they never cancel. I don't know what industry benefits. I mean, you'd have more money for other things. So like sports industries, short-term clothing companies, because if you lose weight, you have to dress in certain clothes. Outdoor activities like nightclubs and stuff like that, or dancing, things where people are more social activities would gain because you'd have more confidence to go out and do more and engage more. You have more energy to do more and engage more. I think that there actually probably are quite a few industries. I think that right now, though, there is a level of like a capitalistic dependence on obesity because you make tons of money through doctors, which fuck you in the ass, and food, which, you know, fucks me coming out of my ass. I'll tell you that much for sure.
0.0 that is better, no side effects, no issues, and we can get everyone into a healthy weight. What industry benefits from
The
that?
junk food industry.
Benefits?
Yeah, hugely.
How does it benefit?
Because now you can eat junk food and it doesn't fucking matter.
No,
You're not
but
gonna
you
get to be a
consume
fat
less
piece of
junk
shit.
food.
Yeah, less. You're not going to.
Okay, this is just Dr. Mike. You're playing pretend right now. Like you're playing pretend where like people will lose weight and eat a bunch of junk food. You're being ridiculous.
Eat zero, and now you can eat tons of junk food, and as long as you get your protein,
This is just sorry. This is a stupid fucking answer from Dr. Mike. He's just being silly right now.
all the healthy foods in, you're not going to be excessive on calories.
He's not being serious right now with this answer.
Because you fill up so fast. So now junk food companies want you to believe that junk food can be part of a healthy, balanced diet. And they're completely correct for a small fraction of people that have very low food drive. In the future, with monoanerectic drugs being ubiquitous, everyone's going to have low food drive. And it's actually true to say, like, dude, get a bag of Cheetos. And people are like, well, I don't know. They're going to lead to, no, they're not. Have a bag of Cheetos. You're fucking good. No one ever got fat from a bag of Cheetos. Now, hundreds of thousands of bags of Cheetos over the lifetime. That's the thing. The junk food industry is going to adapt and make junk foods are maybe some of the similar ones today. They'll also maybe make ones that are slightly healthier, higher in protein. So an industry that's going to, I think, absolutely blow up is the high protein, healthy food, but fun snacking industry. You got a lot of people now that are losing weight. They're empowered by these beautiful new drugs, but they're like, I still kind of want to eat some fun foods, but I know some of the shit's not good for me. And these medicines have put me on the right path. Because there any way I can eat like potato chips that aren't going to fucking kill me? Healthy junk food is just glazed with glory and profit, I think. But junk food in general, I don't
Do you
think
think more so than the current junk food that exists? Like there's higher profit margins in that than what
in healthy junk food? Yeah, hell yeah. Because more people are going to be,
I just think right now the foods are so hyper palatable and so addictive that whatever healthy junk food you have, there's no way someone's going to buy 10 bags of it.
So I do have an interesting prediction. There's not a real war, not a hot war, no shots exchanged. There is a war between hyperpalatable foods and monoanerectic medications. The response for foods development now is going to be like, okay, people are eating less with Ozempic. How do we make our food so fucking tasty, even with Ozempic, that they continue to eat them in large quantities? It's a cool thing. Eventually, it's just going to make a lot of food really, really amazing and really, really cheap, and a lot more people who want to be just as lean as they like eating those amazing cheap foods in moderation. But if in like 10 years you're not on a monoanerectic drug and you're like the average food drive and you just eat sort of whatever shows up to your mouth, the probability that you're going to be obese is insanely high. Same prediction it would have been in the 1950s. Like think about the 50s, right? Not a lot of hyperpalatable foods going around. Just regular people with normal appetites that today are 300 pounds were like 175 pounds back then. You're going to be like, dude, in the 2020s, you're going to be fat. Like, bullshit. No way. Like, food is going to be so good and so cheap, you have no idea. Fast forward to the 2020s, you're like, dude, you're right. I can't stop eating this shit. That trend is going to continue. So the Ozempic stuff haven't ended. They're just another salvo in that fight of corporations bringing you pleasure. But ideally, the best corporations bring you all the pleasure with none of the side effects, which is why I think healthy foods that are super tasty, but are good for you and fill you up. My God, imagine a bag of chips you could buy that was very nutritious, unbelievably delicious, and was super, super affordable.
Well, we're already kind of seeing these industries coming out when it comes to like, you know, diet foods and like different, like, yeah, this is already something that's gaining more popularity, mostly because of the trend of people wanting to like eat healthy, or at least appear to eat healthy.
You would just eat that regularly. And because that company continues to sell you chips and has nothing to apologize for and can advertise like, you can make this part of your diet.
Can you name one food like that right now?
Oh, I have a really good example. Fairlife shakes.
The dairy-based protein shakes?
Correct. They are unbelievably delicious and really, really nutritious as well.
All right.
Oh,
Are
wait
you
a minute.
sponsored by
Fairlife shakes? Wait, am I drinking Fairlife? Oh yeah, the core powers. I have these upstairs. They're very good. I think the ones I got from Costco have 30 grams of protein and like no sugar, and then they're actually really good. But I don't really see that as like a health food. I don't really know what the fuck he's talking about when it comes to that.
No, God, no. Fairlife, please sponsor us. I love them. I love you. I'll sing your praises. Dude, Fairlife's amazing. Yeah. There's lots of like cool chicken sausages they have now.
I'm just not. I don't know if that's necessarily qualifying with like whatever he's talking about.
That you can get at the store and grill up that are incredible macro, super high protein, low fat, and they're ultra delicious and super healthy. So
heme iron.
Would those be delicious for people with the average palate or with like a bodybuilding palate that eat like fucking eggs all the time to the point where they want to puke?
Say that again?
Heme iron,
What's that?
dangerous component of meat-based foods.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, let's make a sausage together. That's
I just think that a great idea. Oh, I'm gonna die here. Fuck. I think a great idea for people to engage with is try to eat your typical shit that you're eating, but then maybe mix it in with like a protein shake afterwards. Like if you're gonna have that McDonald's, then maybe after you have that McDonald's, like just have a protein shake with it, you know, because this way you'll feel more full afterwards. I'm not even kidding. I try to do that more now. Like I'll go and we'll go to the deli and get like a bagel or something. I'll get like a bologna and cheese and fucking like whole wheat. And then afterwards I'll have a protein shake with it just so that I can kind of shore up the lack of protein that I just ate.
It's like the prime drink or the, what's that, Lunchly of sausages? I'm kidding.
Lunchly.
It's terrible what you did on Twitter, by the way.
What did I do on Twitter?
I'm kidding. You had that one post about Twitter misrepresenting all of your
on YouTube.
make-believe tweets of yours. Remember?
Yeah, isn't that wild?
That's so fun, yeah. All's fair in love and thumbnails and titles. So.
No, that's not right. I don't agree with that.
Well, that's my opinion.
I told you though. What did I tell you though? What did I tell? I guessed this at the beginning of the podcast or like midway through that Dr. Mike is brain rot on Twitter, and we got enough of a confirmation, which he is an avid user of Twitter. Okay, I just want to be clear. I was right.
Yours. What the hell were we talking about earlier when you took me off track on the philosophical bullshit? Oh, yes.
Probably more
I'm
philosophical.
Back. No, I got it. So it's all the same. So doctors' offices and telling people, hey, you should lift more weights and do this. Non-androgenic anabolics. We've already started to solve the problem of food drive and appetite with medication. But now we have an even bigger problem in the muscle mass side. It used to be low muscle mass was something that affected predominantly older individuals of certain ethnic groups more than others. People from Southeast Asia struggle with low muscle mass, and you've seen a lot of the metadata on their health stuff. People in their late 20s who are type 2 diabetic, and you're like, you're not even overweight. Like the muscle to fat ratio is all wacky, right? And so what we had, and this is going to be worse and worse of a problem over time, is the only thing keeping many overweight Americans non-sarcopenic, which is to say enough muscle mass to not cause activities of daily living or metabolic dysregulation. The only thing keeping them having high enough muscle mass was their enormous food intake, because if you eat more food, you gain muscle and fat. Now they're going to be eating less food, but they're not getting into fitness and activity, not all of them. So you're going to see these new modern anorectic medications drive a new wave of sarcopenia. Junk food and overeating has just been covering up that wave of sarcopenia, because like a lot of overweight older adults, they're not sarcopenic, but as soon as you get them down in body weight, oh my God, they're sarcopenic. We desperately need the development of a non-androgenic anabolic, because anabolic steroids, they build muscle real well, but they come with like 18 trillion different side effects. They're just non-starter. If you have a non-androgenic anabolic potentially attacking the myostatin regulation system, which is ultra powerful. You ever see those like cows that have like 2 times the muscle of the regular cow, or the greyhound or the mouse or whatever? That is already a monogenic vector of attack we could be developing. And who knows, I'm not in the pharmaceutical back end, but I guarantee you some companies are working. So these are all tractable problems. And as soon as we get a non-androgenic anabolic going, we can prescribe dual therapy. So instead of coming into the office and saying, you should lift weights and eat better, and they're like, okay, you're like, all right, see you next Monday.
It won't even be dual therapy, it would be single pill.
That would be dope. The thing with, so I'm not pushing back. I'm just thinking out loud. 2 Jews get together and talk like, oh, you're wrong. Single injection will be dope.
What the fuck?
The thing is, people have different genetics for muscularity and food drive. And so a single injection would kind of do a ton of good. But I think 2 pills can also make sense, because like some people don't need much more muscle, but they need much less food drive. The other way around is also the case. But in any case, let's just go with 1 pill, right? To make it super simple. People come in today, we're like, hey, go resistance train and eat better. They're like, dope, see you never. And they fucking don't do it. Nowadays, now some of them do, and that's great. But now, maybe in the future, we get a non-androgenic anabolic developed that's safe and effective and really very targeted, then we have the situation where people are taking a medication that not only lowers, let's say, God damn it, back to two medications just to keep this very clear. They're taking a medication that lowers their overall body weight and adiposity. They're brought the fat down. Now they're taking a medication and does 2 things. 1, it brings their muscularity up. And if they want to engage in resistance training for mobility, for health, for strength, for enjoyment, for connective tissue stuff, it makes that a much more fruitful enterprise. I can't tell you how many people I've consulted and trained and seen over the years who people tell them resistance train, it's great. These are people with good genetics. They're often young. These are older people with not so great genetics for muscle. Bro, they're in the gym weeks and weeks and weeks. Something happens, but not much. If you look at the exercise science data directly, you'll notice there are a group of people, maybe like about 1/5 of everyone who's in an exercise science study. They don't lift weights, and all of a sudden for 16 weeks, they make them lift weights for 3 times a week. Something like 1/5 of those people gain undetectable amounts of muscle. Like if in the first 16 weeks of a program you don't gain detectable muscle, people talk about noob gains, like you gain a wildly disproportionate totality of your muscle in the first few weeks. If that ain't happening for you, man, can you imagine your doctor says lift weights? You do. You come back a year later, you're like 3 days a week I've been doing an RPI hypertrophy app. I did it all. And then
RPI hypertrophy app. I like the plug for his shit.
They measure, they do the DEXA, you're like, you lost a pound of muscle. That legitimately happens. So just to cut this off at the pass, I'm not saying we need to replace resistance training in gyms with modern non-androgenic anabolics. They're going to be empowering for everyone. And look, if you never go to the gym, hey, shit, they'll be empowering for you too. And then we can get to this world where people are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they are lean and they have lots of muscle mass, not a ton, just a decent amount. And it's going to impact disease across the board in an unbelievably profound way. Because when I look at folks that are in their 50s, 60s, et cetera, and they're soft, they're not large, they're soft. I'm thinking, fuck, man, 5 or 10 years, you're going to break something, or your type 2 diabetes is going to go up. And what do I do about this? Well, eat better and try to make better choices. They already eat pretty well. They just don't have enough muscle. There's no glucose sink. Yeah. You solve that problem. It's enormous. Now, the first wave of AI-powered drug discovery is already cresting. Most pharmaceutical companies are pretty open with what they're working on. It's not that because they're working on Alzheimer's, diabetes, crazy killer problems that millions have. This, I think, is hopefully going to be next gen. And when it happens, it'll be a big deal.
I think that's your most reasonable prediction that you made this far.
It's more of a hope than a prediction, really. I
think it's the most reasonable because when you look at a lot of the medications that exist in dual therapy in that way, they're almost counteractive. So, for example, there's some medications that have an NSAID and then a sucralfate to coat in a stomach to reduce the side effects, or an opioid medication plus an anti-constipation medicine with it. So, they're always trying to pair two things that take one of the problems and solve the back end side effect.
Yes. And I think this is just insanely obvious. And usually you're very good at pushback. I haven't heard much from you in this regard because it's a real thing, right? I think so many people don't know that having higher muscularity within a given body is so health promoting. And if you have a non-androgenic anabolic in the mix, by a nutrient partitioning, most of what you eat now goes to feed the muscle because it's so hungry all the time. And so it actually is a second order effect is to keep you leaner. So for any amount of food you eat, if you're on a decent dose of non-androgenic anabolic, you're actually going to be leaner because muscle simply occupies more of that space and takes more of your food. When you're lifting a lot and you're jacked and lean and everything, you just eat tons of food and people are like, don't you get fat? You're like, I don't know, man. I lift weight so much and I have so much muscle. It's just hungry and eats all the time. And my fat's like, damn it, feed me. And there's nothing left. That is such a profound thing that I think I'm really excited about that future development. And I hope folks listening that maybe work at a pharmaceutical company can talk to the CEO or something, tell them, hey, there's money to be made here.
I'm surprised you think that right now people don't think muscle is a big component of health.
I think they do, but I think they're like an order of magnitude away from how big of a component they how important it is. There's a thing about recognizing.
I mean, that would make sense to me since people are so overweight. I don't think that the next, it's like one of those things where what's the biggest issue right now when you go to the doctor? A lot of people, it's that they're too fat. So you're probably not going to be like, you need more muscle. It's going to be like, okay, right now we deal with the fat problem. But I think that it does make sense. I mean, honestly, I think that the doctor's framing on health in general is not great. The doctors aren't nutritionists a lot of the times. And they don't necessarily know everything that they're talking about. They're like, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight. But they don't really promote healthy lifestyles. Most of the doctors I've ever gone to are just like, you need to lose weight. And if you don't come back in here next month and you haven't lost 10 pounds, you're failed. And it's like, okay, I'm a grown man. That message is not going to resonate with me. As unhealthy as I am, I'm paying you. I'm not paying you to lecture me like an annoying asshole. But I've never really had a doctor go like, hey, listen, I think you need to start walking. You need to try to walk every day. Just walk 20 minutes every day. Not even don't even weight loss. I've never heard doctors say hey, listen, you're overweight and you should try to change that. Why don't you just walk every day? Just walk. Don't even worry about losing weight necessarily. Just walk. Develop a better habit. I'm 34. Hopefully I'm going to be alive for at least another 30 years. If I walk every day for 30 years, I'm in a better spot than I would be, regardless of whether I lose weight or not. I've never heard doctors say that. A lot of times it's just lecturing, and it's just so fucking annoying, honestly.
The importance of something nominally, and there's a thing about how important is it? Pretty important. No, very important. I think people need to shift more towards this is really important.
Okay. Muscle is very important. You're a Nazi. There's great takeaways from this podcast.
I had fun.
I had fun too. I actually wanted to talk about 10 other subjects and we got none of them. So that sounds like part 3. Maybe we can do it on your show.
I'd love that.
Yeah. If I'm still waiting for the invitation. So
you're too important to invite. We've invited you 10 times and your butlers keep saying that the mail's going to some other part of the compound, they call it.
Okay. Let's make it, what do they call it? A SMART goal. So at least let's be specific. When I come on your show, what topics are we talking about?
Jeez, you're making me brainstorm live.
Live. People are going to see how that mind works.
Sure. No problem. Flex the Jew brain. Got it. I would love to talk to you about if I am a male in my 30s and 40s and 50s. I lift regularly. I eat well. But I don't know anything about doctors and medicine and pills and what I could be missing and all this other stuff. Maybe I'm on TRT, maybe I'm not. when I go to talk to my doctor, what labs do I need to be curious about? What is A1C? What does that mean? How do I know that what I'm doing today is setting me up for health and longevity and muscularity later versus like, dude, you're on the real wrong path. I know you lift and eat well, but like you missed this whole thing that real doctors know about. Because I teach them about exercise stuff and general health stuff, but I know almost nothing about the medical side. I would love for you to fill in the blanks of like, how do you talk to your doctor about blood work? What other measures can you take? What really are the most profound things? Are there any medications that you need to be taking? Another one is this. What multivitamins and multiminerals should I be taking? Can I ask my doctor to test me for deficiencies? Because the big thing is the great canon has been so far, if you're eating a well-balanced diet, you don't need a multivitamin. And that's true, but still millions of Americans have various vitamin and mineral deficiencies, low-grade ones. But if you fix them...
Sorry, the game automatically jumped me at him instead of away from him.
You're going to get some ROI. Is that a thing I talk to my doctor about? Because unfortunately, you can talk to doctors about it, or you can go, no offense, to the local health food store, and they're like, yeah,
you can fix everything.
We got all kinds of stuff to sell.
The whole premise of that, like just to touch on it so briefly to end this podcast, is validation of when you change something, whether or not it creates a clinical impact and whether or not it's valuable to spend the time, as we said in how important it is with limited time to make a change, is the same way that I think about protocols from Gary Brecka, from Huberman, from Peter Attia. And there's
you went down the scale of like empirical believability.
Yes, but the problem is all three of them function in the same world where they create individual protocols that they set themselves as experts in their own right. And I say experts like this because it's clearly a wide variability.
Yes.
One has a bachelor's degree, one is a PhD, one is an MD. So there's variability in expertise, and yet they have their own protocols expertly derived. And here's why I don't buy into that. When they disagree with an organization like the CDC, American Heart Association, AAFP, the American Academy of Family Physicians, because the recommendations that those groups give me as a clinician is validated. So what's the current world record for bench press?
Well, I broke it yesterday in my own home.
So
I think it's just shy of...
What is the recorded?
I think it's just shy of 800 pounds. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that like shirted or like raw?
If I was to tell you non-jokingly that I bench 950, what would you say to me?
Being that you are you and look like you are?
Yeah, everything.
I mean, powerlifters will find this funny. I'll be like, oh, what federation and with what triple ply shirt? But that's an austere reference. So I would say, oh, that's cool. And then I would...
Yeah, well, I actually did bench 900 pounds at the powerlifting tournament that was run by Mike O'Hearn. It was all natty. Everything was fair. Everything was normal. Okay, just be clear.
Tell my friends you're insane.
Right. And why do you jump to the conclusion that I'm insane? Can you prove that I'm insane?
With the way I understand proofs to work in philosophy, probabilistically through inference, yes.
Probabilistically.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But not with 100% certainty.
No, you could just be a total freak. Yeah.
Totally. So I can't disbelieve their protocols, just like you can't 100% disbelieve that I'm saying it. But there's enough reasonable certainty and probability that they don't have the validated bench press shirt, federation judge,
whatever,
watching you form,
yes,
whatever it is, that minutia that's incredibly important to judge whether or not that thing is true and validated, that I can't buy into that and recommend it on a general scale. Because it might be true, but they need to go and validate it for me before I start telling it to people. Totally. And that's my issue with the protocols.
Totally. And what my audience would like to hear, I think, are not protocols. They get those plenty from those other folks. I think what they would like to hear is how to think about the situation of, I'm an adult who's pretty healthy, who exercises and eats well, but what about on the medical and diagnostic side do I need to be aware of and talk to my doctor about? Yeah,
I think a good thing for us to talk about would be how doctors are trained to go into a visit when they think about prevention, treatment, catching things early, what we're trained to do, versus what I'd like for some doctors to do more of.
Yes.
And what to do if your doctor's not.
Huge.
That
really is it, because the subset, a lot of times doctors will do that thing I talked to you about earlier, where like 55-year-old who's made of mush, they're like, oh, your blood work looks good, see you next time. For fitness people, it's extra more of that conundrum, because they're like, their blood work is great. I mean, it's just stellar for their age, but they want more. They want an extra insurance policy of health and fitness. And because the doctor deals only in generalities, because that's how they were trained and that's most of the population, they never get the care and attention they need. And another thing I'd love to ask you about in the future is like, how do we go about selecting a doctor that works more with fitness people and knows, okay, you want extra A+ attention because you're willing to do it. Then what do you look for? Because here's a big problem. Most of the people that are looking for the A+ in fitness end up being like, my doctor is a 70-year-old man who thinks that because I lift weights, I'm going to hurt my back. And even though he's okay with my blood work and everything, he says, you're fine, you're fine.
Well, you could hurt your back in the short term, but generally if you're doing with decent technique, you're going to have a much better... You're going to have a much better outcome with just being safer in general.
Lots of doctors will be like, you're fine, everything's fine, see you later. It's 15 minutes are up. Who's left over to go to? If we can't find an evidence-based practitioner that can give them that extra boost, like, look, let's look at your vitamin D levels over every 3-month time span. Things that aren't worth most of the general population, but are worth it to you. Let's do it in an evidence-based way that makes sense. But there are so few of those people around and so difficult to find. I'd love to ask you about how to find them, how to get to know, because usually these people end up going to like fucking quacks. And they're like, well, this guy's the only one talking about enhancement.
Correct.
You know, like the human, whatever the fuck dear Rebecca says. I'm a human biologist. Like, oh, I usually speak to primatologists about this, but I'm just being a dick.
Well, to talk about Dr. Gundry again and give him a nod, he kept telling me about how great apes only eat fruit during parts of the year. Therefore, we should not eat fruit. I don't know, but he kept telling me that. And I'm like, I don't really know what.
So we got like a minute left.
It sounds profound.
He said we shouldn't be eating fruit all year round. And I'm like, well, clearly humans that consume fruit are really the problem in our country.
That's who the least healthy people are. It's a linear correlation.
The people who eat fruits and vegetables, the disgusting animals.
Yes, I actually can I do know a little bit something about this. The sort of like annual variations in food consumption. You see, Mike, when the sun hits the fruit, I got nothing.
That's honestly refreshing. Because saying I don't know is sometimes more powerful than creating a story about great apes.
It's the story of my life.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right. Cool.
Is your BMI actually useful?
Oh, yeah, probably. All right, man. I like the conversation a lot. It was fun, but Dr. Mike is fucking Twitter brain, so.